Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be going to what if the Assel Pirates did not split chapter 3. Make sure to like and subscribe, it helps, and it means the world to me. Also join the Discord. Disclaimer. There may be mature content and maybe 18+ content, and I don't own this story. With that stuff out of the way, let's begin chapter 20. The red-haired idol. As the brothers made their way back to the infirmary, they were still left reeling from the sudden ending of their conversation with Whitebeard. They still didn't quite believe the captain, and didn't know how to feel about the information they were just given. "Do you three happen to know a brat named red-haired Shanks?" Whitebeard asked, the three sitting up straighter at the name, Luffy's eyes opening as he raised himself off of Ace's chest, and watched the captain with weary eyes. Once upon a time Luffy would have smiled brightly and shouted to anyone that asked that, yeah, he knew Shanks, he had gotten his hat from him. But now, he felt conflicted. They had been captured for 7 years, and although Shanks might not even know that he had been kidnapped, Luffy did. Would Shanks have tried to rescue him if he knew? Did Shanks know he was kidnapped? If he did he try to find him and his brothers? Or had he given up on Luffy? After all, strong people don't get kidnapped and held for 7 years. Did Luffy really deserve to have his idol Straw Hat anymore? He had promised to give it to Shanks when he became the greatest, the Pirate King, but when he was in that cell he didn't see himself as the Pirate King, he saw himself as a prisoner, one that would never see the blue ocean ever again. Ace and Sabo looked at Luffy, worried about how he was going to react. They knew about Luffy's idolization of the man, the promise he had made with him, the meaning behind the straw hat, but how did the boy feel now? It was obvious by Luffy's silence and lack of exclamation that he definitely felt different than he used to on the matter. And why was Whitebeard asking? Were they enemies with Shanks? If they gave away their connection to the man, would they become hostile towards the brothers? Sabo didn't know what to say for a minute, looking at Ace with hesitance, though the eldest didn't seem to know what to do either. "Yes, we do," Sabo hesitantly replied after a minute of silence. The brothers were tensed, ready for a fight, sure that if they were going to be attacked, it would be now. What they didn't expect was for Whitebeard to laugh. "Gurarararara, so you are the three brats that brat was looking for after all." Whitebeard laughed loudly, the commanders at his side looking shocked. Sabo frowned, glancing at Ace again, seeing his brother was frowning as well. "What do you mean?" Sabo asked, Luffy's grip tightening. "Red-haired brat came here a few years back looking for 3 brats, told me they had been kidnapped and wanted help finding them. It seems we finally managed to stumble upon you 3. Do you think he was telling the truth? Shanks was looking for us?" Luffy asked in a small timid voice. Ace and Sabo glanced at each other hesitantly, Sabo turning a soft gaze on Luffy. "Who knows? Ace and I never met him, but from what you've told us you two were good friends, I'm sure he would have been looking for you," Sabo said carefully, not quite sure himself. Luffy remained silent, looking at the ground in front of him as they walked slowly through the hulls of the ship. Ace's lips were thin as he held himself back from speaking. If the pirate had been actively looking for them, how come it was Whitebeard who managed to accidentally stumble upon them? He kept this to himself, not wanting to diminish any hope Luffy might have about his idol. As the brothers reached the infirmary, they did their best to ignore the smells and nurses as they walked to their beds. Sabo could see Whiskey perking up from where she sat, making her way towards the brothers. Tapping quickly to alert his brothers, Sabo got into his bed, Ace and Luffy getting into their own bed as well. "Wonderful, you 3 are back," Whiskey said in a tone that unnerved the 3. Ace frowned, nearly glaring at the nurse, while Luffy clung to his brother, and Sabo did his best to remain stone-faced. Seeming to notice the tension rising within the 3, Whiskey rose her hands in a peaceful gesture. "Don't worry, I'm only here to run the usual checkups, make sure that your little excursion didn't do more damage than good," Whiskey said calmly, the 3 slowly calming down, though still guarded. Sabo allowed himself to get checked over first, the nurse going through the usual procedures as before, jotting something down before turning to Ace and doing the same, and then to Luffy. "It seems you 3 are as healthy as this morning, if not healthier. You're making more progress towards full recovery as well, Ace, it's remarkable really," Whiskey commented, more to herself as she stared at her notes. Ace shifted uncomfortably, remaining silent. "Well, in any case," the nurse said, raising her head to look at the brothers. "I was wondering if I could draw some blood from you, Luffy, seeing as I don't have any of yours. I don't know if there are any chemicals that could be doing you harm running through your veins," Whiskey said calmly, voice steady. Ace and Sabo tensed while Luffy tilted his head in confusion. "Take blood with a needle." Sabo had the forethought to tap the quick explanation to the boy who had no clue what the doctor was talking about. Well, Luffy understood as well. He paled, trembling slightly and clutching Ace tighter, frowning. Noticing this, Whiskey reverted back to the stance she had earlier, hands up in peace. "Don't worry, if you don't want to we don't have to, I just don't want you to get hurt anymore than you already have if we could prevent it," Whiskey explained in his soft voice. The 3 remained silent, and Whiskey was about ready to just give up on it altogether, when Sabo cleared his throat. "We understand your concern, but we're all a little hesitant when it comes to needles. I think it would be best if we didn't draw anyone's blood. Sabo explained as calmly as he could, though his voice did waver slightly at the end. Whiskey nodded in understanding. That's alright, but if you feel any change, any new pains, dizziness, nausea, anything, tell me. Whiskey said sternly to Luffy, the boy nodding in agreement, the tone of the nurse's voice putting him on edge, Ace bristling at it, holding back a snarky response. Whiskey, pleased by the nod, turned her attention back to her notes, eyebrows knitting in confusion. It is quite remarkable though, how fast you three seem to be healing, you especially Ace. At this point, you shouldn't even be awake, much less moving freely without any fatigue. She says, more to herself as she taps her pen to her chin. Sabo and Ace sure look, Ace doing his best to hide a smug smile. Yes, I'm just a fast healer. Ace said in an almost too cheery voice. Whiskey paused at the tone but shrugged it off, nodding. That's so. Well, in any case, it seems like you three should be able to move around freely within the next day, if you all continue healing at this rate. We could even talk with the commanders and Pops about getting you guys your own rooms. The nurse said, lowering the clipboard and smiling at the three. This was the best news the three had heard in years. Thank you, we appreciate everything you've done to help us get better, Sabo said politely, using his overly formal voice when addressing the nurse. He was grateful to the Whitebeards for helping them recover, but who knew when they would turn on them. It was no problem, really. There's one minor thing, though, Whiskey said, raising the clipboard back up to her face. Ace and Sabo tensed, expecting this to be the moment that she whipped out needles and chains. Luffy, noticing his brother's emotions and feeling Ace tense up, glanced at the nurse, ready to start running if necessary. What is it? Sabo asked, voice slightly quieter than it had been a second ago, trying to keep it from wavering. Whiskey frowned, eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Even though you're all eating properly, you don't seem to be gaining the right amount of weight, especially Ace and Luffy. Whiskey said, relieving Ace and Sabo, which in turn relieved Luffy. He didn't really know what was happening, but his brothers had calmed down, so he did too. Sabo smiled again, laughing almost sheepishly. Ah, well, Ace and Luffy have big appetites, Sabo explained, the nurse examining her notes another minute before nodding, jotting something down. Well, why didn't you say something sooner? If you were still hungry you could have asked for more food. Whiskey said in an almost chastising voice. The brothers didn't quite know how to handle the information. All their lives they were told to fend for themselves, and in the facility, there was no asking for seconds, even if you were hungry enough to eat another bowl of garbage. I'll tell Thatch to make you three some bigger meals, and if you want seconds, just ask. She said, smiling at the three. They nodded, still unsure how to respond, and she nodded back, turning and walking out the door, leaving the brothers in their beds, still unsure as to what had happened. I can't believe that those three were the brats that Akagami was looking for, Rikuyo exclaimed. The commanders and Whitebeard were sitting in the meeting room, discussing the conversation they had had with the boys, or more like Sabo seeing as Ace and Luffy rarely said a word. Yeah, I didn't think that they would still be alive after all these years, Haruta muttered. I wouldn't be too surprised, Haruta, after all, this is someone that Akagami brat bet his arm on, Whitebeard said, grinning. Beside him, Marco was dialing a number into a den mushi, the snail ringing for a minute before there was an answer. Shanks here, who am I talking to? A voice asked on the other line. Whitebeard smiled, lifting the snail from the table and speaking into it. Brat. It seems you're still in good health. Whitebeard's voice boomed, the commanders falling silent as they listened. Ah, Whitebeard it seems. Well, to what do I owe the pleasure of your call? Shanks asked, the snail copying his facial expression by raising an eyebrow at the giant. Whitebeard's smile whitened. I believe we found those brats of yours that you've been looking for, Whitebeard answered, the line going silent, the snail's eyes whitening. There was a shuffling and a slam, like Shanks had placed his hand down on something wooden. What? You found Luffy and his brothers, Shanks asked, a background noise that had been loud and boisterous moments ago falling silent. Unless there's another Ace, Sabo, and Luffy, then I believe we have, Whitebeard answered. There was suddenly cheering in the background, and Shanks was laughing joyously. I can't believe it. Where are you? We'll come your way immediately. Shanks cried happily. After giving them their coordinates they found it would take the red-haired pirates a week to reach them. They ended the call, the snail falling back asleep. It seems that those brothers are pretty important to Akagami, Flamingo noted, crossing his arms. Everyone nodded their agreement when there was a knock from who they assumed to be Whiskey. They were right when she entered, holding her clipboard in her hand as she walked up to the table. Do you have news, my daughter? Whitebeard asked, everyone curious, wanting to know anything they could about the brothers. Whiskey sighed. Some news. I wasn't able to get any of Luffy's blood like I hoped, so I have no clue if he's got any harmful chemical in him. Otherwise, the brothers are all clear to leave the infirmary tomorrow, as long as they don't do anything to reverse the healing they've done. Whiskey explained, looking through her notes. Whitebeard nodded. We'll prepare some rooms for them then, Whitebeard said, turning and giving Marco a look to which she nodded too. Why couldn't you get the kid's blood? Was there an issue? Curiel asked. Whiskey frowned, shaking her head. No problem, but as I've mentioned before, every child that we rescued has issues with needles, practically a phobia of them. I don't want to upset the three when we can barely get them to tell us their names. As much as I'd rather get blood any way I could, I don't think it would be a good idea to force them into letting me draw blood. If anything, it would do more harm than good, especially if it turns out that there's nothing harmful in his blood. Our best option is to wait and see if Luffy starts having any new symptoms. Whiskey explained to the group. All of them nodded their understanding. It is a little odd though, how fast the brothers are healing though. Besides the fact that Ace was supposed to be in a coma for another month at least, they all healed at a much more rapid rate than I expected, Ace especially. Even after being awake he should have needed another week of healing, not a day or two. Whiskey said, frowning at her own notes. Is it a drug? Bakuyo asked, all of them confused. Whiskey sighed. I don't think so. All the drugs that were present when the brothers got here have dissipated by now. If there had been anything helping them, it wouldn't be helping them now. Also, Thatch, it seems we need to up the meal sizes. I thought it was weird that even with a regular, healthy diet, the boys weren't gaining as much weight as they should have, Ace and Luffy especially. According to Sabo, they have large appetites. Whiskey said, addressing Thatch, who frowned, but nodded, almost mad at himself that he had let the brothers go hungry, even if he hadn't known about it. Why didn't they say anything? Aizo asked. Whiskey shrugged. I don't know, I didn't push it. The three looked ready to bolt at any second, so I dropped it. The nurse explained, lowering her clipboard. When are we ever going to get some answers from these brothers rather than more questions? Curiel muttered, the commanders nodding in agreement. Anytime they got an answer to something they got 5 more questions to follow it. All we can do now is make them comfortable. Red-haired brat will be here in a week's time, so, for now, let's get them settled. Whitebeard declared. I'll go have their rooms prepared, Yoi, Marco said, standing from his chair and leaving the room. This signaled the end of the meeting, everyone standing and heading off to do their daily tasks. I'll go start lunch, Thatch said, a slight frown still on his face, exiting the room. Luffy, you should try to take a nap. Ace encouraged, wrapping an arm around the youngest. After everything that had happened today, the brothers were surprised Luffy wasn't passing out at that moment. Don't wanna, Luffy mumbled, burrowing his head against Ace's chest. Ace rolled his eyes while Sabo watched with interest. And why not? Ace asked, wondering what answer the boy would give. I'm not tired, Luffy mumbled back, though his eyes were closed, and he yawned. Your body says otherwise, Lu. Take a nap, Ace and I will stay up. Sabo said gently, hoping his brother would listen and take a well-deserved nap. Luffy shook his head again. Nah, he responded. Ace huffed, beginning to feel slightly annoyed. Come on Lu, just take a nap, it'll be fine. Sabo and I are gonna be right here the entire time. We won't go anywhere. Ace continued to encourage, trying his best to remain calm. Luffy was silent for a minute, and the two oldest wondered if he had listened to them and fallen asleep. They were proven wrong though when he spoke up again. Can you tell me a story? Luffy asked, voice much softer and quieter than it had been before. Ace frowned while Sabo sat up a little straighter in his bed. A story? Sabo asked. Luffy nodded, still not opening his eyes. Like the ones you used to tell me before. About the pirates. Luffy said, peeking an eye open momentarily to glance at the blonde brother. Sabo looked at him for a moment before shrugging, standing up from his bed and moving to sit at the foot of Ace and Luffy's bed. Alright, as long as you promise to go to sleep right after, Sabo said sternly. Luffy nodded, a small smile forming as he snuggled further into Ace, getting comfortable. Promise. Luffy chirped happily, wrapping an arm around Ace and closing his eyes again. Sabo smiled while Ace smoothed back some of Luffy's hair, his straw hat sitting on the bedside table. Well, why don't I tell you about the gold-toothed pirates? Sabo asked, Luffy nodding vehemently. Yeah? Did they go on lots of adventures? Luffy asked excitedly, always enjoying Sabo's stories. Ace settled into the bed more as well, interested in the story as much as Luffy was. He had to admit as well that Sabo had a way with storytelling that always made the listener feel as if they were experiencing the story themselves. Well, of course, what pirate doesn't go on lots of adventures? Sabo asked before launching into the story. It wasn't long before Luffy was sleeping peacefully against Ace's chest, and Sabo was finishing the story, moving back to his own bed. I haven't heard one of your stories in a long time. Ace said with a yawn, shifting slightly, careful not to wake Luffy. Sabo shrugged. No one was ever in the mood to listen to them. Besides, we had much more pressing things to think about for the last year. Sabo said. You got that right. Ace muttered darkly. Chapter 21. Out of the infirmary at last. Lunchtime. The sing-song voice of the white-beard pirate chef faltered to Sabo's sensitive ears, though you didn't need super hearing to hear the man coming. He practically kicked the door open, grinning ear to ear, balancing a tray of food in one hand and drinks in the other. Sabo sat up straighter almost instinctively, while Ace roused their napping brother. It had been at least an hour, and while they wished Luffy could have slept more, they weren't complaining, seeing as they were going to be able to eat. Thatch, what have I said about being quiet in the infirmary? Whiskey hissed, quiet enough that the brothers weren't supposed to be able to hear it, but Sabo was easily able to pick up on it. Ah, right, sorry Whiskey. Thatch said, still grinning and not seeming all that sorry as he made his way to the brothers. Whiskey sighed in annoyance, rubbing her forehead, but leaving it be as she turned back to whatever she was working on. Hey, boys. Hungry? He asked, lowering the tray of food down, so the three could see what was on it. Luffy was slightly groggy, having just woken, but the sight of all the food made his eyes sparkle happily, and he had to keep from drooling all over Ace. There was definitely more food than the brothers had previously been getting, but instead of just slightly upping the meal sizes, Thatch had gone all out, practically preparing a feast of different foods. Whiskey told me you guys seem to have bigger appetites than you let on, so I decided to make a lot of food. Eat however much you want, that way I'll know how much to make next time. Thatch encouraged, gesturing to all the food that was practically spilling over the tray. The tray was piled high with sandwiches, bread, bowls of fruit, rice, meat, and even vegetables that Sabo and Ace were going to make sure Luffy ate, no matter how much the boy complained. Ace and Luffy couldn't hide the loud growl their stomachs made, Ace blushing slightly in embarrassment, while Luffy didn't pay it any mind, more focused on the food. Well, go ahead, I made all this for you three after all. Thatch said, placing the tray of food on the bedside table in between Ace and Sabo's beds, grabbing a chair and sitting. Luffy, ready to grab the food, hesitated, looking at Ace and Sabo for confirmation first. Clearly, Thatch didn't think the brothers would eat all of this, so would he freak if he found out that Luffy could eat 5 times the amount on the tray in front of them? They had said they wouldn't mind making more food for the brothers, said that they should tell them if they were still hungry, but they didn't know that there were 2 black holes in Ace and Luffy's stomachs that could clean out their entire storeroom. The brothers debated amongst themselves on what to do before Ace picked up the tray, moving it towards him and Luffy to where the blonde couldn't reach it. Thatch watched, wondering what he was doing, but then he saw Ace dividing the food up, removing most of the fruit from their bowls, placing sandwiches into the bowls with the fruit, adding vegetables, rice, bread, meat, and then handing it to Luffy, who handed it to Sabo, leaving the rest of the food to the 2 ravens. Sabo nodded his thanks as he began eating at a normal pace, using his manners. Ace then divided the food in half, and Thatch watched as the brothers began to eat at a relatively slow pace. He cleared his throat, noticing that he had been staring. So, I heard you 3 should be all cleared by tomorrow. Thatch said, grinning again as he tried to start up a conversation. Sabo nodded and made a motion as if he was going to speak, which made Thatch wonder why he was always the one who talked to them, rather than Ace or Luffy, because surely they had the same answers that the blonde had, so why not talk more? This was a question for later though, when all their attention was turned to the infirmary door that was opening, Marco walking in with his normal neutral expression, making his way over to the group. Oh, Marco, hey. Thatch greeted cheerily, waving to the first commander. Marco nodded back in greeting, pulling up his own chair and sitting beside the chef, looking to the brothers who were watching him as they ate. Marco raised an eyebrow at the amount of food on the platter, turning to Thatch, who laughed sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head. I don't know how big their appetites are, so I just made a lot and figured whatever they didn't eat could go to anyone looking for a snack. Thatch explained, not noticing the smirk Sabo was hiding as he bit into an apple, or the way Ace slightly choked on his food in an attempt to stifle his laughs. Luffy was oblivious to his brothers, more focused on the amazing food he was eating. He hadn't eaten this well since they had lived in the jungle years ago. Marco sighed and shook his head, wondering if Thatch had also made it out of guilt for not noticing the boys' hunger before. Figuring it was probably the case, he let it go, turning his attention back to the boys. I'm sure you've heard that you'll be free to leave the infirmary tomorrow. We're already setting up some rooms for you to use while you're here, Marco said, addressing the brothers. Sabo hesitated in taking a bite out of his sandwich, glancing at Luffy and Ace out of the corner of his eye. Ace tensed slightly, and Luffy, noticing the change in his brother's demeanor, slowed even more in his eating, looking around in confusion, not having heard Marco. If you wouldn't mind, we only need 1 room, Sabo said stiffly, none of the brothers wanting to be separated. Marco and Thatch raised an eyebrow at that. Really? It's no trouble to get you guys separate rooms. Besides, it can't be comfortable to try and fit all 3 of you into 1 room. Thatch replied. Ace frowned, and Sabo tried to remedy the situation before Ace started shouting insults. They were still walking on eggshells here, they didn't need Ace burning those eggshells out from under them. No, we'd much rather prefer sharing a room, Sabo insisted, hoping he wasn't pushing any boundaries with the pirates. After a second of silence, in which all 3 brothers had stopped eating out of fear of the response, Marco shrugged. Alright, but the best we can do is get you a room with 2 beds, Marco eventually said, much to Sabo's relief as he saw Ace's tension leave, and he and Luffy started eating again. Sabo held back a sigh of relief and smiled, picking his sandwich up again. That's fine, Commander, thank you, Sabo said politely, continuing his meal. To be honest, he was surprised Luffy hadn't wolfed his entire meal down, even if Sabo had told him to eat slowly. Looking to his brothers, he noticed they were about halfway through the giant pile of foods. Thatch and Marco didn't seem to notice this fact, otherwise, their smiles and passive faces would surely be filled with shock and maybe even disgust at the sight. Sabo pushed those thoughts away quickly. "We've contacted Shanks as well, Yoi," Marco said, distracting Sabo from his earlier thoughts, Ace and Luffy looking up from their food in slight shock. Even though Whitebeard had said they would try to get into contact with the infamous pirate, the brothers hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Just like that, the tension was back, almost double what it had been before as all three stopped eating once again. "Oh?" Sabo asked, afraid he wouldn't be able to say much more, and hoping the first commander wouldn't notice his nervousness. Marco nodded. "He said he would be here within a week's time," Marco informed without hesitation or emotion. It was hard to tell if the pirates liked Shanks or not. What if they were enemies of Shanks and once the man came they would hold the brothers as leverage, or even kill them? But what if they were friends? Why else would Shanks ask for these pirates' help if they were anything but friends? Unless he had never asked for help in the first place and was never looking for the brothers, in which case Sabo had no clue what he or Ace could do if Luffy found that out. The boy would be heartbroken, more so than when Emily had died. "That's good," Sabo said, hoping to keep up a calm exterior despite his many thoughts. He did his best to go back to eating, seeing Ace trying to do the same. "Make sure you eat those too, Lou." Ace mumbled quietly to Luffy, gesturing to the vegetables that had gone untouched by Luffy. Luffy scrunched his nose up as he looked at the greens. "But green stuff tastes bad." Luffy whined, forgetting his previous worry about Shanks altogether. Sabo chanced to look at Thatch, wondering if he had taken offense to the words, by assuming Luffy meant the chef's cooking was bad. He could see the chef was trying to hold back the hurt look, but Sabo saw it nonetheless and frowned. "Not all green stuff tastes bad, Lou, see?" Sabo asked, making a show of picking a few pieces of broccoli up with his fork and eating it, Luffy watching with curiosity. Sabo saw Thatch's expression clear, the hurt turning to one of understanding, probably thinking now that Luffy meant green food in general. How could he have known about that horrible green soup anyways? "Really?" Luffy asked, picking at some of the broccoli on his own plate, and Sabo was glad the youngest was actually using his fork. "Yeah, remember that one time Makino gave us all kiwis? They were green and good," Ace encouraged. Luffy looked to be thinking again for a minute before trying the vegetable, everyone watching for his reaction. "I still like meat better," Luffy said eventually, though he continued eating the vegetables without any more complaints. Sabo and Ace smiled, Ace messing with Luffy's hair. "Of course you do, I don't think you'll ever like anything more than meat," Ace said, rolling his eyes, noticing the fond smile Thatch was directing his way and the slight curve of Marcos's lips, hinting that the man found amusement in the show as well. Ace fought back a blush and glared, looking back to his own food, almost forgetting they were sitting in a room with complete strangers. "That's not true, I like Ace and Sabo a lot more than meat." There was no fighting the blush this time, Ace's cheeks practically a flaming red, Sabo smirking on his bed in amusement. Though Ace was glaring daggers at the blonde, Luffy felt the love and warmth coming from Ace. He could feel it from Sabo too, and Luffy basked in the pleasant feelings, digging into his food once more. By now the food was nearly gone, Sabo finishing his own bowl of food, pleasantly full for the first time in many years. Instead of shouting at the blonde, Ace opted to finish his food as well, deciding he would yell at Sabo later. It was at this moment that Thatch and Marco noticed the near empty platter, Ace and Luffy eating the last few bites of sandwiches or pieces of fruit. "Why, you guys ate the whole thing?" Thatch said in the surprise that Ace and Sabo had expected, Luffy peering at the chef with curious eyes as he patted his stomach. He could still eat more because he was Luffy, a bottomless pit, but he felt much better than he had in a long time from having a bigger meal. Ace felt the same way, moving the platter to the bedside table, Sabo putting his now empty bowl on top of it. It was delicious," Luffy said happily, smiling brightly. He didn't feel any bad feelings from the chef or first commander, only wonder, shock, amazement, and curiosity. He didn't really understand the jumbled emotions, but determined they weren't bad, and decided it would be okay to talk to them. Tea the whole thing. That was enough for 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 people. If they all ate seconds. "I can't believe it, I've never seen someone eat so much before." And not to mention Thatch's ramblings were cut off when Marco not so subtly elbowed the man in the side. Thank you, I'm glad you enjoyed it," Thatch said, and though he sounded genuine he was still clearly in a state of shock, eyes still wide. Marco looked to have calmed down, not having looked all that shocked in the first place, his eyes only whitening slightly and his eyebrows raising. "No wonder you weren't gaining weight properly, Yor. Do you normally eat that much?" Marco asked, the brothers only hearing genuine curiosity in his voice. "More than they know." Ace tapped out as an almost habit. Sabo smiled anyways, Luffy grinning as well, while Ace shifted to lay against the pillows comfortably. Did he ever mention how nice it was to finally lay on a real bed with real pillows and real cushion? Normally, yes. Ace and Luffy have a large appetite as I've stated before. I have a much more normal appetite, but after living with these two I guess mine grew a little as well. Sabo said, the last part coming out as more of an afterthought. He omitted the part where Ace and Luffy could actually eat 3 times that amount, knowing that, if the 2 pirates knew this, then they probably wouldn't be as hospitable to them. Besides, if they got this much food at every mealtime, then the 3 would be perfectly healthy in no time. I can't say I expected large appetites to mean this, but I guess it can't be helped. Thatch said with a smile, grabbing the now empty platter from the bedside table, placing it in his lap. The day had passed quickly after lunch. The brothers had been left to themselves for the most part, after Marco and Thatch left until dinner, when the chef returned with an equal-sized amount of food as before. After they had finished, the brothers decided to go to sleep, though Ace and Sabo took turns staying up, still uncomfortable with all of them sleeping at once in the presence of so many nurses and needles. By breakfast the next morning, Whiskey had cleared them, doing her final checkups. Say ah, Whiskey said to Luffy, opening her mouth and sticking her tongue out, making the noise. Luffy copied it, making the noise, as the nurse checked that everything was okay. Nodding in affirmation, she leaned away, smiling. Well, that's everything. You 3 are healthy enough to leave the infirmary, but that doesn't mean you're fully recovered. I don't want any of you overexerting yourselves, and definitely no heavy lifting either. Also, if you feel anything bad, headaches, stomachaches, coughing, dizziness, anything, come straight here so I can make sure it's not a chemical causing the issue. Whiskey said in her stern voice, the brothers nodding almost out of habit, fear pulling in all of them at the order that reminded them a little too much of Hare's commanding tone. Good. Well, you're free to go. Marco should be here in a minute to show you around. Whiskey said, walking away from the brothers' beds. There was a collective sigh of relief among the 3 as they watched the nurse leave. Finally, I thought she'd never leave. Ace groaned, slumping back onto the pillows. I was beginning to wonder if we would ever finish our checkups. Sabo groaned as well, also slumping onto his pillows. Normally he was the patient one, but Whiskey had been thorough with her examination, checking anything and everything, the brothers still too scared of the possible enemy nurse to stop her. I'm tired and hungry, Luffy said, laying against Ace. The checkups had been mentally exhausting for all 3 of the brothers, the nurse being so close to all of them, putting them all on edge, the brothers watching her every move, no matter how small it was. Breakfast should be soon, I hear them making it. I think I hear Marco coming too, Sabo said, closing his eyes as he took in the different sounds, better at filtering out the unnecessary noises on the ship. Luffy nodded. I can smell the food. Oh, and Margot too, Luffy said, holding back the drool at the smell of breakfast, also noticing the scent that Marco gave off along with it. He had also gotten better at distinguishing certain smells of people on the ship. He had Ace and Sabo's scent memorized by heart, along with a few people from the facility, due to being with them for years, but everyone on the ship had new scents that he was still learning. The only ones he knew for sure were Thatch, Marco, Whiskey, and Izo's scent. He also, vaguely, knew Whitebeard's scent, but he wasn't all that good at recognizing it yet. If only I had gotten X-ray vision too. Ace mumbled half-heartedly, not really meaning it. Sure, the enhanced senses were cool and all, but the cost they paid for them would never be worth it. Before Ace could ponder that much longer, the door opened and Marco walked in, beelining towards the brothers immediately. Ace and Sabo sat up straighter at the side of the commander, Luffy still too tired to bother moving, knowing his brothers would keep him safe if something happened. Ready for a tour, Yuri? Marco asked in his usual bored tone. Sabo gave the man a smile, hoping he gave an air of politeness with the action as he nodded. We are. Whiskey just gave us the all clear, Sabo answered, removing the blanket from his waist and swinging his legs over the edge of the bed, standing. He looked down at his clothes and wrinkled his nose. Though the brothers had been cared for quite well their entire stay with the pirates, they were still in their clothes from the facility, which wasn't much, just tattered off white shirts stained with blood and dirt and even more tattered shorts. The same off-white color and covered in just as much dirt and blood as their shirts. They had no shoes or socks and they hadn't gotten baths either, so they still smelled overly ripe. Don't worry, Izo's been put in charge of getting you 3 some clothing. You can take baths after the tour as well, Yuri, Marco informed, waving off Sabo's concerns before the blonde even had to speak them. Thank you, Sabo said, gratitude behind his words. He was grateful to the pirates for everything they had done for them, but that didn't mean he would hesitate in forgetting that gratitude if the pirates turned on them. Beside him, Ace and Luffy were climbing out of bed, Luffy much more sluggishly than Ace, yawning again. Marco nodded again and turned, leading the way out of the infirmary. As they left, the nurses waved, but the brothers could barely look at them, much less wave back. Sabo forced a small polite smile back, but that was all he could get himself to do, still extremely off-put by their presences. When the infirmary door closed behind them, the 3 brothers sighed in relief, some of their tenseness leaving their bodies as they followed Marco down the familiar hallway. Luffy was in between the 2 eldest again, holding their hands as they walked. The brothers could sense the many pirates out on deck with their hockey, and were unnerved like before, still not used to the mass amount of pirates on the deck. The four walked in silence, reaching the door to the deck quickly before they were opening it, and walking out into the sun once more, something the brothers weren't getting tired of. Even after the few times they had gone out, it was just as good as it had been the first time. "This is the main deck," Marco announced, gesturing to it as they walked. Ace and Sabo nodded while Luffy peered around curiously. He could see people doing chores, but for the most part, everyone was watching them walk by, curiosity in their eyes. Luffy hesitantly put down his wall, allowing everyone's emotions to flow into him, taking notice of the strong feeling of curiousness emanating from practically everyone, feelings of joy or boredom mingling in. Though those feelings were much harder to feel when there was so much curiosity overpowering it. "This is a large crew," Sabo noted, glancing at the many pirates that surrounded them, body tensing up again along with Ace's. Marco nodded. "Yeah, we're definitely not a small group, Yuri." Marco agreed. Ace was frowning, biting back his snarky comments and opting to glare at everyone, though trying to make it a less heated one than he wanted it to be. They continued across the deck, Marco pointing out different spots, like the spot where Whitebeard was sitting, watching everyone with a smile, or the crow's nests at the top of the giant masts. Eventually, they were finished with the main deck tour and heading to the galley according to Marco. "Smells good." Luffy tapped to his brothers, trying to hold back the drool, licking his lips. Sabo smiled, shaking his head, while Ace rolled his eyes. They entered what they were assuming was the galley, Marco disappearing into the room. The brothers followed quickly, not wanting to get left on the deck with the unknown pirates. The room was huge, though it had to be to fit the large crew, and they could see into the kitchen where there were cooks preparing lunch, breakfast having passed a while ago now. "Hey Marco." "Oh, and our guests too. Nice to see you three out of the infirmary." Thatch called as he walked out of the kitchen, smiling brightly and waving. The brothers fidgeted but said nothing as the man made his way over. "So what are you guys up to?" Thatch asked as he reached them. "I'm giving them the tour of the ship, Yuri. Aji wanted them to at least know their way around if they're gonna be here for a week." Marco explained, crossing his arms. Luffy, not having put his wall back up, felt Thatch's enthusiasm and happiness, the feeling rubbing off on Luffy himself as he started feeling jittery as well, fighting a smile that wanted to stretch across his face. Normally Luffy enjoyed the feelings of joy, practically fed off them, but he didn't want to make Sabo or Ace mad by acting weird, so he forced himself to put the wall back up, blocking Thatch's feelings, and feeling that happy jitteriness fade away. Luffy let out a breath of relief from this, ignoring the quizzical look Ace sent his way at the sound. "Makes sense. Well, be sure to come back for lunch then," Thatch said, his smile never fading. Sabo put on his smile as the chef looked his way and nodded. "Wouldn't miss it," the blonde replied, flinching internally at the words. To be honest, he didn't know if he could force himself back in this room, when there would be hundreds of pirates crammed in here at the same time, much less try and get Ace and Luffy to join as well. That was an issue for later though, no matter if he could feel Ace's glares burning into him from the corner of his eye. He also was definitely ignoring the taps that Ace was having Luffy relate to him, knowing the straw-hatted teen wasn't this creative when coming up with swears to yell at the blonde. "Why don't I show you three where you'll be staying, Yuri?" Marco asked, turning to face them, Ace spinning to face the man, wiping the murderous glare off his face within seconds, though he was still scowling. "Yeah, that'd be great," Ace said, ignoring the slightly shocked look that Thatch wore due to the fact that Ace had actually spoken. Out of the three, Sabo was definitely the one to speak for the brothers, and occasionally Luffy would pipe up, but it was rare to hear the freckled teen speak instead. Marco took this in stride though and simply nodded, already making his way to the door. "Well, I guess I'll get back to cooking then," Thatch mumbled, spinning on his heels and heading back into the kitchen. Ace held back a snicker at the sight by remembering his anger towards Sabo. "We put your room close to the galley and bathroom so you wouldn't get lost, but if you ever need help just ask. The commanders are also in this hall, my room is just there, Yuri. Aji's is down there as well." Marco explained, gesturing down the hallway, showing them his room which was 2 away from theirs and Whitebeard's which was at the end of the hall. Marco opened the door to the brothers' room and they walked in, scanning it quickly. There were 2 beds like they had asked, bolted to the ground to keep from moving when the ship hit rough waters. There was also a desk and chair, also bolted down, and a closet. It was a pretty spacious room, and the brothers would be fine with spending the entire week in there. "Those are all the important places you'll need to know, but again, if you need help, just ask," Marco reiterated, the brothers all nodding, wanting to be left alone. Marco nodded, glancing at the 3 again. "I'll come by when lunch is ready if you're in here, but you're free to wander around if you want, Yuri. Aizo should be by soon with clothes as well," Marco said, already making his way to the door. "Thank you, Commander, we appreciate all your help," Sabo said with a tense smile, wanting the man gone, so the 3 could truly relax for a bit. With not much else Marco left the room, all 3 brothers sighing loudly in relief. "Finally," Ace groaned, face planting into the bed in the corner of the room. Sabo rolled his eyes but couldn't help but feel the same way. This was the first time the brothers had been left alone the entire time they had been on the ship, always having been in a room with a nurse. This room smells a lot better than the medicine room, Luffy said in a pleased manner, smiling as he looked around the room, pulling out the drawers of the desk, and poking his head in the empty closet. And it's much quieter, Sabo said happily, closing his eyes and relishing in the fact that if he drowned out the noises outside of the room, it was blissfully silent. Ace rolled his eyes. I'm just happy we're away from those damn nurses, Ace said, flipping onto his back and staring at the ceiling, arms behind his head and legs crossed. No, Ace, Luffy cried cheerfully, running and jumping onto the man's stomach, causing him to make an oof noise. What, Luffy? Ace groaned out, wincing a little at the sudden impact, but containing himself. I like this place a lot better than the facility. They feed us and help us, and they're gonna give us clothes, and we can take baths. Since when did you like baths? Sabo asked, interrupting the rambling boy. Luffy paused, turning to look at him with a look of confusion as if wondering the same himself. I dunno. You guys stink though, Luffy said, scrunching his nose up at the reminder. Sabo laughed while Ace rolled his eyes. Well duh, he muttered, but Luffy either didn't hear or didn't care. Anyway, the chef is always happy too, and when I feel people's emotions they're happy too, except Marco, he's always muddled, like he's bored, but sometimes there's a little bit of happy in it, oh, and a warm feeling too, Luffy continued. Before responding, Sabo tapped out that he could hear someone coming their way, Izo, before changing the subject. We should take baths when we get our new clothes, so we don't have to keep smelling each other, Sabo said, scrunching up his own nose at the thought. Though they didn't have Luffy's sense of smell, Ace and Sabo could still smell how bad they smelled. For once, I can't wait to have a bath, Ace said, pushing Luffy off his stomach and sitting up, ready for their visitor to knock at any moment. I feel gross, Luffy whined, pulling at his shirt and grimacing at himself. Finally, Izo reached their room, an awkward sounding as Sabo put on a smile, opening the door. As expected, Izo stood there holding a neatly folded pile of clothing. Hello there boys. I've brought you all a new set of clothing. There are a few extra shirts and things for throughout the week, but there isn't much, after all. I didn't have the material to make a whole new wardrobe from scratch, Izo said, handing the pile to Sabo who took them, placing them on the bed to sort later. Thank you, Commander, we appreciate your kindness, Sabo said with another polite smile. Being on this pirate ship for so long was a real test to Sabo's abilities to put on different masks. It was no problem. You can go take baths now if you'd like. There's no one in the bathroom at the moment. I made sure. I didn't think you three would be wanting any company, Izo said, pulling out a fan and hiding his face. The brothers did relax marginally at the information, not having thought about that little fact. You're definitely right about that. Thank you again, Commander, Sabo said, this time meaning it a little more than he had the first time. Izo smiled, though it was obscured by the fan, and nodded, turning and leaving the room with a wave. Another sigh of relief escaped Sabo as he closed the door, turning to face his brothers. Well, I guess we should hurry and bathe before anyone decides they want to as well, Sabo said, moving to the pile of clothes they had been given and sorting them. He was actually slightly amazed that they looked to be the right sizes for the brothers, and sorted them according to that, making 3 piles for each brother. Deciding to hang them all up later, Sabo pulled a shirt and pants for each brother out, as well as towels that were at the bottom of the pile, and cradling them all carefully. Alright, let's go, Sabo said to his brothers, the two nodding and following him closely out the door, scanning their surroundings rapidly. There was no one in the hall, so they weren't stopped on their way to the bathroom, the 3 rushing in and closing the door quickly behind them. Finally, time for a bath, Ace exclaimed happily, already throwing his ruined shirt off, moving to heat the water up, courtesy of his firepower. Sabo rolled his eyes but also removed his shirt. Come on Lou, we better stop the hot head before he makes the water too hot, Sabo said, Luffy nodding with a bright grin. As Luffy removed his shirt, Sabo couldn't help but notice the burn marks covering his brother's shoulder from tests Harry had performed. All 3 brothers had lasting scars from that place, and Sabo was grateful Luffy's devil fruit kept him from getting anything more than scars from burns, but it still made his blood boil in anger as he looked at the marks. He and Ace had plenty of burns and scars littering their chests and arms, but they had always done their best to ignore them, pretend they weren't there. The brothers bathed in relative silence, all of them enjoying the relaxing heat soothing their sore muscles. They took turns washing each other's hair for each other, Sabo in charge of making sure Luffy and Ace didn't sink under the water, and by the end of the bath, they were finally clean and feeling better than they had, since they had been kidnapped. Man, I feel great, Ace cried happily, stretching his arms wide over his head as he stepped out of the bath, wrapping a towel around himself, and using his devil fruit to heat his body up and dry himself. And we all smell good again, Luffy cheered just as happily, accepting Sabo's help out of the tub, slightly sluggish from a mix of the water, and having already been tired before the bath. Sabo smiled and laughed a little at the two but got out as well, moving towards their new clothes. It seems Izo is pretty good at making clothes. These are all our sizes, Sabo said, tossing Ace and Luffy their clothes while taking his own. Ace had gotten a yellow button-down shirt with short sleeves that he didn't bother buttoning and black shorts that reached his knees with an orange belt and brown boots that he happily slipped on. Sabo had gotten a blue button-down shirt with long sleeves and a pair of light blue pants with black boots. Luffy had been given a blue tank top with the numbers 56 on it in white and blue jean shorts and sandals which Luffy slipped on happily, swinging his feet from where he sat on a bench, waiting for Ace and Sabo. Do you think we could fit in a nap before lunch? Ace asks, stretching again, the relaxing bath making him tired. Sabo shrugged. Maybe. We should head back to our room now anyway. Sabo said with a shrug, picking up their towels and destroyed clothes. Ace and Luffy nodded their agreement and followed Sabo out the door, the three moving quickly back into their room. Luffy and Ace immediately went to the bed, laying down and falling asleep almost instantly, leaving Sabo to deal with all the clothes. Sabo shook his head but smiled nonetheless as he began hanging their clothes up, looking around their small room again before sitting on the unoccupied bed. Now we just have to get through the rest of the week. Chapter 22. 3 meals a day keeps the nurses away. How far do you think a rubber body can stretch? Do you think everything is rubber? Even the organs? Begin the next test. How long do you think he can stay awake while we do this? The words were ringing inside Luffy's head as he spun around in confusion, but saw nothing but darkness. He had to get out, he had to find Ace and Sabo, they had to get out together. Haru, the test isn't taking effect. Up the dosage. The sound of a man's voice sent violent shivers down Luffy's spine, the words echoing loudly in his ears. Out of the darkness a familiar man walked out with a malicious grin, clipboard in hand. Ah, number 11,097, thought you could try escaping. Well, it seems your brothers are going to be paying for that one. Haru practically cooed out, spinning on his heels and walking back into the darkness, laughing maliciously in the silence. His brothers. They were here too. What did Haru mean by paying? They didn't have money. Luffy moved to run after the doctor, but no matter how fast he ran the man continued moving further away from him. Luffy was near tears now, confused, scared, and alone. Ace Sabo Luffy cried the words out loudly, hoping that one of his brothers would hear him. If anyone would hear him it would be Sabo. Instead of getting an answer, or any noise at all, Luffy's cries were met with silence. Ace. Sabo. Luffy screamed, spinning around as he looked at the blackness around him like it was trying to swallow him whole. Again, there was nothing but a faint echo of his own words fading away. Luffy sank to his knees. Luffy, get up. Ace muttered almost harshly to the youngest, shaking his shoulder in an attempt to jostle the teen awake. Sabo was sitting on the bed with him, looking as concerned as Ace felt. Luffy was curled up in a ball beside them, a distressed look on his face as he made small whimpering noises, tears falling fast down his sleeping face. Come on Luffy, you're just dreaming. Sabo tried, rubbing his brother's arm in an attempt to soothe the boy. There was still no response from the sleeping boy, and it was worrying Ace and Sabo. Right as Sabo was going to try again he heard footsteps heading their way, recognizing them as Marco's light yet determined steps. The first commander's coming. Sabo hissed quietly to Ace, spinning to look at the door. Ace growled lowly, shielding Luffy as much as he could, so that anyone at the door wouldn't be able to see him. Of course he is. Ace spat out, glaring at the door as if it were Marco himself. Sabo listened, hoping the man wasn't coming to their room, but when he heard the footsteps get closer they also got slower, something people did when they were getting ready to stop moving. Sabo cursed under his breath and stood up, making his way to the door as he heard the man knock. Ace was still glaring and shielding Luffy, but he was also shaking him more, trying to get him to wake up before the commander noticed the boy and started asking questions. How can I help you, Commander? Sabo asked, a tense smile on his face as he opened the door for the man. Marco seemed to take notice of the tension that was in the room, and frowned a little, but shrugged it off. I came by to tell you that lunch is ready, Yoi, Marco informed. Sabo nodded, becoming even tenser if possible. Thank you, we'll be by shortly, Sabo said, closing the door without anything further. He was going to worry about how the pirate took the interaction later. Right now his priority was on Luffy, his brother who was stuck in a nightmare. He crossed the room and was back at Luffy's side within seconds, doing his best to help Ace wake him up. All three of them had experienced nightmares on a regular basis, but sometimes they could get stuck in them and couldn't get up. They didn't understand why it happened, because shouldn't you wake up when two people are shaking you and yelling at you to wake up? They chalked it up to the doctors injecting them with something that caused it. Either way, whenever one of them got stuck in their nightmares the other two would try their hardest to wake them up, doing anything they could think of. Sabo always wondered that, if no one was there to wake them up, would they be stuck in their nightmares forever? He really hoped not, praying that the three of them all didn't get stuck in one of these nightmares at the same time. Wake up Luffy. Ace hissed out, trying not to be too loud to alert anyone passing by their room, but loud enough for Luffy to hear. Sabo frowned at the lack of response and sighed, imbuing hockey into his fingers and pinching Luffy, hoping it would help him wake up. Sometimes using pain as a way to wake them up worked, but not every time. The pinch seemed to work a little, relieving the two. "The job, Lou, you're dreaming, okay? All you gotta do is open your eyes," Sabo encouraged in a gentle tone. "Yeah, that chef made lunch. I bet there's gonna be a lot of food." Ace added, and although the three were worried about eating in the galley with others, the two oldest were more focused on waking Luffy. The youngest started to shift, the tears gradually stopping and his expression evening out, only to furrow in pain and sadness again as he bolted upright, breathing heavy and looking around quickly, eyes darting across everything in the room. Finally, Ace sighed out, assessing Luffy's emotional state. He was very clearly panicked and distressed, and though they wanted to hug him, they knew that might not do any good. Whenever they woke up from one of these nightmares, they didn't always know what was happening. "Luffy, you okay? We're all safe and together," Sabo said, continuing to use his gentle tone. Luffy glanced at Sabo, fear and confusion in his eyes, but his breathing started slowing, returning back to normal. "Yeah, don't worry, we're free," Ace said with such conviction that it seemed to snap Luffy out of his stupor, the boy blinking a few times, eyes finally focusing on Ace and Sabo. "Free?" Luffy asked in a small timid voice. The two nodded, Sabo taking the chance to rub Luffy's back now that he seemed more focused and awake. "That's right, Luffy, we're free and safe, and we've got lunch waiting for us," Sabo said soothingly, further calming Luffy down, allowing him to take a few recovering breaths before the blonde stood. "And speaking of, we should go. We don't want them coming here, and if we don't go they might send us back to the infirmary," Sabo said with a frown. Even as he tried to convince Ace and Luffy that they had to go, he himself didn't want to. Ace frowned. "But Sabo, there's gonna be a whole lot of pirates in there." Ace growled out, trying to stay calm and quiet, but just the thought of the number of people in there set him on edge. Luffy hugged his knees to his chest, not voicing his thoughts, but showing them as clearly as if he had spoken. "I know that, it's not like I want to do it either. But I'd much rather sit through a few minutes of that than a few hours, or even seconds, in the infirmary. It's the lesser of two evils." Sabo tried reasoning, both with his brothers and himself. "Or, option 3, stay in here and ignore everyone who tries talking to us," Ace muttered. Sabo glared at him. "And starve. Ace, we've gotta last until Shanks gets here at least. You wouldn't be able to survive even a few days without food before I would force you to go to the infirmary," Sabo said, knowing just how fast Ace and Luffy's bodies burned calories. Ace glared back at Sabo, but before he could say anything Sabo interrupted him. "Look, I don't like it, you don't like it, and Luffy doesn't like it, but we have to. We can't just not eat, and we have to stay on their good sides. This is how we do that, it's the safest option," Sabo reasoned. Ace still looked like he wanted to argue, and Sabo was sure he would, so he said the first thing that came to mind to get his stubborn brother to listen. "If you don't, I'll go by myself," Sabo said in a rush, not really thinking over his words but trying to look calm. He was freaking out just by the idea, and Ace and Luffy's whitening eyes showed their own shock at the thought, but Sabo tried steeling himself, crossing his arms and trying to put on an air of confidence. What, you wouldn't? You're bluffing." Ace stuttered out, standing from the bed to examine Sabo closer for any signs of cracking. The blonde was sure Luffy could feel his fear, and hoped the boy wouldn't comment on it as he looked at Ace directly in the eyes. "Oh my?" he asked simply, uncrossing his arms and making his way to the door. He tried to keep his hands from shaking as he felt Ace and Luffy's eyes glued to his back, watching his every move as he lifted his hand to the doorknob, grabbing it, and taking a deep breath before pulling it open. "Sabo, don't be an idiot," Ace hissed quietly at the blonde now that the door was open. Sabo tried to ignore Ace and his own thoughts as he stepped out. He could hear a quick shuffle of movement from the room as he walked out and heard Ace curse before Luffy was running up to his side and grabbing his hand. The boy looked petrified and was holding on to Sabo's hand almost too tightly, but Sabo allowed the pain, letting it ground him as he looked at the straw-hatted boy staring up at him. I don't want Sabo to go alone," Luffy said in the same quiet timid voice as before, shifting nervously from foot to foot, very obviously terrified. "Fucking hell." He heard Ace mutter behind him as he left the room as well, closing the door behind him as he begrudgingly walked up beside him too, shuffling his feet. Sabo looked at him for a moment but didn't say anything, internally relieved that he wouldn't have to go alone, sending Luffy warm comforting feelings and thanks. He knew that it must have been hard for Luffy to follow him, especially right after being stuck in a nightmare, but he had come anyway, and Sabo was proud of him. The three made the trek to the galley in silence, Ace's hands in his pockets as he kept an eye out on their surroundings. No one was in the hallway, and even as they got closer to the galley, they didn't see that many people, most probably already in the galley or elsewhere on the ship. "Alright, this'll be easy, we can eat quickly and then get out," Sabo said, taking some deep breaths. All of them were fidgeting now, and they looked on the verge of panic attacks, but they did their best to calm down. "Don't even bother with manners either, there's no use," Sabo said as an afterthought, knowing it was true. Manners were ingrained in his brain and he couldn't not use them, but Ace and Luffy had to force themselves to, and if they tried that now, they wouldn't be able to. Ace and Luffy nodded, Luffy trying to soak in all the warm happy feelings he could as his stomach turned and twisted, making him nauseous. He was hungry, but he was worried too, and he didn't know if he could do this. Let's go, Sabo said softly, placing a hand on the door and pausing for a second to gather himself before pushing it open. Even outside the three could hear the loud chatter from the pirates, but as they walked in timidly, it seemed to get even louder. No one noticed their entrance, everyone focused on their own conversations or food, which made the brothers feel a little better as they stood in the doorway, not quite sure what to do now. Sabo hadn't thought that much ahead. He could see Whitebeard and the other commanders sitting at their own table, Whitebeard noticing them first and then the rest of the commanders as well. This put them on edge as Marco stood and made his way over to them, gaining more and more of the pirates' attention, as conversation slowly stopped and heads turned their way in curiosity. The three tensed at the attention, and Sabo was beginning to regret coming here, deciding that Ace's plan seemed much better than this, but couldn't dwell on that as Marco reached them. Sabo could see Ace's anger rising, not because he was really angry with anything, but because he didn't like the attention, and didn't know how to deal with the uneasy feelings, channeling them to anger instead. Everybody get back to eating, Yoi, Marco called out, grabbing the brothers' attention. Luffy shifted, staring at Marco with a look that even Sabo didn't understand, deciding to ask him about it later. Sorry about them, Yoi. Thatch made you three some food, you can come sit with us if you want. Marco said with an air of indifference to the situation which helped the three be put at ease, though still very obviously tense. Thank you, Commander. Sabo managed to say, albeit weakly, hoping the man wouldn't comment on it. The commander didn't, though he did look at Sabo for an extra second longer, glancing over the other two as well before nodding and turning, the brothers following close behind. Not wanting to get left behind when there was still plenty of eyes on them. The group walked in silence until they reached the table where the commanders and Whitebeard were sitting, Marco gesturing to the empty seats as he sat down in his spot. The brothers hesitated a moment before sitting, nearly jumping in shock when Thatch came out of nowhere, placing dishes in front of them piled high with food that smelled just as good as always. Sabo forced himself to start eating, going at a normal pace, while Ace and Luffy sat looking around apprehensively. Sabo knew they were wondering how the crew would react to their eating habits, and Sabo wondered when they had started to care about what others thought. Eventually, the two started eating as well, and while it wasn't as mannerly and neat as Sabo, it wasn't as messy and fast as they normally ate either. You know, the three immediately tensed at the sound of someone speaking, scared of what they were going to say. They hadn't really planned on talking to anyone and were hoping no one would talk to them in response, but that obviously wasn't going to be the case. I didn't believe Thatch when he said you three ate a lot, but I guess it's true. A man they hadn't talked to before said, a cigar in his mouth. The brothers didn't know how to respond as they slowed in their eating, glancing at each other. Why wouldn't you believe me? Have I ever steered you wrong? Thatch asked in mock hurt, holding his heart dramatically. The man rolled his eyes and huffed out a laugh. Is it even a question I need to answer? He asked, Thatch dramatically falling to his knees where he stood behind the brothers. Your words wouldn't be false. Thatch cried, crocodile tears filling his eyes. The brothers started eating at their normal pace again, seeing as the attention wasn't directed on them anymore. They just wanted to finish quickly so they could leave. Ah, Thatch, you're such a drama queen. Another person laughed. Or not. I'll have you know, Haruta, that I'm the drama king, thank you. Thatch said, getting over his mock sadness as he sprung to his feet, placing his hands on his hips and puffing out his chest. All the commanders collectively rolled their eyes at the chef, Haruta laughing loudly. The brothers all stopped eating at the name Thatch had said, freezing mid-bites and staring at Haruta with wide eyes. One of the commanders noticed first, raising an eyebrow at them. You guys okay? They asked, but the brothers weren't really listening. Haruta Luffy mumbled out softly, everyone's attention on them now. Haruta was especially confused, tilting his head slightly. Yeah, that's my name, why? Haruta asked, the brothers collectively shivering as memories of a certain doctor filled their minds. Haruta Luffy mumbled again, a little louder than last time. What? Fasa asked, everyone still very confused, even Whitebeard who was watching the interaction closely. Luffy turned to look back at his food, picking at it with his fork and moving it around. Your name's Rita now, Luffy said, his brothers seeming to snap out of their trances, as well as they turned their attention back to their food as well, though none of them were interested in eating anymore as they picked at it, taking bites out of habit rather than hunger. My name's Rita. Haruta questioned in pure confusion, the commanders giving each other equal looks of uncertainty. They didn't get any more responses from any of the brothers, so they all shrugged. Well, nice to meet you, Rita. Thatch said, smiling widely and placing his hand out as if meeting Haruta for the first time. Haruta rolled his eyes but gripped Thatch's hand in his. Nice to meet you too, though you never gave me your name Poofy Hair, Haruta said with a grin, the commander's confusion turning into joy as they all laughed once more. Marco shared a glance with Whitebeard, both wondering just what exactly happened a moment ago, but decided now wasn't the time to ask the brothers, instead deciding to watch them once more as they ate. Lunch continued on this way, the brothers eating quickly while the commanders joked with each other, ignoring the brothers for the most part. When the brothers finished lunch they quickly got up from their seats and practically ran back to their room, Ace nearly slamming the door shut as they all piled into their room, leaning against the door and breathing heavily. Luffy and Sabo sat on the floor in front of him, doing the same. That was torture. Ace groaned out, sliding to the ground, back still against the door. Luffy and Sabo nodded in agreement, falling back, laying down on the ground and staring at the ceiling. Only have to do that 3 times a day for the rest of the week. Sabo huffed out. Ace groaned again, his head falling against the door. Do we have to? Maybe we can skip breakfast. Ace tried, wanting to do that as little as possible. Sabo frowned, raising his head to glare at the oldest. Not when you two barely make it to lunch even with breakfast. You need the nutrients. Sabo said, letting his head fall again. Screw nutrients, I was just fine in the facility. Ace mumbled out, immediately regretting the words as they came out of his mouth. Luffy looked at him in silent shock, feeling Sabo's anger rising as the blonde practically jumped up off the floor. Are you kidding me, Ace? You were not just fine in the facility. If anything, you were just 1 step from death. Sabo shouted, angrier than Luffy had ever felt the normally cool-headed brother to be. The youngest was watching the two with wide eyes, not quite sure what to do. Sometimes it was better to just let the two yell at each other. The warm feelings usually came back after they did, so Luffy decided to sit silently and not get in the way of his arguing brothers, quietly standing and moving to sit on the bed. Well, isn't going to eat with the pirates the same thing? Except we're willingly going 1 step closer to our death. Ace asked, ready to say anything to keep them from going to any more meals with the people who could easily kill them in seconds without warning. Sabo's glare never left his face, and if anything it only intensified. No, it's not the same thing, not at all. We're actually being held here, getting fed, getting proper medical treatment, and all we have to do is smile and nod and bear with it for a week. I know you hate it, but it'll be over soon and we can go home. Sabo said, his voice slowly getting quieter at the end, glare softening slowly until it fell completely, and he was frowning. All 3 of them went silent as they remembered their home, the forest, the treehouse, Dayton, even the trash heap known as the Great Terminal. But, Sabo eventually said, breathing out heavily, as if exhausted. We only need to eat 3 times a day. Other than that, we can stay here, only leave when we absolutely have to. Sabo said softly, looking at Ace with almost pleading eyes, not wanting to continue fighting with him on the matter. Ace was silent another moment before he nodded his agreement, crossing his arms and pouting slightly. Yeah, fine. I can't wait for this week to be over. Ace grumbled angrily, standing and joining Luffy on the bed. Sabo smiled slightly, standing as well and shaking his head. In the meantime, why don't we work on moving this bed? Sabo asked, gesturing to the second bed a few feet away from the one in the corner that Ace and Luffy were on. That became the mission for the 3 brothers for the next few hours while waiting for dinner. Everything in their room was bolted to the ground so it didn't move around during storms or rough waters, so it was hard for the brothers to figure out how to pry the bolts out of the ground. After rummaging around and finding nothing that could help them, the 3 sat on the ground, staring at the bolts in question. I could melt them, Ace muttered, glaring at the bolts. Sabo shook his head. If you melt them then the pirates will get suspicious. The blonde said thoughtfully, finger on his chin as he thought about their predicament. Oh? What if we pull REALLY hard? Luffy asked, raising his hand and smiling brightly at the idea. Ace turned to glare at Luffy, Sabo holding back a laugh. We can't pull them out, idiot, we wouldn't be able to grip them. Ace said, gesturing to the bolts that were rounded at the top, giving them no way to grip and even attempt to pull them out. You could reshape the tops, Sabo said, wondering if this plan of his would work. What? Ace asked, confusion showing on his face. Sabo shrugged, gesturing to the bolts again. The tops. You could reshape them, heat them up enough to mold them into a grippable shape, and then if we can pull them out and move the bed we can put them back, and you can mold them back to their original shape. Sabo explained, Luffy nodding the entire time as if he understood the plan perfectly, while Ace frowned. Alright. Ace mumbled, moving closer to the bed and heating his fingers up as hot as possible, gripping the bolt tightly. It took a few minutes, but eventually, it got pliable enough that Ace was able to mold a shape out of the top, letting go and moving on to the next one, letting the previous one cool. He continued doing this while Luffy and Sabo talked about what they could do after, Luffy wishing they had chalk or something to draw with. Eventually, Sabo's plan had worked, though he was even surprised when they were able to pry the bolts out of the ground with their bare hands. He knew they were strong, but he didn't think they would have been able to do it so easily. They didn't think too long on it though as they moved the bed closer to the other, replacing the bolts in the legs and having Ace remold them. By then it was dinner, and Marco came once again to tell them, this time the brothers leaving with the first commander and following him to the galley, wanting to finish dinner as quickly as possible. Like last time all attention was on them as they walked in, but Marco once again shooed them away, guiding them to the table where the commanders and captains sat, all of them greeting the brothers with smiles and waves. Someone had mentioned that the brothers hadn't been properly introduced to the commanders, so one by one the brothers learned their names. Marco, Thatch, Izo, Jozu, Fossa, Harida, or as the brothers adamantly stuck to, Ruda, Vista, Blominko, Rikuyo, Namur, Blenheim, Curiel, Kingdu, Atmos, and finally Jir. It was a lot of names and faces, and Sabo was sure that Ace and Luffy had already forgotten most of them in the few seconds after the introductions had been made. Sabo did his best to remember them though, not wanting it to be an issue during their time on the ship. I didn't see you out at all after lunch. Did you guys stay in your room? Thatch questioned at one point, making the brothers pause in their eating like they normally did whenever they were spoken to. Yes, we were tired so we stayed in there all day, Sabo said carefully, hoping the chef wouldn't have an issue with it. Thatch smiled brightly though, nodding. Makes sense, you've only been out of the infirmary a day after all. You should try and come out tomorrow though, I'm sure it's no fun to stay cooped up in there all day. Thatch encouraged Sabo, giving him a small smile and nod. Yeah, maybe. The blonde said softly, not having any intention of leaving the room tomorrow, or at all. Pleased with the response, Thatch returned to eating before someone in the kitchen called him away. Dinner hadn't been much more eventful, but the commanders did keep glancing at the brothers like they wanted to ask them something, but would stop themselves. It unsettled the three, and when they finished their food they left just as quickly as they had left lunch, not looking back once. This is gonna be a long week. Chapter 23. Warmth Overload. The Whitebeard pirates all watched as the three brothers rushed out of the galley, practically running back to their room. The majority shrugged it off, returning back to their food with mutters of strange kids and leaving it at that, but the commanders shared glances with each other, turning to their captain. That's the second time they ran out of here the second they finished their food, Kingdu mentioned, taking a bite of his own plate. Thatch was walking back now, pouting. Aw, I miss them. Thatch whined, sitting beside Izo who rolled his eyes, pulling out his fan. You didn't miss much, Thatch. They ran away like last time, didn't even say goodbye, Izo said, though there wasn't any malice or annoyance in his tone as he spoke. Don't take offense, children, those three brats probably aren't comfortable with eating in such a crowded space, Whitebeard said calmly, though even he was slightly disappointed that the three teens hadn't gotten used to the size of the crew yet. He knew they wouldn't be comfortable immediately, but he had hoped that they would have seen by now that they weren't a threat. He supposed that they had their reasons though, and would continue being patient with them. They don't seem to like the attention, Yoi, Marco added in support of his father's words. The commanders nodded, all remembering how the brothers became uncomfortable when they were the center of attention. They also don't like Harida's name either. Vista said, nudging Harida with his elbow. Harida grinned, rolling his eyes. It's Harida now, Vista. Harida playfully scolded, remembering the looks the brothers had when they heard Harida's name mentioned. It is strange how strong of a reaction they had to your name though, Blenheim said, frowning in thought. The commanders all nodded, wondering about it as well. Maybe there was someone with a similar name. You know, in the facility. Thatch questioned. Probably. The only thing we can do now is try and make them as comfortable as possible. Izo said sternly, not wanting anyone to make the teens upset. The commanders once again nodded, returning to their food. This week can't end soon enough. Ace groaned into the pillow. It was the next day now and they had only gotten through breakfast so far today, the meal going as it normally did. I'm bored. Luffy whined, sitting on the edge of the two pushed-together beds, kicking his feet against the ground and frowning in boredom. Before Ace could shout at the youngest, Sabo spoke up, scooting closer to Luffy and putting a hand on his shoulder. Maybe we'll find something we can use to draw with, yeah? Sabo asked with a smile, sending Luffy some warm feelings that made the Raven smile back, nodding. I'm gonna look in the desk again. Oh, and maybe there's some dust we can draw in. Luffy said, already off the bed and digging through the very empty desk. Sabo sighed in relief that the boy was preoccupied for at least a few minutes, turning to Ace. I can't wait for the week to be over either, Ace, but you need to calm down. Luffy can feel your emotions too, remember? If you keep up the angry attitude he'll pick up on it, and I don't want to deal with two hot-headed brothers at the moment. Sabo scolded Ace quietly, noticing the freckled teen's eyes widened at the mention that Luffy could still feel their emotions. They forgot about that at times, only noticing when it was too late, and Luffy was acting completely out of character due to their feelings influencing his. Sorry, Ace mumbled, already trying to send more warm feelings to Luffy, forcing himself to bury the anger that had been there seconds before. Sabo sighed, running a hand through his hair, which definitely needed to be cut. Glancing around he noticed Ace and Luffy's hair, which was in just as desperate a need for a haircut as well, all reached a little past their shoulders. At the facility, the doctors had cut their hair from time to time when it got past their shoulders, but now they were out and didn't have any scissors to help them. It's not your fault, with everything that's happened all of our emotions are off. Sabo sighed out, resting his chin in his hand, elbow on his knee. We should set some goals for ourselves so we can keep ourselves busy. The blonde suddenly said, the thought making him brighten. Ace lifted his head to look at Sabo, raising an eyebrow at him. Goals? Like what? Ace asked. Luffy was done rummaging in the empty desk, a pout on his face as he came back to the bed, sitting down and listening to Sabo as well. Well, small things, like finding something to draw with. Or something to cut our hair with. Sabo suggested, Luffy brightening as well. Like a scavenger hunt. Luffy said happily. Sabo smiled, nodding. Exactly. Whenever we go out for meals or the bathroom, we should keep a lookout for things to keep us entertained. It'll give us something to do and keep us busy. Sabo said, Ace nodding as well, liking the idea. Alright. Hey Luffy, I bet I can find something to draw with faster than you can. Ace challenged with a wide grin, Luffy taking the bait immediately, and arguing that he would. Sabo laughed quietly, happy that they were able to fall into this small bit of normalcy, after everything that had happened in the facility. They were far from healed when it came to all the emotional scarring that the facility had inflicted on them, but when the three were together, and for the moment, safe, it made things bearable. They were able to forget that 7 years of their lives were spent in hell. After Ace and Luffy argued for a little bit, the brothers decided to head to the bathroom, none of them wanting to let the other go alone, so they went together. When they were in their cell, there had been no privacy when it came to using the bathroom, so the three weren't uncomfortable standing in the same room. They filed into the bathroom, shutting the door before anyone could turn into the hallway and see them. While waiting, they rummaged around the bathroom, looking for their first few items. Something to draw with and something to cut their hair with. Seeing as they were in a bathroom, they concluded they were most likely to find something to cut their hair with, and they were right, Luffy presenting a sharp pair of scissors out of a drawer, holding them proudly in the air. I win. Luffy called out happily, Sabo quickly grabbing the scissors from the boy's hand, before he could somehow manage to cause accidental harm with them. The job, Lu, now let's head back, Sabo said with a smile, the three standing in silence as Sabo listened to make sure no one was in the hallway or heading their way. When he gave the all clear, they quickly left the bathroom, speed walking back to their own room and filing in quickly, closing the door quietly. So, who wants to go first? Sabo asked, holding the scissors up and snipping them a few times, smiling. Ace volunteered, going to sit in the desk chair. They didn't have a brush, so Sabo opted to use his fingers, pulling apart the tangles and knots slowly, as to not hurt the oldest, though even if he didn't, he was sure it wouldn't bother Ace. Luffy was hopping around them excitedly, ready to watch Sabo cut Ace's hair. The older two were pretty sure that if they had more activities for Luffy, he wouldn't have wanted to watch, but with how bored the youngest was, watching Sabo do Ace's hair was more than entertaining. How short do you want it? Sabo asked after he finished pulling out the tangles. Ace shrugged, not having thought about it. About this much, Ace said, putting his hand about midway between his head and shoulder. Sabo nodded and started concentrating, tongue sticking out as he began cutting away the raven hair. Don't forget there, and there, oh, and there. Luffy added, trying to be helpful as he pointed out every spot he felt Sabo needed to cut at. Ace sat patiently, the minutes ticking by quickly, and before he knew it, Sabo was finished, his head already feeling lighter. Good thing we've done this before, Ace said, running his fingers through his hair a few times to get rid of any extra pieces that hadn't fallen. Sabo grinned, nodding, remembering the times they had cut each other's hair back in the forest, before the facility. Alright Luffy, your turn, Sabo said, the boy falling happily into the seat, his smile never leaving as he kicked his feet. Sabo began the process of untangling the hair as much as he could, scolding Luffy for moving too much already, while Ace began telling Luffy stories, in an attempt to settle the boy down. When Sabo began cutting the hair away, Luffy informing him how short he wanted it, he was relieved that the teen seemed to understand that he needed to sit still now, if he wanted his hair to turn out alright. With Ace and Luffy's hair now cut, it was Sabo's turn, the blonde handing the scissors over to Ace, none of them trusting Luffy to be able to do it. His brother was meticulous when it came to cutting hair, making sure every strand was untangled and smooth before cutting away what was necessary. When finished, Sabo did the same thing Ace and Luffy had done, running his fingers through his hair, trying to get used to the feeling of his hair ending sooner than expected. Now we gotta clean this mess up and get these scissors back before anyone notices they're gone, Ace said, using said scissors to point at the clumps of hair on the ground. Sabo nodded his agreement, the two oldest sweeping the hair into their hands, and putting it in the trash in the corner of their room, Sabo taking the scissors back to the bathroom quickly, using his hearing to get there and back unnoticed. When Sabo returned, he could already hear footsteps turning down the hallway they were in. Marco's coming. It's probably lunchtime, Sabo said to Ace and Luffy, the two sitting on the bed. Sabo stayed at the door, ready to open it when Marco knocked, while Ace and Luffy got up as well, ready to get the meal over with. It was getting a little easier to go to the galley, though they still didn't like it at all. When the knock sounded, Sabo greeted the commander, who merely raised an eyebrow at the brothers' now shorter hair, and then they were on their way to the galley, Luffy in between his brothers per usual, while they all stayed on guard, ready for anything as they made the short trip through the halls. Luffy had been spending most of their time in the galley, taking in as many feelings as he could, searching for even one person with the darkness in them, but he had yet to find anyone with it. The crew was huge, and Luffy knew that there had to be at least one person with the darkness in them. He stayed close to his brothers, and when they reached the galley he let the emotions pour into him. He was filled with multiple emotions at once, from joy and happiness to exhaustion and annoyance. He sifted through the many emotions, looking for any malice or darkness, as he made his way to the table with his brothers, Thatch placing plates in front of them. He ate almost on autopilot, letting his brothers do any talking that was needed, as he kept his eyes glued to the food in front of him. Joy, happy, satisfied, hungry, tired, bored, annoyed, irritated. The list went on, and Luffy blocked the many emotions from entering him, not wanting to tip the pirates off to anything weird if he started laughing from letting too much happiness influence him, or screaming because he let too much annoyance get to him. His brothers kept a close eye on him, sending warm feelings his way in an attempt to balance out the many different emotions they knew Luffy was experiencing, trying to keep him grounded. That was when Luffy realized he was feeling the warm feeling from others around them who weren't Ace and Sabo. He hadn't expected to feel the feeling from anyone else besides his brothers. After all, the doctors had never experienced that emotion. He didn't know others could feel it. He still didn't quite know the name of it, but the closest he had gotten to describing it had been lover home. Both seemed to fit, but they didn't fully explain the feeling, so Luffy never thought a better name other than warm. Almost every pirate in the room was emitting this warm feeling, even if it was only a little bit, but there was someone emitting a high amount of it, more than Luffy had ever felt coming from one person before. He tried pinpointing where the person emitting the feeling was, trying to filter out all the other emotions in the room in search of the person. He had paused in his eating, his brothers noticing immediately and focusing their attention more on him, but not making it obvious to the talkative commanders sitting with them. Darkness. Ace tapped out on Luffy's leg, ready to bolt if Luffy answered affirmatively. Luffy shook his head minutely, still focusing on dimming the feelings of everyone else. The commanders seemed to take notice of Luffy's pause as well, turning their attention on the boy who was staring mutely at his food, fork raised halfway from his plate to his mouth. "You okay, Luffy?" Thatch asked gently, concerned. Luffy suppressed the feeling he could feel coming from the chef, no matter how strong it was. He was close to figuring out where the warm feeling was. Ace and Sabo were now openly looking at their brother as well, wondering what was happening. Luffy raised his head from his plate, glancing around the galley as he got closer to figuring it out. It wasn't coming from the right or from behind him. Not in front of him, so that leaves the left. "What's the matter?" Namor asked, all commanders now all having stopped eating in favor of focusing on Luffy. Whitebeard was watching with interest as well. The warm feeling was being paired with a feeling of concern, but Luffy ignored that as well, noticing that whoever this was coming from was close to him and his brothers. Luffy's eyes scanned the area again, his brothers doing the same in hopes of seeing whatever Luffy was searching for. The commanders instinctively did the same, thinking there might be a threat or at least something that was unsettling the youngest of the trio. There it was. Luffy's eyes snapped to the captain, Whitebeard, and his mouth opened slightly in almost awe. Everyone at the table was looking at him again, the rest of the pirates in the galley, oblivious to what was happening. Ace and Sabo, now noticing their brother's target, stiffened slightly, not sure what Luffy was detecting from the giant. No one knew why the boy was staring so wide-eyed at the captain, not even Whitebeard himself. Luffy couldn't bring himself to look away from Whitebeard, relishing in just how much warmth was coming from the man, the feeling filling Luffy quickly, pushing away any other feelings he might have been feeling at that moment. The warmth made the youngest feel at peace, like nothing bad could happen, as long as this warmth never went away. Any tenseness in Luffy faded away, the boy practically slumping to the floor if not for Ace catching him from falling backward off the bench. Everyone was concerned for him, and Hercule was about ready to call for a nurse, while Ace and Sabo tried grabbing Luffy's attention, not knowing what was happening. Luffy suddenly felt sleepy, at complete peace. Nothing bad could happen. Not when there was a warmth blanketing him, lulling him to relax. His eyelids drooped closed slowly, but he forced them to reopen. He could hear mumbles around him, but they were fuzzy, like when he was underwater. He tried listening to what they were saying, but that warm feeling was so nice, he didn't want to let it go. He could feel himself slipping into darkness, and he let it happen, embracing it. A part of him was objecting to doing this though, telling him that he was worrying his brothers, and it was enough to stop him from slipping completely. He opened his eyes again, trying his best to focus on his surroundings, no matter how tired and relaxed he felt. He tried sitting up, noticing he was leaning into something. His senses were slowly coming back to him as he resisted the warmth, allowing him to become more aware. "Nurse." "He's fine, no nurse." Luffy knew that voice, it was his brother, Ace, and Luffy could hear the tiny amount of fear hidden in his voice. Why was Ace scared? Was it because of him? Things began getting clear, his vision sharpening, his ears picking up on noises again, his sense of smell returning. "Luffy?" Sabo's voice was soft in his ear. He turned to look at his brother, letting the warm feeling leave him slowly, though part of him still wanted to pull it back in, to let it envelop him again. "Are you okay?" Luffy noticed that the galley had fallen silent, and now everyone was watching him, concern floating like a cloud in the air. Luffy closed his mouth, which had been open the entire time, and nodded, the feeling of exhaustion not having left him. Luffy hummed out quietly, sitting up on his own, realizing Ace had been supporting him. Luffy mumbled out, rubbing his eyes. What happened? You gave us all a scare there. Luffy looked up at the voice, recognizing the man as Fasa. The boy shrunk in on himself, all the attention suddenly catching up to him, as he realizes how many people were looking at him. I dunno tired, Luffy mumbled softly, the commanders and captain just barely picking up on it. Before anyone else could say anything, Sabo and Ace stood, Luffy realizing he had missed whatever they had tapped to each other. We're gonna take him back to our room. Sorry for the scare. Sabo said politely, bowing slightly with a strained smile on his lips, as Ace pulled him off the bench. It was then that they both realized Luffy couldn't stand on his own, his legs feeling like jelly. Ace wrapped an arm around Luffy's middle, Sabo doing the same on Luffy's other side, and the two supported the boy, as they made their way back to the room as quick as they could, the tension making their skin crawl and motivate them to move faster. If those stupid nurses hadn't ordered them to not do anything strenuous, Ace would have lifted his brother onto his back and ran to the room, but they just barely got away with getting the commanders to hold out on calling a nurse for Luffy. He wasn't going to push it. He also had to play the hurt kid as well, so the pirates didn't know that he was fully healed, wanting to keep that little known fact to himself. Sabo had the same thoughts as they raced back to the room, practically dragging Luffy along in between them. He was worried that the pirates would be upset with their sudden departure, as well as their refusal for a nurse. They didn't need the pirates turning on them after whatever had just happened to Luffy. When they were in the relative safety of their room, Ace and Sabo guided Luffy to the bed, laying him down gently. What happened back there, Lu? Sabo asked gently, still worried about his baby brother. Luffy's eyebrows knitted together as he thought about it. I don't know, I was looking for the darkness. Luffy shuddered at the mention of the bad feeling. And then I felt a lot of the warmth coming from someone. Luffy continued, still a little disoriented. It was a lot of warmth, more than Ace or Sabo have ever made, and I tried figuring out where the mystery person was, Luffy said, trying to remember exactly what happened. The memory's a bit fuzzy after the emotional overload. The captain? Sabo questioned, remembering how Luffy had seemed to focus on the man. He and Ace were listening intently, knowing Luffy hadn't felt the warm feeling from anyone but his brothers before. Yeah. It was Big Mustache Man. And then the warmth just kept coming and coming, and it felt really nice, so I let it, but then I felt sleepy and relaxed, and safe, and I wanted to sleep. Luffy said, nodding rapidly. Ace and Sabo frowned, glancing at each other. They knew that emotions from others could influence Luffy, but they never affected his functioning before. Normally they just influence what he felt at that moment, but if this warm feeling could incapacitate their brother, they had to be careful with just how much they sent him. Luffy, you have to be careful next time. If the warm feeling can make you do that, it wouldn't be good, especially not now when we're on this ship. Ace said sternly, worried for his brother's safety. Luffy nodded in understanding. I won't let it happen next time, even if it is a nice feeling. Luffy said in determination, making Ace and Sabo smile, Ace moving to ruffle his brother's hair. Why don't you take a nap, Luffy? You still look exhausted, Sabo said, moving the blankets from underneath Luffy and tucking him in. The youngest nodded and curled into the blankets, eyes closing as he smiled. Wake me up for dinner, Luffy said cheerily, as if everything that happened in the galley hadn't really happened. Ace and Sabo sat in silence for a few minutes until Luffy's breathing evened out, signaling he was asleep. That was odd, Jozu muttered, watching the retreating brothers' backs as they stumbled off. The commanders nodded in agreement. What the heck was that? Thatch asked, concerned for the youngest. We should tell Whiskey about this, maybe something's wrong. Didn't she say that there could be something bad in Luffy's blood? Haruta asked, worry on his face. Yeah, but Ace and Sabo seemed pretty adamant about no nurses, Namor added, some nodding their agreement, remembering the vehement rejections the older two gave when they mentioned getting Whiskey. They're terrified of nurses though, even if one of them was terminally ill. I don't think they would want a nurse checking up on them, Aizo said, moving a loose strand of hair from his face. Either way, I'll tell Whiskey after lunch, Even if it was nothing serious, we're better safe than sorry, Marco said stoically. And what was with the look he gave Pops? Atmos asked, everyone, remembering the look on Luffy's face as he had gazed over at Whitebeard, mouth fulling open and eyes whitening slightly before they had glazed over. He looked like he was looking for something before focusing on Oyaji, Blenheim said, remembering the way the kid had glanced around before focusing on the giant. Whatever it was interesting. Whitebeard rumbled, hand on his chin in thought. When the boy had looked at him, it didn't feel like he had been looking at him, rather he had been looking at something deeper. Whitebeard could feel his interest in the boys peaking, his curiosity growing. These boys were a puzzle, one that he was interested in solving. Chapter 24. Heated arguments and lost Luffy's. It was now Thursday. Shanks was scheduled to arrive at the Moby on Monday. Time was passing too damn slow. The brothers were in their room per usual, but there was nothing to do in said room. It was empty, bare, with nothing to entertain themselves with. Ace was pacing around in boredom and pent-up frustration, trying to muffle it in case Luffy started getting influenced by it. Sabo was laying on the bed, staring at the ceiling in boredom, no distinct emotion coming from him as he stared, making shapes in the wood grain. Luffy was beside Sabo, laying on his side and staring at the wall across the room. He wanted to do something, but there was nothing. They had spent 7 years in a cell, and even that was more entertaining than this room. At least they had been occupied with other things. Luffy had recovered after the event at lunch yesterday, and when dinner had come they were sent a lot of questioning looks, but no one asked anything which they were grateful for. Suddenly Luffy sat upright, nose twitching, already slightly burning at the scent coming their way. Ace and Sabo noticed this, and Sabo focused on the sounds coming from outside their room, noticing a familiar pair of determined footsteps heading their way. He stiffened, hoping that the footsteps would turn away from them, that they weren't actually coming their way, but he was proven wrong as they turned to walk down the hallway their room was in. What's happening? What's coming? Ace asked, oblivious to who was on their way. Whiskey, Sabo said softly, sitting up and scrambling off of the bed, Luffy moving more to the corner, trying to get as far away from the door as possible. Ace tensed as well at the nurse's name, clenching his jaw as he spun to face the door, fists clenched. They told her about yesterday. Ace practically growled out, glaring at the wooden door that separated him from their worst nightmare. Sabo nodded, agreeing with Ace. Most likely, Sabo said tensely, biting the inside of his cheek in an attempt to stay calm and grounded. He didn't want to feel too many negative emotions, careful of influencing Luffy. A knock on the door had all of them tensing even more, Sabo swallowing hard and taking a deep breath, as he raised his shaky hand to the knob, preparing himself. When he pulled the door open he was met with a blank-faced Whiskey, giving him no indication as to how the nurse was feeling. She offered the blonde a smile after a second though, waving a little. Hello there, I know you guys would rather I not be here, but I heard about what happened to Luffy, and I wanted to make sure he was okay. Whiskey said, trying to peek into the room, but Sabo was effectively blocking her view of anything but himself. We appreciate that, but he's fine, really, he was just tired. Sabo tried explaining it to the nurse as calmly as he could, trying to keep the strain from his voice. Whiskey wasn't convinced though and frowned a little, putting Sabo even more on edge, remembering Hair, and how he would smile pleasantly at first, until he was denied something. He would frown and then inflict punishment on whoever had denied him of his intentions. I just want to do a small checkup. Seeing as I don't have any of his blood, we can't be sure that whatever happened yesterday wasn't because of a drug still in his system. Whiskey said, practically standing on her tiptoes in an attempt at even catching a glance of Luffy. The brothers knew that what happened yesterday hadn't been because of a drug, but they couldn't exactly explain that to the nurse, without giving away too much information about themselves and the facility itself, so Sabo was stuck in a predicament. He didn't want to make the nurse mad, but every time he denied her from coming into the room, she seemed to get more and more annoyed with them, and that wouldn't be good if she suddenly turned on them and told the pirates. On the other hand, he couldn't just let her in to examine Luffy, she would probably try to take his blood or do tests, or even worse, send him back to the infirmary. They definitely couldn't be sent back there, that was for sure. But that left Sabo stuck in a jam, caught in between wanting to play the nice patient, but also keeping himself and his brothers safe. After the checkup, I'll leave, as long as this really was nothing. Whiskey insisted, and Sabo bit his lip, glancing into the room quickly. Ace was sending glares to the nurse, though she couldn't see them, and Luffy was curled in on himself so much that he looked like a child again. Sabo really didn't want to let the nurse in, but it was their best option. Turning back to face Whiskey he nodded, although very hesitantly, forcing a smile to grace his lips. Alright, Sabo said simply, slowly stepping away from the door and letting the nurse in. Ace did his best to remove the glare from his face, knowing he had to play nice too, and instead opted to go comfort Luffy who was forcing himself to at least move closer to the nurse. No matter how uncomfortable he was with it. Whiskey stepped into the room, glancing questioningly at the beds that had been moved together, wondering how they had gotten there. Did you three move the bed closer? She asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Sabo, remembering Whiskey telling them not to strain themselves, spoke quickly before Luffy or Ace could say anything, though he was pretty sure they were too focused on keeping their composure to answer. No, they were already like this. Sabo managed weakly, knowing it was a horrible lie. Marco had seen the room before when the beds had been apart, and for all Sabo knew none of the rooms on this ship had two beds pushed together like this. But unless Whiskey expected them to have somehow managed to get their hands on tools to remove the bolts in the ground, she would have to believe Sabo. She nodded at Sabo's poor excuse, still looking slightly confused, but she shrugged it off quickly, moving closer to Luffy who was now sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for the nurse to come over and do her checkup. Ace sat beside him, rubbing his back soothingly in an attempt to calm the youngest down, he and Sabo both sending Luffy warm feelings, but making sure to not send too much, as to not have a repeat of what got them into this mess in the first place. Well, in any case, as I said before, I'm just gonna do a quick checkup to make sure everything's okay. Whiskey explained before getting to work, trying to move as fast as she could so she could be done quickly, not wanting to make the brothers any more uncomfortable than they already were. By the time she finished she found nothing wrong, finding herself agreeing with the brothers that Luffy had probably just been tired, and after a good night's rest he was better. Everything looks good. Thank you for letting me do the checkup. Whiskey said as she stood back up, some of the brothers' tension easing away, though not completely. Whiskey was sure they wouldn't fully relax until she was out of the room. No problem, thank you for your concern, Sabo said in the same polite tone he always used as he walked with Whiskey to the door, Ace wrapping an arm around Luffy's shoulder and pulling him close, whispering something to him, probably something to comfort him. Marco told me that breakfast would be ready soon, you could probably head there now though, there won't be that many people there, and I'm sure Thatch would be more than happy to give you a plate early. Whiskey said, having heard how uncomfortable the brothers got when it came to crowds and attention. Thank you Whiskey, we'll head there now, Sabo said, wanting the nurse out of the room, so he could make sure Luffy was okay. With a quick goodbye Whiskey finally left the room, Sabo closing the door with a sigh of relief, as he quickly returned to his little brother's side, glancing at Ace with worried eyes. Hey Lou, you okay? Sabo asked softly, not wanting to startle the youngest. Luffy nodded mutely, a small frown on his face as he stared at his hands. It wasn't that the nurse had done anything wrong, Luffy could feel her feelings, could feel that she was worried that she would make the brothers uncomfortable, could feel that she really did just want to help, but just her presence, her smell, set Luffy on edge. Reminding him of Haru and the other doctors, and the facility itself. Neither brother had the heart to say anything else on the matter, both deciding to silently support the youngest through what they knew were painful memories. After a few minutes of silence, Luffy forced himself out of the memories, remembering the nurse mentioning food, which reminded him how hungry he was. Can we go get breakfast? Luffy asked softly, not wanting to talk any louder. Ace and Sabo shared a look before they nodded, standing. If we're lucky there won't be too many people there like Whiskey said. Ace said with a small smile. Luffy smiled at the thought, standing as well and following his brothers out into the hall. I think she was right, I don't hear too many people in there yet, Sabo mentioned, focusing on the sounds in the galley, blocking out those out on deck or in the kitchen. This lightened the mood between the brothers, happy they wouldn't have to deal with too many people right after the events of both this morning and yesterday. When they entered the galley it was practically barren compared to how it normally was, only a handful of tables actually containing people. The commander's table that they normally sat at only had a few people as well, Izo, Jozu, Fasa, and Haruta. The brothers, not quite sure what to do, walked quickly to the table, sitting in their usual spots on the bench. Good morning boys, sleep well? Izo asked politely, smiling to the three. Sabo smiled back, already used to taking the role of talking to the pirates, Ace and Luffy remaining silent beside him. Yes, thank you. You? Sabo replied courteously, his smile never faltering. Izo shrugged noncommittally, sighing slightly. Oh you know, as well as you can when you've got these barbarians running around yelling all night. Izo huffed, frowning a little and gesturing to the near-empty galley. Jozu laughed beside him. By now it shouldn't faze you Izo, after all, when have the Whitebeard pirates ever been quiet when there are drinks to be had? He asked, raising an eyebrow and smirking. Izo glared at him, pulling out his fan and covering his face. Well, I need my beauty sleep. Couldn't you idiots celebrate in a quieter fashion? Izo grumbled out, this time making Fasa and Haruta laugh as well. What were you guys celebrating? Sabo asked, genuinely curious. The commanders turned to look at him as if forgetting the brothers had been sitting there the entire time. Oh, well one of the groups that had been sent to deal with an issue came back successful. We would have invited you three to join, but after what happened we assumed you wanted to be left alone. Haruta said with a slightly guilty look as if he expected the brothers to be upset with him for not inviting them. Sabo held back his confusion and shook his head. No, it's fine, we turned in early last night, Sabo said, ready to drop the subject. Luffy was taking the time to more clearly determine the commander's emotions, seeing as there were only a few people in the room to interfere with the emotions and make them hard to read. He could only find good feelings in them, and although Lady Not Lady was still a little annoyed, it wasn't much. That's good, we were worried about you, after all, little one. Fasa said, more to Luffy who spun to look at the man, quickly taking check of his feelings, and determining there was nothing bad in them. Because of this Luffy offered the man a small smile, which was enough to tell his brothers that everything was okay so far, allowing Sabo to continue the pleasantries while keeping Ace from glaring suspiciously at the commander. He was just tired was all. After he slept he was good as new. Sabo said, ruffling Luffy's hair affectionately, causing Luffy's smile to widen. The commanders smiled as well. That should be ready with your food, Ruta, why don't you go check? Jozu asked, nearly slipping up with the name, but correcting himself before he could. The brothers were grateful for it, relief filling them, and Sabo was glad they were accommodating enough to use the nickname around them. He was nowhere near comfortable with the pirates, and neither were Ace or Luffy, but he was put at ease slightly when they did small things like that to make the brothers comfortable, even if it turned out that it was all under false attempts at making them happy. Sure, be right back, Haruta said, smiling as he left the table to go check on the food. Sabo sighed internally. They hadn't even gotten food yet, and he was being forced to have pleasant conversation with the commanders. The one bad thing about the lack of people in the galley was there was a lack of distraction for the commanders, leaving all their attention focused on the brothers, or more accurately Sabo, seeing as he was the one who was actually talking. Ace and Luffy were doing their best to stay calm and occupied, while also on guard the entire time. With Sabo being the one to talk, he was focused on the conversation rather than his surroundings, leaving it up to Ace and Luffy to make sure no threat approached them. Ace was scanning the room covertly, his sharp vision making it easier to detect any and every movement that was made, from a pirate shuffling in their seat to a fly stuck in the spiderweb in the corner. Luffy was focusing on everyone's feelings, making sure no one had the dark feeling, because if there was one thing Luffy knew, it was that someone's emotions could change within a second. If he felt any sort of malice directed towards them, he would be the one to let his brothers know. Not only did Ace and Luffy use their abilities, but they also used their haki, using it to figure out the strength of those surrounding them, as well as how many there were in the room, and how many were outside the door in case they had to make an escape. These two were on complete guard, leaving the hardest part to Sabo. The talking. If Sabo made one slip up, everything could take a turn for the worse. These friendly pirates could turn around and become bloodthirsty killers if Sabo didn't watch his words carefully. He used his hearing to listen to the pirates' breathing and his natural-born skill of detecting moods and reactions to figure out what to say next. "How have you three been feeling?" "Better," Jozu asked, which Sabo nodded to. "Yes, your nurses here are very good at their job." Sabo complimented easily, though his fists were clenched under the table at the thought that he just complimented nurses. He knew, logically, that not all nurses were bad, that there ran into some sick doctors, and not everyone was like them, but that didn't make it any easier on the blonde. Pops made sure of it when he asked them to join. Fasa boasted, raising his drink to his lips as he grinned. "By the way, did you guys cut your hair?" Izo asked with a raised eyebrow, having noticed it when they had first done it, but not mentioning it till now. Sabo nodded, running his fingers through the much shorter hair on instinct. "We did, after all, it was getting to be unmanageable. This is much easier to handle," Sabo said, wondering how the man would react. He didn't think he would have a problem, after all, they only cut their hair, but what if, for some reason, that set the pirate off and made him turn on them? Sabo knew these thoughts were irrational, just as he knew not all doctors or nurses were horrible people, but, again, old habits die hard when you were practically raised in a facility where cruelty and punishment were thrown at you for little to no reason at all on most occasions. "It looks good. Have you had practice cutting hair before?" Fasa asked, taking notice of the brothers' much shorter hair. Sabo nodded again, wondering how much to give away. "I used to cut these two's hair when we were younger, and Ace would cut mine. It was just something we learned how to do over time with practice," Sabo said nonchalantly, shrugging. The commanders nodded in understanding, and Sabo sighed internally, already wanting to crawl back to their room, regardless of the fact that they hadn't even eaten yet. As if on cue, Thatch and Haruta emerged from the kitchen, plates in hands as they made their way over to the table with smiles. "Sorry for the wait, I was a little held up back there," Thatch said, grinning happily as he set the plates in front of the trio, the brothers immediately digging in, wanting to leave as soon as possible, preferably before everyone started showing up. "We're fine with waiting, it's no big deal," Sabo said in between bites, completely lying through his teeth, not that he would let the pirates know that. Thatch merely smiled in response, sitting in his spot at the table along with Haruta. "So, you guys gonna come on out of your room today? You've been in there the past few days now," Thatch said good-naturedly, though the three tensed at the words. Sabo had been hoping Thatch would have forgotten about his apparent want for the brothers to mingle with the pirates, but that was clearly not the case. The blonde cleared his throat, sharing a quick glance with Ace in slight panic. He didn't want to make the pirate mad, but he also didn't want to agree with coming out of their room anytime soon, not until Shanks was here, and then maybe not even then. "I don't know, after yesterday Luffy's been a little tired," Sabo said apologetically, feigning a look of guilt. Thatch pouted a little but smiled quickly after. "It's no big deal, but you really should try to later. It's supposed to be really nice out for the next few days, especially in Grand Line standards." Thatch encouraged happily, and Sabo smiled, the expression getting harder and harder to fake as the conversation continued. "That sounds great." The words were hard to force out, and he hid the strain in his voice, as he took another bite of food, noticing that Ace was looking his way rather than at the pirates around them. The oldest had picked up Sabo's growing unease, and he unconsciously began to eat faster. Luffy picked up on this, as well as the feelings coming from Sabo, and did the same as Ace, shoveling food in a little faster than before, in an attempt to finish quicker. The brothers hadn't needed to use their silent language between each other when eating, all of their communication happening through glances or looks, but Ace was getting closer and closer to using the signal for a board mission now. He knew the blonde could only keep this act up of friendly politeness for so long, and that time limit was closing in. After Sabo's comment, Thatch beamed and the brothers busied themselves with eating as quickly as possible, finishing within record time since they had been there. The food was delicious, Mr. Commander. Thank you, Sabo said, his strained smile still plastered onto his face as he stacked his plate on top of Ace and Luffy's, handing them to Thatch, as the three stood up from the table, ready to leave. It was no problem. Hope to see you outside soon, Thatch said as the three began walking away. Sabo hesitated, smile faltering for a split second before it returned. Right, Sabo said with full cheeriness, nodding to the chef as he ran after his brothers. I didn't think that chef would ever shut up, Ace growled, annoyed. The trio made their way back to their room quickly with practiced ease, avoiding spots where they knew people were so they didn't have to deal with anyone. Sabo nodded his agreement. I didn't think you would be so adamant about seeing us outside of our room, Sabo muttered, also a little annoyed. Thatch probably meant well, or maybe he didn't, Sabo couldn't know for sure, but what he did know was that he and his brothers didn't want to be bothered by anyone until Shanks arrived, even if that meant staying in their room with nothing to entertain themselves with. He was disappointed when you said we would stay in our room, Luffy piped in, having been focusing on the commander's emotions the entire time. Sabo frowned while Ace glared harshly at the end of the hallway they had just turned into. Probably because he couldn't get us out in the open where they could attack us. Ace spat out, not trusting any of the pirates for a second. Sabo sighed but didn't disagree with his brother. Sure, the pirates were being nice now, but no one was this nice to strangers without having ulterior motives. The brothers had learned that the hard way, especially when they interacted with Harry more and more. Did anyone have the bad feelings? Sabo asked Luffy, knowing the youngest had been cataloging everyone's emotions the entire time for the feeling. Even though he knew Luffy would tell them the second he noticed a bad feeling, he still couldn't get over the fact that no one had the feeling yet. These were pirates, and Sabo wasn't going to allow himself to be naive enough to believe that no one here had any ill will towards the brothers. No, some of them were annoyed, but not at us, at the other guys, Luffy said softly. His abilities allowed him to feel where someone's emotions were being directed, like anger directed at the person someone was talking to or happiness directed toward food someone was eating. Sabo and Ace took in the information, wondering just when things would turn bad. It was too calm, too peaceful, too safe. It was like an oxymoron, for the brothers to be safe on a pirate ship, and that was why Sabo and Ace weren't going to let their guard down. I wish they would just turn on us already, Ace said in frustration as they entered their room. It was unnerving and exhausting for the brothers to constantly be on their toes, to constantly watch everything they said, so they didn't upset anyone. Ace just wished the pirates would attack already so they could get out of here. Don't wish for things that you don't truly want, Ace. If they do turn on us, we'd still have to figure out how to get to an island without anything to guide us there, Sabo said pointedly, causing Ace to pout and cross his arms as he made his way to the bed. Luffy decided to go to the desk and start making patterns out of the wood, tracing the surface with his fingers as he listened to Ace and Sabo. Who says I don't want that? At least we won't have to double-check every step we take around those pirates. Ace spat out, the pent-up anger and frustration beginning to show its ugly head. All the stress that was being put on the three didn't help either. I know you don't want that because it would be worse than now. We wouldn't have any food or fresh water, and what happens when the weather starts changing and we're stuck in a tiny lifeboat, huh? Sabo almost shouted back, voice rising as anger began taking hold of him too. Luffy lifted his head from the desk, turning to look at his brothers with wide eyes, looking at their waves that were virtually vibrating with their anger. He knew he should stop his brothers from arguing, because they were brothers, and they were on a scary ship with scary people, and if they got angry with each other, it wouldn't be good for them, but when he opened his mouth to talk nothing came out. How do you know what I want? Did they give you special mind-reading powers in the facility too? Ace shouted, voice rising to an equal volume as Sabo's as he stood up from the bed, glaring at the blonde. Luffy could feel the anger and frustration coming off his brothers, making his chest tighten, and his blood seemingly start to move faster, his breathing becoming heavier. Don't be an idiot, Ace. Of course I didn't get mind-reading powers, but if you would stop to think for once you'd see what a bad idea it is wanting the pirates to fight us is. Sabo countered, the shouting match between the two becoming more and more heated. Suddenly Luffy could feel the red-hot anger in him as if it were his own, his lips thinning and his fists clenching. Oh, so now I don't think either. Why do I bother living if you seem to know me better than I know myself? Ace questioned, practically butting heads with Sabo at this point. Don't you even go there. Sabo growled out harshly, voice lowering dangerously. Oh, you mean question why I'm even alive to begin with? Why not? I should have never been born. Enough. Both of you, shut up. Luffy screamed, voice louder and angrier than the brothers had ever heard it before. Ace and Sabo immediately stopped their arguing, eyes going white as they realized what they had been doing. Why can't you two just get along? I'm sick of it. Luffy continued, voice only marginally lower than it had been the first time. It didn't take long for Ace and Sabo to realize that they had just been feeding Luffy their anger and frustration, influencing the youngest to feel just as, if not more, angry than both the brothers had been combined only moments ago. Luffy didn't even let Ace start to say anything as he turned on him, glaring. Why can't you just be happy to be alive like Sabo and I are? We love you and without you, I would be really sad. Luffy shouted. Luffy didn't let Sabo speak. And you? I know you want us to be safe and happy, but fighting with Ace and ignoring how he feels doesn't help us. It only makes things worse. Stop ignoring each other and just listen. Luffy finished, turning on his heels and nearly stomping out of the room, flinging the door open and slamming it shut behind him, leaving his brothers to stare after him in stunned silence. Luffy didn't really know where he was going, all he knew was that he was too angry to care, and that, as long as he was away from his brothers, he would be fine. He marched down the hall where their room was, and took random twists and turns throughout the inside of the Moby Dick, walking without any care for where he ended up. The longer he walked the more he calmed down, his fists slowly unclenching, glare falling into his natural expression, stomping becoming soft steps once more. It was only then that he realized his mistake in leaving the room. He didn't have a clue where he was, but he was near a lot of pirates judging on the smells. He was still in the maze of hallways, and he couldn't remember how many turns he had taken in his haze of anger, or whether or not he had passed any pirates on his way here. Surely he had to have passed at least a few, he could smell them behind him, and this only caused fear to start rising in Luffy. He couldn't go anywhere now without running into a pirate. He was alone, lost, and scared, a combination that Luffy definitely did not like, and even though he could just follow Ace and Sabo's waves, he would still have to pass at least one pirate on his way back to them. Suddenly he could hear talking behind him and turn with wide, panicked eyes to see two people rounding the corner. Luffy didn't even have a chance to try to hide by the time they spotted him, both giving him slightly confused looks. If Luffy wasn't on the verge of hyperventilating, he would have tried to gauge their emotions, look for the darkness, but as it was now Luffy was barely able to keep it together enough to keep his breathing under control. Luffy? You okay? Thatch was the one to speak first, he and Marco having been talking before they had spotted the youngest of the trio alone in the hallway. Are you lost, Yuri? Marco asked, noticing the panic look in Luffy's eyes, like a deer in the headlights. Luffy's mind was racing just as fast as his heart as he tried figuring out what to respond with. He knew these two were good souls, and they kept their promises, but Luffy's mind was clouded with fear and uncertainty, any reason he had flying out the window. It took everything within Luffy to just nod, still too petrified to move any more than that. Thatch and Marco's expressions softened at the nod as they realized the situation. Hey, it's okay, why don't we get you back to your brothers, yeah? I know I said I'd like to see you out of your room more, but I didn't mean for you to get so scared while doing it. Thatch said good-naturedly, giving Luffy a small smile in an attempt to calm the boy down. Luffy could only nod again in response. Why don't we go check your room, Yuri? If they aren't in there we can go to the galley if you like and have a snack until someone finds them. Marco suggested. Again, Luffy nodded, beginning to calm down slightly, enough for the tenseness to leave his body, and for him to get his breathing fully under control. Alright. Well, come on, your room's this way. Thatch said cheerily, turning to face the way Luffy had come from. Luffy hesitated for only a second before he walked behind Thatch and Marco. He didn't want to get too close to the pirates, but he didn't want to get too far back either. Thatch tried making small talk with Luffy, but when he noticed the boy wasn't going to talk back, he opted for making jokes instead, keeping a conversation going with himself to fill the air with something other than silence. And then this other guy walked into the bar and said, "Ow, who put that there?" Thatch said, lowering his voice to imitate the guy in his joke. Luffy couldn't help but smile a little at the joke, finding it funny. Oh, and there was this one joke I heard on the last island we landed on before yours. How do all the oceans say hello to each other? Thatch asked, pausing for effect, but also to see if Luffy would answer him. He glanced at the boy expectantly, grinning widely and raising his eyebrows in anticipation. Luffy had a smile of his own, both from the jokes, and because he could feel Thatch's happiness and joy, beginning to fill him as well. They wave. Thatch said, delivering the punchline with an exaggerated wave of his own. Get it? Because there are waves in the ocean, and you wave to say hello. Thatch explained happily. Luffy saw Marco roll his eyes at the explanation, but the man was smiling a little nonetheless, and he could feel Marco's own happiness radiating inside him. Luffy hadn't even noticed that he was completely relaxed with these two, even though they were pirates. He wouldn't go as far as to say he trusted them completely, but Luffy could feel that these two were good people, that they wouldn't hurt Luffy or his brothers like the doctors at the facility had. And there was also this one joke. Luffy. Whatever joke Thatch had been about to say was cut off when they heard Luffy's name being called, all three turning to see what was happening. Luffy's eyes widened as he realized he'd been so caught up in Thatch's jokes that he hadn't even realized that they weren't even following Ace and Sabo's waves anymore. Behind him, Ace and Sabo were running toward him, relief washing over their faces. The quick check told Luffy that the two had been feeling panic before, but after seeing him they had been filled with happiness and relief. Sabo was quick to pull Luffy into a hug, and Ace would have as well, but he noticed they were with company, so he opted to stand guard, moving to place Sabo and Luffy behind him while he glared at the two. "Oh, hey, we've been looking for you too. We were just headed to your room to see if you were there, but it seems you found us," Thatch said happily, neither not noticing or completely ignoring Ace's glare as he laughed without a care. Ace looked ready to snap something at the chef, but Sabo stopped him, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder and smiling gratefully to the pirates, this time not faking it. "Thank you for finding Luffy for us. We were worried," Sabo admitted, gazing softly at Luffy and ruffling his hair, causing Luffy to laugh and swipe at Sabo's hands. "It was no problem. He told us he got lost, so we were just helping out. Moby's pretty big. I'm not surprised he couldn't find you too, Yuri," Marco said, waving it off as no big deal. "Either way, we're grateful, right Ace?" Sabo practically hissed the words at Ace, elbowing the fire user in the side, causing Ace to glare at him, but nod. "Yeah, thanks," Ace muttered, moving to look at Luffy. "You okay?" he asked, quickly scanning his baby brother for any injuries that hadn't been there when he had left. If there was even one hair out of place, Ace wouldn't hesitate in fighting these two pirates right then and there. Luffy beamed at Ace though, nodding. Mr. Chef told me lots of jokes, and even though I didn't know where I was or where you guys were, I didn't cry at all," Luffy said, beaming proudly to Ace, who looked at Luffy a little longer to make sure his brother really was alright, before sighing, ruffling the youngest hair the same way Sabo had. "Good job, Lou," Ace said, straightening up slightly and turning to face the two pirates again, giving them calm, calculated looks. He didn't know what to think, seeing as these two had their perfect opportunity to hurt Luffy, yet they hadn't. Maybe they were taking him somewhere else before they hurt him. Ace didn't know what to believe, just wanting to get back to their room where they could talk this all over. "Thank you again, we know the way back from here. Sorry for any inconvenience," Luffy was. Sabo apologized, bowing politely, tapping his leg. "Oh?" He knew if he didn't tell Ace to, then his brother would continue to stand defiantly. Luffy always did what Sabo did, so he wasn't worried about the youngest. Besides, he could already see Luffy imitating his bow from where he stood slightly behind him and Ace. It was a little awkward and Luffy looked off balance doing it, but it got the message across. Sabo would have to teach him how to properly bow later. Ace, huffing quietly beside him, brought his attention back to the present as he watched the stubborn oldest brother finally begin to, begrudgingly, bow to Thatch and Marco. "Thanks," Ace muttered, and Sabo was going to beat some nonsense into Ace later too. Didn't the idiot understand yet that they had to be nice here? No, he wasn't going to get mad. Getting mad is what caused this mess to happen in the first place. He and Ace let their emotions get out of control, and it could have lost them their brother had Marco and Thatch attacked Luffy rather than helped him. "Really, it was no problem. I guess we'll see you at lunch," Thatch asked, waving off their gratitude. Sabo smiled, putting on his mask of politeness. "We will. Goodbye, commanders," Sabo said, he and his brothers turning to head to their room, moving almost stiffly as they felt Marco and Thatch watching them for a minute before turning and walking away, continuing on with the conversation they had been having before they'd found Luffy. "I swear King Du knew that the damn fish was still alive when he gave it to me. It's your fault for not expecting it, Yuri. Who expects a fish to suddenly resurrect itself in your hands and slap you in the face?" Smart People. Chapter 25. Thoughts of venturing beyond. "Luffy, we're so sorry, we didn't mean for any of that to happen. It got out of hand and we didn't mean for it to." Sabo apologized, the three of them sitting on their bed, talking about the big fight Ace and Sabo had had. "It's okay, I'm sorry too, there was a lot of anger and I didn't mean to let it in, I didn't want it to, but it just did, and then I got mad too, and I left, but I didn't know where I was going, or where I was, and then I was lost, and then Thatch and Lazyface found me, and I got even more scared. And we get it, Lou," Ace said, cutting off Luffy's ramblings, knowing that if he didn't the boy would probably go on for another hour. "It wasn't your fault anyway, it was ours, so we're sorry," Ace continued, frowning to himself, still mad that he'd let himself get so angry, and at Sabo nonetheless. "Yeah, it won't happen again, promise," Sabo added, holding up his pinky. Luffy smiled brightly at that and connected his pinky with Sabo's, lifting his other one and holding it out to Ace expectantly. The eldest rolled his eyes but smiled and connected his pinky with Luffy's as well before connecting his other with Sabo's. "This is stupid," Ace said after a minute, which caused Sabo to laugh and Luffy to pout. "Nua, it's a promise. We're not gonna get mad at each other like that again," Luffy said determinedly. "That reminds me, Luffy, who taught you to bow?" The rest of the day passed with little to no more big events happening. The only memorable thing that had happened was that Thatch didn't give up on trying to get the brothers out of their room, more adamant about it now than ever. The worst part about it was that even Aizo was beginning to join in on it, mentioning how he'd like to see them out and about as well. The next day, a few hours after breakfast, the trio was doing what they usually did in between meals, sit in their room and stare at the ceiling. Ace had just suffered a narcolepsy attack, leaving Sabo and Luffy to drag him off the floor and into the bed, waiting for him to wake back up. They had been lucky in terms of Ace's attacks happening out of the eyes of the pirates. None of them wanted them to know about the narcolepsy and feared that they would somehow use it against the brothers, so they had tried their best to keep it a secret, but it was hard when Ace couldn't control when he had an attack. With everything that had happened at the facility and all the drugs that had been pumped into the trio, it only made Ace's narcolepsy worse. The eldest always had trouble when it came to getting a good night's rest, but at the facility he always had a hard time falling asleep, his insomnia becoming worse than ever before. Now that they were out of the facility though, and Ace was able to have a better sleep schedule, free of harmful drugs and chemicals, his attacks had lessened a bit, along with his hallucinations and insomnia. He still had them, and most times he would be up a few hours after Sabo and Luffy had fallen asleep, but it was better than before when he would stay up practically the whole night. Get away, you damn bastard. The sudden shouting coming from Ace startled Sabo and Luffy only slightly, used to it, as they began calming their brother down from what was undoubtedly another nightmare. Ace, it's okay, we're not there anymore, Sabo said soothingly, wanting to place his hand on the eldest's shoulder, but knowing that might do more harm than good at the moment. The fire user's eyes were open, but they were hazy and unfocused. After his initial outburst, it seemed that Ace couldn't speak, at least coherently, anymore, his mouth opening and closing, mouthing words, but not making a sound. Ace, did you know the swirls on the wood like cinnamon rolls? Oh. Or meat when it's cooked and juicy and I'm hungry. Luffy said, holding his stomach as it growled, frowning. Sabo sighed, shaking his head and turning back to Ace. Ace, we're safe, we're free, it's okay. Sabo continued, his tone still gentle and calm. It took another few seconds, but Ace seemed to calm down, eyes refocusing on his brothers and becoming clear again. The hazy fog that clouded his mind was clearing, and their brother was awake again. Welcome back, Sabo said with a small smile, patting Ace comfortingly on the back, Luffy grinning widely to the oldest. Ace seemed a little out of it still but nodded anyway. Sabo perked up, noticing footsteps heading their way, ones he could recognize that wasn't Marco's. Who is it? Ace asked, once again wishing he had better senses when it came to noticing people coming their way. Both Sabo and Luffy seemed to know who it was due to their enhanced hearing and smell, but Ace had no clue, having to rely on them to inform him. Sure, he had his haki, but there were so many people on this ship that it was hard for him to distinguish which presents belonged to who. Thatch, Sabo said in confusion, wondering why the chef would be heading their way. Mr. Chef always smells like food. Luffy whined, remembering his hunger once again at the smell of meat and seafood that signified Thatch. While Luffy was lamenting over his lack of food, Sabo took notice of the fact that Luffy either thought Thatch's name was Mr. Chef, or called him that purely because he had called him that when talking to him. Whichever the case, it was better than Luffy making up a nickname that could possibly be insulting to the man. What does he want? Ace asked, sitting up in the bed and getting ready for a fight, though Sabo didn't think it would come to that. With Ace, though, you never knew. As always, Sabo stood from the bed, making his way to the door to greet the man, if he so happened to stop at their room. With how ready to fight Ace was and how timid Luffy became when talking to others, Sabo had taken it upon himself to be the one to talk to anyone and everyone during their time here. The second there was a knock on their door, Sabo was swinging it open with his full smile and calm attitude, perfect to anyone who saw it, but obviously fake to Sabo and his brothers. Hello Mr. Chef, to what do we owe the pleasure? Sabo asked politely. Behind him, not that Sabo or Thatch could see, Ace was giving Luffy a confused look, mouthing the words, to what do we owe the pleasure? To the youngest. He had no clue about manners, and whatever Sabo had just spewed out of his mouth had to have been polite, but Ace, and Luffy for that matter, had no clue what it meant. Thatch started, surprised by both how fast Sabo had opened the door as if he had known he was coming, and how polite Sabo was. Well, I just came by to see if you three wanted to come out on deck, get some fresh air. I'm free for a bit till I have to make lunch, so I was just wondering if you'd like to join me. Thatch said, somewhat sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck with one hand while smiling at Sabo, trying to peek in to see the other two. It was impossible though because Sabo was doing an extremely effective job of keeping the commander from seeing anything but the wooden ceiling above him. We appreciate the offer, Commander, but we were just about to take a nap. Maybe later. Sabo suggested, trying his best to look disappointed as if he wanted to go outside, despite the fact that he very much did not want to do that. As was Thatch's usual response to Sabo denying a request to leave their room, Thatch pouted, but fixed it quickly, smiling again. It's alright, I understand, I just thought I'd ask. I'll see you three later. Have a nice nap. Thatch said, waving as he began walking away. Sabo waved back before closing the door, smile falling to one of relief that he had successfully dodged another of Thatch's attempts at getting them to leave their room. What is with that guy? Can't he take a hint? Ace growled out, glaring at the door. Sabo wiped his face with his hand, sitting back on the bed, suddenly feeling exhausted and in need of that nap. He's definitely persistent, but I have to say, it is becoming a bit stuffy in here, Sabo admitted, glancing around the room that once seemed larger, now seemingly smaller than their cell had been. Ace turned his glare on Sabo. Don't tell me you actually want to go out there with all those pirates. Ace hissed, though he was conscious of the fact that his anger was rising and did his best to calm down. He, under no circumstances, wanted a repeat of what happened with Luffy. Sabo also remembered what happened and made sure to breathe through any anger that wanted to rise, addressing Ace calmly. No, I don't want to go out there with the pirates, but that doesn't mean I don't want to go out there, Sabo said slowly. Ace went quiet, thinking about what Sabo said. I want to go out too, but there's a lot of pirates and feelings, but I haven't felt the darkness, but they always stare at us, Luffy rambled, which you seem to be doing a lot more of lately. Sabo deduced it was probably from the stressful, unknown situation they were in. We understand, Luffy, there are a lot of unknowns out there, whereas if we stay in here we know exactly what can and will happen. I'm just saying that we're slowly going stir crazy in here, and we've still got a few days until Shanks gets here. Assuming he doesn't run into any trouble on his way here, Sabo explained. Luffy tilted his head. What stir crazy? Is it like stir fry? Luffy asked, brightening at the mention of food. Sabo sighed, resisting the urge to fasp him. No, it's not food, Luffy. Stir crazy, it's when you start to feel a little crazy from being kept in one place for too long. Sabo explained, Luffy seemingly disappointed when he realized it wasn't food. What are we supposed to do then? Sure, I don't want to be in here either, but I'd rather be in here than out there, Ace said, gesturing wildly at the door. Sabo shrugged, slumping a little. I don't know, Ace, but if we don't somehow manage to get out of this room for more than meals and bathroom breaks, I think we're going to start having a lot more problems, Sabo muttered, confusing his brothers. Problems? Luffy questioned. How would we have more problems here? It's safer here, Ace said incredulously. Sabo frowned, shaking his head. Think about it, just yesterday we got into an argument that was bad enough to influence Luffy to storm out. If we stay in this room any longer there's a chance that could happen again, and we wouldn't be so lucky that Luffy runs into Thatch and Marco, who are willing to help him back to us. By being stuck in here we're not only going to be bored, but we're also going to be easier to anger. Not only that, but more people are starting to ask us to come out, and I can only dodge their requests for so long before they either get mad and attack us or think something's up and send the nurse after us again. Sabo explained, slowly enough so his brothers would understand what kind of predicament they were in. Ace's eyebrows were furrowed in thought, while Luffy had listened with wide, innocent eyes, leaving Sabo unsure how much of that explanation he understood. So you're saying if we stay in here we'll turn on each other, but if we go out there they'll turn on us? Ace asked. This time Sabo did fasp him but kept his frustration in check. You almost got it, Ace, he said through gritted teeth, forcing a smile, and he knew he wasn't fooling either of his brothers. Well, sorry I'm not as smart as you are at this stuff, Ace said, throwing his hands into the air, also frustrated. Luffy could feel the rising frustration and anger, causing worry to bubble up in him. No? Don't get mad, Luffy cried out, Ace and Sabo turning to look at him with wide eyes. They both froze, taking deep breaths, and Luffy felt their anger and frustration slowly leave them, worry and warm feelings replacing them. Sorry, Lu, Ace said softly, ruffling the youngest's hair. Sorry, Luffy. This is exactly what I mean though. You were partially right, Ace. Staying in here, we could end up turning on each other, but the thing is, we don't know if they'll turn on us if we leave. Sabo started, already seeing Ace ready to argue with him. They might, but we don't know. So far, we know Thatch and Marco are good guys, right, Lu? Sabo asked, both to reassure Ace and to reassure himself because he was about to suggest something risky, something he really didn't want to do, but he trusted Luffy. Mr. Chef kept his promises and they both have good colors, Luffy confirmed, smiling a little. What's your point? Ace asked Sabo, already not liking where this was going. The point I'm trying to make is that maybe we should try to go outside, at least once. We can stay near Thatch or Marco, keep our backs against the railings, stay close to our room, but at the very least, go outside for a few minutes. This way, we won't go crazy in here, and we'll get the commanders off our backs about going out. Sabo said quietly, not even liking his own words as he spoke them. He didn't trust the pirates, not one bit, but they had no choice but to be near them if they wanted any sort of fresh air. Ace went quiet as he thought over the suggestion, eyebrows furrowing once more while he lowered his head. Luffy went silent as well, and Sabo and Ace both knew that, even if they both wanted to do this, Luffy was really the deciding factor. Luffy was the one who would have to feel all the pirates' emotions and, if he was up to it, check out some of their soul colors. The room was silent as they contemplated this idea, but eventually, Ace spoke up, still frowning. Okay. I'll go out, Ace said, extremely reluctant. It was obvious in his voice, but he knew that this was something the three needed. while Sabo was the one who focused on keeping the brothers safe in terms of the interactions they had with the pirates. Ace was in charge of keeping them safe when it came to the situations they put themselves in, and this was something they needed, but would put them in a lot of danger. Ace knew that if they did this, he wouldn't be relaxed for 1 millisecond while out there on the deck, surrounded by pirates. Just the thought made him shudder. Luffy, what do you think? If you don't want to, we can stay here and figure something else out. Sabo asked softly, he and Ace watching the youngest carefully. He was wearing his rarely seen serious expression, hands fidgeting as he thought carefully about his options. He didn't want all of those emotions to overload him, but he could help Ace and Sabo by finding out what colors the pirate souls were. He could already feel anxiety twisting in his stomach at the thought of the sheer amount of people that would be out there. Can we leave if it gets too scary? Luffy asked, almost too scared to ask the question. He didn't want Ace or Sabo to think he was a kid, but just the thought of going outside was scary to him, much less the actual action of it. His older brother's expressions softened and Luffy felt them increase the amount of warmth they were sending him, making him feel more comfortable, happy they weren't mad at him for being scared. Of course Lou, just say the word and we'll come right back here, no questions asked. Ace said gently, Sabo nodding in agreement. Why don't we do this tomorrow? After lunch? Sabo asked, not wanting to do this today, feeling too exhausted after this talk. Ace and Luffy nodded rapidly, both of them not up to doing it that minute either. Sabo sighed heavily. Good. Now, I think I'm gonna take that nap. Wake me up for lunch. Sabo said, falling into a laying position, ignoring Ace's snickers. What's got you all pouty? Flamenco asked Thatch. Lunch was just starting, pirates starting to pull into the galley one by one. All of the commanders were at the table, Whitebeard as well, and they all turned to look at the chef when Flamenco mentioned him. Why don't they want to leave their room? Thatch asked dejectedly. Beside him Marco shook his head, figuring out what Thatch was talking about fairly quickly. They don't seem to trust us, Yuri, that might be the issue, Marco said lazily as if it were obvious, and really it was. It was painfully obvious the brothers didn't trust any of them, despite how much they've tried showing them they were good people, even for pirates. Thatch's pout only got worse. But why? We haven't done anything. Thatch whined, not understanding. Thatch, you have to understand that we're strangers to them. Strangers who saved them from a horrible place, sure, but strangers nonetheless. They know nothing about us, and the fact that we're pirates doesn't help either. Izo explained. The pout lifted slightly, and Thatch raised his head a bit. Don't worry son, I'm sure that once they see we mean them no harm you will become fast friends, Whitebeard said encouragingly, smiling to Thatch who beamed back. Yeah, you're right, I just gotta keep trying. By the way, where are they? Thatch asked, looking around and seeing no signs of the brothers. They're on their way, I went by and told them lunch was ready, Yuri, Marco informed, and as if on cue the chef spotted the trio walking quickly up to the table and sitting down. Thatch was up in seconds, getting the brothers their food with a bright smile, sitting back down beside them. Hey guys, how was your nap? Thatch asked, and as usual, the only response he got was from Sabo, Luffy focusing more on his food and Ace's eyes darting around, watching everything. Good, thank you, Sabo replied with a smile. Encouraged by both the response and the talk with Whitebeard, the chef decided to ask his signature question. So, you guys gonna come out of your room anytime soon? Thatch tried, and to be honest, he was expecting the same response, for Sabo to dodge the question with apologies and excuses, but he, and everyone else at the table was surprised when Sabo turned his attention fully to Thatch, still smiling. Briefly, he noticed that Ace and Luffy had given him their attention as well, the two of them slightly tense. Actually, we planned on coming out tomorrow. It gets stuffy staying in the same room for so long. Sabo said nonchalantly, shrugging and returning to his meal. Thatch gaped at him for a minute, having not expected the response, but quickly recovered, smile brightening as he felt excitement fill him. Yeah. I heard that it's supposed to be nice out tomorrow, but really, you never know when it comes to the Grand Line. Oh, I also heard, Sabo tuned the chattering out easily, smiling and nodding in all the right places, making it look like he was paying attention. Just saying those words to Thatch had taken a lot, and now Sabo couldn't take them back. He could practically feel everyone's shock when he had said the words, all eyes on him, but he did his best to not let it look like it bothered him as much as it did. He could feel Luffy shifting beside him, and though the youngest was in between him and Ace, he was sure that the oldest was fidgeting as well. When Thatch had started rambling it relieved Sabo a little, his brothers calming down, which was a good sign, and Sabo took the opportunity to start listening in on other conversations, something he hadn't been doing with everything that had been happening. With all this stress Sabo was sure he was going to get gray hairs soon. Chapter 26. The sun, the sea, and the sky. This was a bad idea, I don't know how you talked me into doing this, Ace mumbled, pacing back and forth in their room. Luffy could feel the nervous anxiety rolling off the oldest, which didn't help with his own feelings of fear and anxiety. Sabo had the same feelings, the blonde twiddling his fingers nervously as they all worked up their courage. It'll be fine, it's just like when we started eating meals with the pirates. It was fine in the end, Sabo said, though he looked like he was saying it more to himself, rather than to Ace. The only thing the brothers could think of was the worst-case scenarios, the pirates attacking them, the pirates throwing them into the infirmary, the nurses shackling them, doing tests, locking them up, separating them, sending them back to the facility. All these scenarios made it harder for them to even imagine stepping foot outside the door, but Sabo had promised Thatch yesterday that they would do this. Boy, how he was regretting that now. Maybe we can make an excuse, Ace suggested weakly, eyeing the door wearily. Yeah, like what? Sabo asked, his voice just as weak as Ace's. We're sick, Ace asked, and Sabo sighed, shaking his head. He almost wished they could come up with a good excuse, anything to get them out of doing this. They'll send us to the infirmary, Sabo said. Ace frowned, continuing his pacing and letting the room lapse into silence. Luffy hugged his knees to his chest from where he sat on the bed, eyeing his two brothers with worry. He wanted to go outside, and he knew Ace and Sabo wanted to go outside, but they were all too scared of what could happen. Even though Luffy had seen good colors around people and only felt good feelings, it didn't help with his anxieties. Besides, he hadn't looked at even a quarter of the crew's feelings for the darkness, much less the color of their souls. Who's to say that there wasn't a group of pirates that were all bad colors with dark feelings? Let's just get this over with. Ace suddenly shouted, freezing in place and giving a determined look to Sabo and Luffy who stared at him with wide eyes. They definitely weren't expecting Ace to be the one to say this. What? Sabo asked, Luffy looking in between the two cautiously. Ace nodded, face growing more determined, even though Luffy felt none of his anxiety leaving. Yeah. Let's just go out there and get this over with. Hang out for a few minutes. Like you said yesterday, we need to do this, and we can stay close to our room or near Thatch and Marco, or with our backs to the railings. And if Luffy wants to leave, then we leave, no questions asked. Ace said, stunning Sabo into silence. He didn't have much time to think about it though when he heard footsteps and talking heading their way. Well, it looks like we're not gonna have a choice in the matter, Sabo said as he and Luffy straightened up, recognizing the smells and sounds. Ace froze again, turning to face the door again while Sabo stood up, steeling his nerves. He slowly made his way to the door, listening as the people grew closer. He took a deep breath, hearing Luffy and Ace's own breathing grow more rapid as they got more nervous and scared. Scared wasn't a term the brothers liked to use. It made them feel weak, but after everything that had happened at the facility, scared was something they felt daily. Per usual, Sabo opened the door the second there was a knock, blocking the view into the room with his body, smiling as best he could under the circumstances, hoping that he was imagining the feeling of the corners of his mouth twitching under the pressure. Commanders, Sabo greeted with full cheer. How does he do that? It's like he knows we're coming. Thatch whispered in a hushed voice to Marco, who waved him off. Sabo kept his pleasant smile on, finding slight amusement in Thatch's surprise, before it was replaced with the usual nervousness and unease. Thatch wanted to know if you were coming out today, Yoi, Marco said lazily, and Sabo had a feeling Thatch had dragged him along here. I could have said that myself, Thatch mumbled, feeling as if he was being glossed over by the first commander. Sabo gripped the doorknob tightly in his hand, his lips thinning only slightly as he turned to face his brothers. Now was the time, if they were going to back out, they had to do it now. Ace and Luffy still looked as petrified as Sabo felt, which wasn't any help, but Luffy signing something caught his eye. I wanna try. That was enough for Sabo. By the look in Ace's eyes as he read Luffy's signs though, he wasn't too excited for this outing. We were actually just on our way. Sabo tried saying coolly, but he wasn't sure how calm and smooth it sounded to the commanders. Thatch brightened up immediately at the words, and Marco even raised an eyebrow in interest, probably not having expected them to actually come out today. Well, neither had they. Sabo didn't move from his spot, watching the commanders closely while leaving his smile on as he waited for Ace and Luffy to reach him, listening to their slow shuffles and hesitant steps. Before Marco or Thatch could question what Sabo was doing, the blonde opened the door wider, walking out with Ace and Luffy close behind him, Ace closing the door behind them. It took only a second for Thatch to recover from his shock, as he quickly caught up to the brothers, leading the way for them with Marco at his side. The brothers were in their usual formation with Luffy in the middle, following the two silently, as Thatch raved about how nice it was outside. Bad colors. Darkness. Ace asked Luffy, wanting the youngest to be 100% sure that Thatch or Marco didn't have the bad colors or darkness, before they followed them out onto the deck. Luffy's eyes focused intently on Thatch first, then Marco, his steps slowing only slightly as he concentrated, but within a minute he was done, finding it was easier to read the two seeing as he'd been doing a lot of that lately. No bad colors, only good feelings. Luffy reassured, only calming Ace and Sabo slightly. And there hasn't been a single cloud in the sky all day, Thatch said as he spun to face them, looking backward. The trio tensed at the sudden attention, but Sabo forced his smile to return. Sounds lovely, Sabo said pleasantly. Thatch continued to beam at them for a minute before turning back around, the group coming to the end of the hallway. You know, everyone was beginning to think we would never see you three come out of your room. Thatch said matter-of-factly, shrugging at his words. Sabo chuckled nervously, rubbing the back of his head. It's been an interesting few days, Sabo said wearily. Thatch didn't seem to notice the change in tone, merely nodding. Yeah, I guess it's been pretty stressful for you three, huh? Thatch asked offhandedly. Sabo bit his tongue, keeping back the words that wanted to spill out about how true that statement was, and still is. A little, Sabo said in the end, seeing Ace twitch a little out of the corner of his eye, Luffy slumping a little as he walked. It went silent as they finally reached the door leading to the deck, Marco and Thatch taking no hesitation in pushing it open, leaving the brothers as they walked out on deck, not noticing the trio had stopped. Now or never. Ace signaled, and Sabo and Luffy knew he was right. We can leave at any time. Sabo reminded, more for himself than his brothers. I'm scared. Luffy's tapping made Ace and Sabo's faces soften. Don't worry Lu, we'll be with you the entire time. Ace signaled back, and Luffy nodded, taking a deep breath. Ace and Sabo did the same, all of them preparing to walk out on the deck. The entire conversation had only taken a few seconds, and Marco and Thatch hadn't gotten that far, but if they didn't move now they would lose the two in the throngs of pirates on deck. Ready? Sabo tapped out, his brothers both frowning, but nodding in response. Sabo nodded as well, and then took the first step on deck. He had almost forgotten already how warm the sun felt on his skin, and how bright it was at that. They had always moved so fast between the galley and their room that they hadn't had time to enjoy the sun, but now that they were out here only for the purpose of enjoying the fresh air, they were able to actually feel the sun on their awfully pale skin. Ace and Luffy followed Sabo out onto the deck, Luffy a little more hesitantly, but within seconds all three brothers were standing on the deck, absorbing the sun. Although the sun had its benefits, the disadvantage of having to go outside to get it meant that they were the center of attention once again. All eyes were on them, all of them wide with wonder and shock, as they openly gazed at the brothers. They could at least try to be discreet about it. Ace tapped out scornfully, glaring at those staring, which was everyone. No need to be shy, come on. Sabo had forgotten their main plan to stay near Thatch or Marco, but was immediately reminded of it, as Thatch stopped and came back to them, smiling warmly to the brothers, and waving off everyone's stares. Sabo couldn't even manage to force out a response, only nodding as he took a hesitant step towards Thatch, Marco watching from slightly further away. Luffy suddenly lunged forward, grabbing at his hand and squeezing it tightly, stopping Sabo from moving any further. All eyes were still on them, but Sabo managed to ignore them for now, turning to look at Luffy with a questioning gaze. What is it, Lu? Sabo asked, tapping on the back of Luffy's hand. Had his brother sensed a bad feeling? Or did he see a bad color? He could tell Ace was thinking the same thing as he moved closer to Luffy, scanning their surroundings quickly, ready to fight. Scared. Luffy tapped the word out slowly, hesitantly on Sabo's hand, and Sabo could see Luffy scanning their surroundings as well. Sabo could hear how fast Luffy's heart was pumping, and even though his and Ace's were pumping just as fast, he could hear that Luffy was moving just a bit faster. Lots of feelings, curious, wonder, like doctors, curious about us. Luffy tapped more fervently, remembering how the doctors had felt the same feelings towards the brothers whenever they tested on them. His breathing was picking up now, and Ace and Sabo knew they had to calm him down before he caused a scene, and someone sent for a nurse. Not doctors Lu, Pyrus, good feelings right. No darkness. Ace asked, grabbing hold of Luffy's other hand. Luffy hesitantly nodded, though made sure the movement was small and discreet, so as to not tip off the pirates to their silent conversation. So we're fine. Wanna sit on the railing? Look at the sea? I'll watch your back. Ace suggested, discreetly moving his head towards the railing near the door they had just exited. Luffy started to calm down at the thought, knowing Ace would keep him safe, keep the pirates from hurting him. He smiled a little and nodded again, grip loosening and breathing slowing back to normal, though his heart was still pumping from the anxiety of everyone looking at them. Sabo was once again glad that they could have these conversations between each other within seconds, because otherwise they would have stood there in awkward silence for too long, and it would have been hard to explain. Why don't we go sit over there, Lu? Sabo asked out loud, smiling a little as Luffy nodded more confidently, even smiling a little back at him. I hope you don't mind, Sabo said in his best apologetic voice. Thatch waved it off, still smiling. It's no problem, have fun. If you need me I'll be over by Pop's chair. Thatch said gleefully, already turning to leave. Sabo sighed in relief, watching as Marco, after watching them for another second, turned and walked off as well, leaving the brothers alone. People were still watching them, but some were beginning to return to their tasks which they were grateful for, as they made their way over to the railing. There wasn't anyone over there, all of them in the middle of the large deck or near Whitebeard's chair, leaving the railings open for the brothers to relax near. Come on Lu, I'll sit with you, just don't fall off. Sabo tapped out, climbing up onto the railing and patting the spot next to him. Luffy beamed at him, jumping onto the rail as well and plopping down beside him, looking at the large ocean in front of them. Ace sat with his back against the rail and arms crossed across his chest, legs stretched out in front of him, facing everyone on the deck. He feigned sleep, making his body look relaxed on the outside, but staying constantly tense, ready for a fight at any moment as he peered through his mostly closed eyelids at everyone walking by. His amazing eyesight made it easy to see every person on deck, where they were looking, what their expressions were. Even with his eyes mostly closed, it was still clear enough for him, making him the best one to keep watch. To anyone that looked his way they'd think he was sleeping, but Sabo and Luffy knew better, especially Sabo who could still hear Ace's fast beating heart and rapid breathing. The three sat in silence, Luffy and Sabo mesmerized by the beauty of the ocean, how it seemed to continue on endlessly, sparkling in the sunlight. It's beautiful, right Lu? Sabo tapped against the rail so Ace could hear it without having to see it. Luffy nodded. Peaceful. Luffy tapped back, smiling a little. The sight made him calm down even more than before, enjoying the view. Luffy remembered one of the reasons for coming out here, and glanced at a large number of pirates behind him, some still looking his way. Stop if it gets too much. Sabo tapped, and Luffy nodded, turning to face the ocean, his eyes unfocusing as his attention was more on the feelings in the air. He did his best to filter the feelings from being one large mass of emotion into strings, connecting to each person they belonged to, searching for even a hint of the darkness in someone. He didn't know how long he searched, but he was sure that he had searched everyone on the deck, maybe even some people lingering in the galley too. No dark feeling. Luffy reported, Sabo nodding in relief beside him. The blonde had been watching Luffy closely for any signs that he was being influenced by others' emotions. The youngest had been unresponsive for almost 10 minutes by the time his eyes seemed to refocus, and he gave the message. Sabo knew it was because there was a large number of pirates on the deck, rather than just a handful of doctors in a small room. Do you want to see colors? Sabo tapped almost hesitantly. He knew how Luffy got when it came to taking down his barriers, scared that he would accidentally bring both down and start hurting people. With so many people on this deck, Luffy would probably hurt himself too by seeing too many memories at once, overloading his brain. Luffy glanced at Sabo, an unsure look on his face as he thought about it, and Sabo saw Ace shift nervously from where he sat on the ground. I wanna help. Luffy tapped, clearly nervous again. Sabo gave him a smile, sending a pulse of warmth to the youngest. You have helped Lu, you don't need to check colors if you don't feel up to it, alright. Sabo responded, Ace giving a subtle nod in agreement as he listened closely to the tapping, so he could follow the conversation. Luffy didn't respond for a minute, clearly thinking about his options. I wanna check. Luffy finally tapped, Sabo nodding as he turned on the railing to face the crew, Luffy doing the same, while Ace continued feigning sleep. Now, Luffy, doesn't the cloud look like a flower? Sabo asked, pointing to a cloud off in the distance. Luffy looked, smiling a little and nodding. And that one looks like meat. Luffy said softly, pointing to his own cloud. Seeing as the brothers had been on the deck for a little bit, now the pirates around them had all eventually stopped staring at them. But Sabo didn't want Luffy to suddenly start staring at them in silence, with no indication of why he was doing it, so he created this distraction. Luffy slowly, carefully, brought down his first barrier, taking deep breaths to keep himself calm, so he wouldn't accidentally bring both down at once. Beside him, Sabo continued rambling about different cloud shapes, pointing at them and keeping the conversation going, while Luffy began glancing around the deck. He couldn't spend too much time looking at each person, or else it would take him forever to get through everyone, but at a glance, he would be able to tell if there were any dark colors in someone's soul. His eyes skimmed across the deck quickly, making sure not to linger too long on one person. Everyone was looking good so far, everyone's colors a light shade of blue, no signs of any black or even gray in their colors. Hello, Commander. Sabo's sudden change in conversation snapped Luffy out of his scanning, as he looked to where Sabo was looking, seeing Marco walking their way, his color the same near clear blue as it had been last time. Luffy took a deep breath, replacing his barrier, the colors disappearing as Marco finally reached them. Hello, Yuri. I just came by to make sure you three were doing alright. Marco explained, and Luffy noticed that Ace wasn't feigning sleep anymore, eyes open, narrowed at the first commander. He was sitting up straighter now, body visibly tense, but not saying anything as usual. We are, thank you. Luffy and I were just enjoying the view, it's beautiful after all. Sabo explained easily, gesturing to the white expanse of ocean and sky surrounding them. Marco nodded in agreement, moving to lean over the rail, looking at the water hitting the side of the boat. That it is. Do you mind if I ask you a question, Yuri? The commander asked, looking at Sabo now who frowned a little. You may, but I'll warn you, I may not answer it, Sabo said carefully, Ace tensing more and Luffy shifting nervously on the railing, though he felt no bad feelings coming from the man. Marco nodded at the response, turning to look at the ocean again. I understand, Yuri, I wouldn't force you to answer anything you wouldn't want to. I was just wondering about something I remembered hearing back at the facility. Marco said calmly. At the mention of the facility, all three brothers tensed up considerably, Ace glaring and scowling, Sabo frowning deeply, and Luffy averting his eyes, also frowning as he shifted nervously. The three began having memories of that place, the darkness, the cells, the training room, the tests. When Thatch and I first walked in and they were trying to convince us Luffy was delusional, the lady at the desk told us that Luffy had defeated 10 guards in his escape, Marco explained, and Sabo remembered how Luffy told him that the doctors made up things when he was rescuing them, and how the upstairs of the facility had been decorated. Sabo had made the assumption that the facility had been using it as a decoy, to make anyone who wondered in believe that it was a mental hospital for children, rather than a horrible experimental lab. And? Sabo asked cautiously, not knowing what Marco was trying to get at with this line of conversation. Marco turned to look at them again, Luffy still fidgeting around nervously and Ace tensed, barely holding it together at the mention of the facility, while Sabo was trying to keep his calm, but was failing if his twiddling thumbs were anything to go by. I was wondering if it was true, Yui, Marco said nonchalantly as if it were no big deal. Sabo's frown deepened even more, and with no hesitation, he shook his head. No, Luffy, along with all of us, has no fighting background, not to mention for 7 years we were barely fed and were given more drugs than you could imagine. None of us were in any shape to fight our way out. Luffy was actually just lucky, one of the facility guards that fed us got too close to the bars, and we were able to nab the keys and escape before anyone noticed really. It wasn't until we were just about to get out that they noticed and started chasing after us. Ace and I got caught, but Luffy, obviously, escaped and found you and Mr. Chef. Sabo explained, the false story rolling easily off his tongue with practiced ease. He had made up the story for this exact moment, someone questioning how Luffy had escaped in the first place, but he hadn't needed to use it yet, until now. This would also give the pirates false beliefs when it came to the brothers' strength and fighting experience. If they believed they had none, then they would have the advantage in a fight when it came to surprising them with not only their ability to fight, but also the abilities they'd gained in the facility. The single word was tapped out quickly by Luffy, Ace turning to get a look at the youngest who looked ready to bolt. While Sabo had been explaining, he'd failed to notice Luffy's growing unease at the mention of the facility. If you'll excuse us, we'd like to head back to our room for a bit before dinner, Sabo said, already standing up off the railing along with Luffy, Ace getting up from the floor. Marco looked at them for a second before nodding. That's no problem, Yuri. I'll see you then, the commander said, already walking off. Sabo nodded to him before he and his brothers turned as well, quickly heading to their room before anyone could stop them. You okay, Lu? Ace asked when they were in the safety of their room once again. Luffy nodded, sitting on the edge of their bed, Ace joining him. Luffy hummed faintly, eyes distant as he, no doubt, began having memories of the facility. Don't worry, Lu, we're not back at that place, we never will be. In just a few days we'll probably be off this ship and on our way back home, Sabo said soothingly, sitting on Luffy's other side and rubbing the youngest back. And then we can have all the crocodile and boar meat you want, Ace said with a bright smile. Luffy turned to look at him with hopeful eyes. Really? He asked in a small voice. Ace's grin widened. Yeah. Hey, I bet we could beat the Tiger Lord with no problem now, Ace said, and just like that the tension was gone, all the bad memories, bad thoughts, dissipating as they talked about their home. In a few days, they would be on their way back home. Chapter 27. Red hair incoming. And Ace, did you see that one guy with the funny mustache? Ace sighed from where he lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I did, Luffy. And the one guy that was Huuge, Luffy said, stretching his arms out to imitate just how big the person was. Ace nodded. Yup. Oh, and there was that other guy, the one who was fighting with another guy. He had a really cool sword. The youngest continued, jabbing the air as if holding his own sword. Pretty weird. Sabo smiled from where he sat at the desk, listening to Luffy's ramblings and Ace's half-hearted answers. He was amazed Ace hadn't snapped at Luffy by now, the boy having been going on and on about the different pirates he'd seen out on deck the day before. He didn't seem like he was going to stop anytime soon, but Ace didn't look like he minded either, laying there patiently and answering Luffy diligently. Shanks was supposed to be arriving tomorrow, assuming everything had gone to plan, and the brothers' anxiety was starting to grow again, filled with unknowns and possibilities. If Shanks didn't come, what were the brothers supposed to do? The best they could do was fight their way off this giant ship, but what then? They'd be stranded with no food or fresh water. Sabo sighed, turning back to look at the desk. Although all three brothers were back in good health, though Luffy and Ace could use a bit more food, to be honest, that didn't mean they were ready to take on hundreds of pirates who were armed and ready for battle at all times. They especially wouldn't be able to do anything against Whitebeard, no matter how many abilities they had been given by the facility. They would have the element of surprise, but that would only get them so far before the pirates got over it. And there was the guy with the big hair too. At least from what Luffy saw yesterday before they got interrupted, the pirates seemed to have good colors, which meant that they were somewhat good people. Sabo had figured that the colors around the soul indicated what kind of person someone was, and the grayer or, kami forbid, black around a person, the sicker and more twisted they were, the more likely they were to hurt anyone just for the fun of it. At least these pirates didn't have that surrounding them. What about that one guy who? I think it's lunchtime. Sabo interrupted, hearing Thatch's footsteps heading their way. Normally Marco told them when lunch was ready though, so he was skeptical. Shouldn't Thatch be in the kitchen making said lunch right now anyway? While pondering those thoughts, Sabo moved towards the door, Ace sitting up in the bed, ready for anything as usual, while Luffy watched curiously, head tilted slightly. Doesn't Lazyface normally tell us it's lunchtime? Luffy asked, and Sabo was reminded of the nickname the youngest had given the first commander. It's Marco Lu, not Lazyface, and yes, normally he does, Sabo said before there was a knock on the door, and he was swinging it open. Thatch had his usual startled look, but got over it quicker than normal. Do you guys have hockey or something? Thatch asked incredulously, and Sabo had to bite back a laugh, tilting his head in mock confusion and furrowing his eyebrows, looking to be in deep thought. Hockey? What's that? Sabo asked innocently. Really, it was getting too easy to hide just how strong they were when the pirates asked questions like this. Thatch opened his mouth, looking flustered. You know, it's uncomplicated anyways, lunch is ready. Thatch said, immediately grinning instead. Sabo nodded, already hearing Luffy and Ace standing and moving closer. Thank you, Sabo said pleasantly, the brothers filing out of the room and heading towards the galley, wanting to get the meal over with. Seeing as Shanks was coming, it was taking everything they had to keep calm, and meal times were always stressful for the trio. Right. So, you guys coming out again today? Thatch asked as he jogged to catch up with them. Normally the brothers wouldn't let anyone stay behind them, but seeing as it was only Thatch, someone Luffy had gotten a good read on in terms of both emotion and soul color. They were a little okay with him being there, especially since they could still keep an eye on him, seeing as he was the only one behind them. We haven't really thought about it, Sabo said shortly, shrugging. The brothers actually had thought about it, a lot in fact, but they still hadn't come to a decision. Luffy hadn't gotten to see everyone's soul colors yesterday because they'd been interrupted, but if they did go there was always the chance that they would be interrupted again, and have to answer more questions. Oh, well I hope you do, I never got to hang out with you yesterday. Jiro got me wrapped up in some business with his division, and Pops was thinking of sending a small group from my division to one of our islands. Thatch said, relaxing with his arms behind his head as he walked. They were reaching the galley now, all of them filing in and making their way to the commander table. Some pirates still stared, but most were used to seeing the brothers in the galley by now, and didn't pay them much mind, which made it easier on the brothers. Where's Marco? Nemur asked as they reached the table, and Sabo was silently grateful the fisherman had asked the question, because he had been wondering the same thing. Don't know, said something about extra paperwork this morning that he needed to get done. I gave him some lunch and decided to grab these three on my way back here. Thatch said, gesturing to the trio who were now digging into their lunch that Thatch had given to them. Nemur nodded in understanding, also returning to his own food. That guy works too much, we gotta take that paperwork away from him, Atmos said, shaking his head. Haruta scoffed. We'd be in charge of doing it then, Haruta said, waving a fork at Atmos who cringed at the thought. On second thought, let's support Marco and his hard-working ways, Atmos said quickly, digging into his food while Haruta laughed. Really though, how does he always end up with so much paperwork when he works so much? Rikuyu asked. He's in charge of the first division, not to mention overseeing all other divisions, including second, seeing as we still don't have another commander to fill in for them, Izo explained calmly, the table growing quiet after that. The brothers were listening with interest, trying to learn as much about the Whitebeards as they could without having to ask questions. They didn't know how they operated, but this conversation was giving them good insight into it. Well, we know where Marco is, but what about Pops? Nurses at him again? Fasa asked, looking at the empty chair at the head of their table. From what I heard, Marco sent him there himself before shutting himself away. Caught him drinking again. Kingu said, everyone nodding in understanding. The day Pop stops drinking is the day Thatch shaves his head, Vista said casually, Thatch gasping and grabbing his pompadour almost protectively. Never? Thatch gasped, everyone laughing again. Hey, by the way, Curiel stopped talking as he turned to address the brothers, only to find their seats empty, the door to the galley swinging closed. Damn, missed him, Curiel said with a shrug, everyone laughing again. Gotta be faster than that, Curiel. Haruta teased. They sure do eat fast. Fasa observed, looking at the plates that were practically licked clean. But they eat everything, so I've got no issues with it. Thatch said happily, grabbing the empty plates. They sure are interesting kids, Izo said fondly, watching the doors that the brothers had escaped out of. Yeah, and the blonde keeps doing this weird thing. Thatch exclaimed, everyone, turning to him with raised eyebrows. Weird thing? Atmos asked, intrigued. Thatch nodded. Yeah, every time I knock on their door Sabo opens up the second I knock, like he knows I'm coming. Thatch explained, still curious about how the blonde did it. Hockey? Blenheim asked. Thatch shrugged. I asked the same thing, but Sabo didn't seem to know what it was. If he does have it, he obviously doesn't know about it. What's so funny? Ace asked with a raised eyebrow as he and Luffy watched their blonde brother stifle a laugh from his spot on the bed. Oh, nothing, just something I overheard, Sabo said, waving off his brother's curiosity, tuning out of the commander's conversation. Ace shrugged at that, deciding he wasn't going to get anything more out of his brother. Well, in any case, we should talk about what we're gonna do today. Do we want to go back out on deck? Ace asked, immediately getting down to business, crossing his arms. Luffy was fiddling with his hat, which was held tightly in his hands, not looking up. It would be nice to get some fresh air again, but only if Luffy's up to it. He didn't get a look at everyone's color yesterday. We also have to be prepared for someone trying to ask more questions too, Sabo said, weighing their options. Ace nodded, the two of them turning to look at Luffy. What do you think, Lu? Ace asked gently. The last thing they wanted was to make Luffy too uncomfortable. Luffy tilted his head back and forth, deep in thought, a serious expression on his face. I might wanna, but I don't want to talk to him, Luffy explained slowly, Ace and Sabo nodding in understanding. If someone comes our way, you and Ace can head back. I'll distract whoever it is and then follow right after. Sabo suggested, though he didn't really like that plan. If they did this, then Sabo would be left alone, even if it was only for a minute. His brothers caught this as well, both shaking their heads. No way in hell I'm leaving you alone, Ace said sternly. Ma'am. I wanna stay with both Ace and Sabo, Luffy said, Sabo sighing, somewhat relieved his brothers rejected his idea. Alright, then maybe you and Ace can start to head back, but go slow. If I don't start heading after you by the time you reach the door, then you can head back to me. Ace, you'll be able to see me the entire time. If I need you guys to come back or need help, I'll signal for you, Sabo said, imitating their sign for help. This idea seemed to go over more smoothly than the last, Ace and Luffy nodding their agreement to the plan, even if it was with slight reluctance. So we're going then? Ace asked. It went silent for a minute, the three of them glancing at each other, before Sabo sighed again, nodding. I guess so. Let's get this over with. In the back of Luffy's mind, he knew he didn't have to do this. He knew he could just signal to his brothers, and they would be back in their room faster than Luffy could eat a piece of meat, which was pretty fast, mind you, but Luffy wanted to do this. More like had to do this. He felt like, if he didn't do this, he would be letting himself, Ace and Sabo down. It would be like letting the bad doctors win, everyone at the facility smiling and laughing at him because of what they'd done to him. He remembered when he was back home in his village before he met Ace and Sabo, when he would run up to strangers with no hesitation and smile, and ask said stranger a wide variety of things. He remembered when he could run up to completely unknown pirates and act as if he were talking with Makino, someone he knew and trusted. He remembered when he didn't feel any of these bad feelings, the nervousness, the anxiety, the nausea. That was the worst, the feeling that he was going to hurl his lunch over the railing. He loved eating, and whenever he felt that way, the last thing he wanted to do was eat. It was all those doctors' fault, and he hated them for that. He just wanted to go back to the way things were, when he could smile and laugh without worrying that he was being too loud, and that the doctors would come and punish him because of it. He and Sabo were sitting on the railing, Sabo keeping up a conversation by himself beside him as he scanned the deck, going over everyone's colors quickly. He had to do this, had to prove to himself that he could go back to how things were, that he could go back to normal. He knew Ace and Sabo were always worried about him, worried that he would become like he had back in the facility, when he would barely smile, barely talk to anyone, even his brothers. Luffy didn't want to become like that again either. Doing this would prove he could get better. Going out on deck with strangers, pirates no less, would prove that he could handle himself like he used to. But even as he had these thoughts, he could feel his anxiety peaking, nausea churning in his stomach, the nervousness making him twitchy. His feet were swinging in an attempt to vent out some of that nervous energy, his fingers rapping against the railing in a way that showed his brothers that he wasn't signaling something, but rather making the noise just to make the noise. He was losing focus, he needed to keep his focus, if he didn't, he might accidentally let down his other barrier, and he definitely didn't want to start looking into everyone's past, not when there were these many people. Blue, 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 everywhere he looked there was a blue aura around the pirates mingling on the deck. This was a good sign though, right? This meant that these were good people. But even good people could turn bad. It only took one wrong thought, one wrong intention, for that clear blue to start turning gray. He has seen it happen, one of the new doctors having come to the facility with a clear blue aura, but the longer they stayed, the darker their color got. Until it was a stormy gray that made Luffy's stomach churn. It was never as bad as Harris, he had never seen anyone as bad as Harris, but it wasn't a pleasant sight. The pulse of warmth coming from his brothers brought him back to the present, and he basked in the feeling, allowing his nervousness and anxiety to wash away, letting the warmth in. He was careful with how much he took in, not wanting whatever happened with the giant captain to happen again, but it was still pleasant nonetheless. The colors. Sabo's tapping against the railing caught his attention, but he didn't stop scanning the pirates. Yeah, no darkness so far. Luffy responded slowly, keeping his eyes peeled for even a hint of gray in someone's aura. With his thoughts taken off of the facility, Luffy was able to start focusing more and more on scanning the pirates. He was nearly finished now. The brothers had been out on the deck for nearly half an hour in the same spot and positions that they had been in yesterday. So far no one had bothered them, but as Luffy was finishing up with the pirates that changed. First commander coming this way. Luffy tensed at the taps and was ready to get up and walk away with Ace like they had planned, but he was almost done looking at all the pirates. You and Luffy go, I'll deal with it quickly. Sabo tapped, already turning to look at the commander with a warm smile. The thought that Sabo was getting good at acting crossed Luffy's mind before he returned to the task at hand. No, almost done. Luffy tapped, scanning quicker than he had before, noticing Lazy Face was nearly here by now. Ace and Sabo looked at him. You sure, Lu? Ace tapped, but Luffy only nodded, determination on his face as he glanced around the deck. Ace and Sabo shared a look before sighing and shrugging. Alright, but leave if you have to. Sabo tapped out and Luffy nodded, focusing wholeheartedly on the pirates rather than the commander. Hello, Commander. Luffy could hear Sabo addressing Lazy Face, but Luffy refused to look that way. If he did he would feel the anxiety again. Hello. I'm glad I found you three so easily, Yuri. Marco said in his usual tone. Sabo kept the smile on, tilting his head slightly. Did you have something you wanted to discuss? Sabo questioned and Luffy's lips thinned, trying his best to block the words out. Only a few more people left now. I did. We just got a call on the Den from Red Hair. He said he should be arriving here tomorrow shortly after breakfast, Yuri. Marco explained, arms crossed casually as he watched the brothers almost too closely. Luffy had just finished checking everyone's colors when he heard those words, immediately tensing, skin paling a little at the reminder. Shanks was coming. Shanks was gonna be here tomorrow. Shanks was gonna see him again. He would be breaking his promise. He wasn't a great pirate. He wasn't anywhere near being a great pirate yet. What would Shanks think of him now? He had been captured, he had been tested on, he had been hurt and injured and drugged, and if he had been strong, none of it would have ever happened. But he wasn't strong. He had gotten captured because he was weak. He had gotten hurt because he was weak. He had gotten injured because he was weak. He had to watch children and friends die right in front of him because he was too weak to save them, too weak to stop the doctors from hurting them. He had killed. Luffy shuddered as the memories of the fear in the children's eyes returned. The looks they gave him as he tried connecting to them under Hare's orders. The look in their eyes as they passed away right in front of him. Because of him. He was too weak to stop himself from killing others. Vaguely he was aware of Ace grabbing his hand, of his feet touching the ground as he was pulled along. He felt numb though, like he wasn't really moving his body, like it was on autopilot. Maybe people were talking around him, or even to him, but he couldn't hear them, couldn't feel anything, couldn't think about anything but their eyes. The children's eyes as they looked at him, terrified. How could he face Shanks when he couldn't even face himself? How could he look at Shanks without being reminded that he had failed his idol? That he had gone and gotten himself captured, gone and let people die? Luffy. How is he going to face his brothers? How could his brothers face him? They knew what he had done, they knew what he could do. How could they look at him and still stay by his side? Luffy, calm down. He couldn't do this. He couldn't go back to the way things had been, because he would be lying, to himself, to his brothers, to everyone. He wasn't his old self, he was changed, he was different, he couldn't go back to how he used to be, not after all the things he had done. Luffy. The harsh stinging on his cheek snapped him from his thoughts, a sharp slapping noise echoing in the room around him as he looked around. When had he gone back to his room? When had he left the deck? Luffy, you with us again? His brother's voice had him turning, looking curiously into Ace's eyes. He brought a hand to his cheek, the sting already dulling as he realized Ace had slapped him, with hockey of course. Ace? Sabo? He asked, noticing the blonde was there as well, both of them sitting on their bed with him. Hey Luffy, it's okay, we're back in the room now, Sabo said calmly, rubbing his back calmly. He could feel the warmth again, radiating off his brothers along with their worry and concern. Suddenly Luffy's lip was trembling, his hand dropping from his cheek as his eyes began watering. He tried to stop the tears, but once one fell they all began falling, a sob breaking from his throat, and suddenly he was wailing, tears streaming. It's alright Luffy, we're here with you. Yeah, don't worry Lu, we won't let anything happen to you. Luffy? Marco turned to look at the youngest who was sitting beside Sabo on the railing, Ace standing at his side and grabbing his hand. The kid's eyes looked glazed over, distant, and Marco wondered what had triggered it. All he had said was that the red-haired brat would be here tomorrow, but why would that cause the youngest to look so distant? Before he could voice these questions Ace was tugging the boy off the rail, Luffy moving almost robotically as Ace pulled him away, some of his brothers looking after the two in confusion, noticing the dazed look on Luffy's face. I'm sorry Commander. Thank you for the information. Sabo said in a hurry, jumping off the rail himself and rushing off after his brothers, leaving Marco more confused than ever. Everyone else was watching in confusion as well, no one quite sure what to make of what had just happened. Marco turned, seeing Whitebeard looking at him with confusion in his eyes as well. "What happened, son?" Whitebeard asked as Marco made his way over to the giant, the other commanders gathering around as well, wondering the same thing. Marco shrugged. "I don't know, Yoi, all I did was tell them that red hair was going to arrive tomorrow," Marco explained, leaving everyone just as confused as before. "But wouldn't that make them happy? Why did the kid look so detached?" Blenheim asked. "Maybe they don't like Shanks after all," Thatch questioned, still not sure about this whole thing. "I don't know. If they don't like him, why would red hair go looking for them for this many years?" Izo asked. "We're not going to get answers to these questions today. Tomorrow we'll keep an eye on the brats, and when red hair gets here we'll keep a close eye on him too. For now, let's just make sure we keep them comfortable," Whitebeard announced, the commanders nodding in understanding. It was only minutes after this conversation that they heard it. It was so loud and sudden that it made most of the crew members on the deck jump in surprise, everyone turning towards the sound in shock. "Was that?" Thatch murmured from where he stood beside Marco, eyes wide. Marco was frowning deeply, a change from his usual bored look, and nodded. Thatch frowned as well, looking down at the deck as sadness welled in him. The crew tried their best to ignore the heart-wrenching cries coming from the brothers' room. Chapter 28. Finally. The arrival of Shanks. "Remember Luffy, the second you don't like it, we leave," Ace said, drilling it into Luffy's head. The youngest nodded mutely, a frown on his face as he shuffled his feet along the floor, the brothers heading back from breakfast. "I mean it, Lou, even if we didn't even make it out onto the deck," Ace urged, again Luffy only nodding mutely. "And if they come hunting us down, we run, we get a lifeboat, and we leave," Ace continued. Sabo sighed, really hoping it didn't come to that, but knowing if it did even he would go along with that plan. "Ace, calm down, we're all on edge right now, the best thing we can do is try and relax a bit before Shanks gets here," Sabo said, hesitating near the end, both he and Ace looking at Luffy who looked like he was trying to sink into the floor. "Do you want to try and take a nap? Ace and I will stay up," Sabo asked as they entered their room. Luffy shook his head but shuffled to the bed anyway and lay down, facing the wall silently. Ace and Sabo watched him with worry, the blonde sighing. They both sent the youngest pulses of warmth in hopes that it would calm him down, turning to give each other their attention. "What do you think's wrong with him?" Ace asked through their silent language, making sure he didn't make any noise with his tapping, so Luffy wasn't disturbed. Sabo shook his head. "I wish I knew. It might have to do with whatever promise he made to Shanks, but we won't know for sure unless he tells us. The best thing we can do right now is try and keep him calm," Sabo responded. Ace nodded in agreement. "Yesterday, do you think he was thinking about all those kids?" Ace asked his brother, remembering the look in Luffy's eyes. He had only seen it once before, the same distant, distraught look as back when he was in the facility, after Harry forced him to hurt all those kids. Most likely, the only time he ever looked like that was back then. Sabo tapped back sadly, moving to sit in the desk chair while Ace sat on the bed, near the edge, so he could give Luffy space. "When do you think he'll get here?" Ace asked, moving to lay down as well. Sabo shrugged, closing his eyes. "Who knows, any minute now really," Sabo replied, his own anxiousness beginning to take hold. Silence lapsed over the three, no one speaking, whether through actual words or through their silent tapping. None of them were able to relax, all on edge, ready to go. Luffy was staring despondently at the wall, a million thoughts running through his head at once. Maybe he could just avoid Shanks, stay in the room until he left. That way, he wouldn't break the promise. But Shanks was coming there specifically to see him, so did that mean Shanks didn't believe he could keep his promise after this, and wanted to take Luffy's hat back? If Luffy didn't have the hat, all of their promises would be non-existent. The straw hat was what was binding all those promises together, reminding Luffy every day exactly what he'd agreed to when Shanks had given it to him. So who was he to avoid Shanks if he wanted to break off their promise? It was Shanks' hat, after all, it never truly belonged to him, and he was the one to break their promise in the first place. The fact that Shanks even needed to come looking for him proved that, because no great pirate would need someone to come looking for them. The great pirate wouldn't have been caught in the first place. He had to see Shanks then, if only to give the hat back. He didn't want to though. He remembered when he used to look forward to seeing Shanks' ship in the harbor, when he was excited and happy and energized, ready to hear tales from the red-haired man, and hang out with Yasop and Ben. Luffy didn't know how much time had passed since breakfast, but he did know that the longer he lay there, the worse his anxiety got. He didn't want to move from his spot, didn't want to look at anyone, just wanted to melt into the bed and ignore the world forever. "He's here." Sabo's words were soft, hesitant, and they made Luffy's anxiety skyrocket, to the point that he was practically shaking with nervousness. "Don't worry, Lou, remember, we don't need to see him," Ace said soothingly, but it did nothing to ease Luffy's tension. Not even the warm feelings coming from Ace and Sabo helped like they normally did. Sabo could hear the pirates greeting Shanks and his crew, hear the red-haired pirate boarding the Moby, hear Whitebeard send Marco to get the brothers. He took a deep, steadying breath and stood from the desk chair, moving to the door. Do you want to go, Lu? Ace is right, we don't have to go see him, I can make up an excuse. Sabo said, worried for the youngest who still hadn't moved, except for the slight tremors that ran through his body. Luffy was silent for a minute, and Sabo could hear Marco getting closer. Finally, Luffy moved, sitting up and nodding. Wanna go? Despite his words, the youngest looked like he definitely didn't want to go, but Sabo nodded regardless, knowing Luffy would say something if he couldn't handle it. Even if he didn't, Ace and Sabo knew the signs, what to look out for so something like yesterday couldn't happen again. Yesterday had been sudden and unexpected, giving all three brothers no warning as to the fact that Luffy was going to break down, but now they, for the most part, knew what was going to happen. Alright, just stay close, Lu, Sabo said worriedly, a part of him wanting to stay in the room with his brothers, and ignore the world outside the door. Ace seemed to be thinking the same thing if his clenched fists were anything to go by. Marco was outside their door now, his knock echoing almost deafeningly in the now silent room. Sabo had to take another deep breath before he finally opened the door, forcing a smile onto his face, though he was sure it looked as strained as it felt. Red hair's here, Yoi, Marco announced without any hesitation. Sabo nodded, already knowing this, Luffy and Ace already close behind him as Sabo silently opened the door, all of them shuffling out of the room, and following Marco down the hall. The walk was made in complete silence, the air thick with tension, and the brothers filled with so much nervous energy, that they felt they were going to burst. Sabo noticed that Marco kept glancing at the brothers, and he hoped he wouldn't say anything, seeing Ace noticing it as well from beside him. Luffy was too out of it to notice, which was probably a good thing. When they reached the end of the hall, Marco pushed the door open, the light pouring into the hall as the brothers watched Marco step outside. Ready? Sabo asked Luffy, he and Ace grabbing the youngest hands to comfort him. Luffy merely stared out into the light, eventually nodding. Let's go then. Ace said softly, he and Sabo stepping outside, pulling Luffy along with them. All eyes were on them seeing as they were the center of attention, but the brothers ignored it, more focused on the main issue. Ace could already see the red hair that Shanks was known for sitting in front of Whitebeard's chair. All of the commanders stood beside the giant captain who was looking at Shanks, though his attention shifted to the brothers as they started making the slow walk towards him. Ace could see Shanks standing now too, turning to face them, a slight look of worry on his face that made Ace wonder. The walk seemed to take hours, but they eventually got close enough that even Sabo and Luffy could see the commanders and two captains. Luffy let go of their hands at this point, hiding behind the two of them, grabbing onto their shirts instead as they finished walking up to the captains. It was silent for a moment, no one knowing what to say, no one knowing who should speak up first. The brothers were now in front of Shanks himself, everyone staring at each other expectantly, no one knowing what to do, not wanting to be the one to break the silence, but eventually. It was Shanks that spoke first. We haven't met before, I'm red-haired Shanks, you must be Ace and Sabo, right? He asked, smiling a little to the brothers who were effectively hiding Luffy behind them. Ace and Sabo nodded. That is correct, Mr. Akagami. It's a pleasure to meet you. Sabo said politely. He would have bowed, but he was busy hiding Luffy, so he decided to stay standing. Call me Shanks. So, I hear you're the Little Anchor's brothers, huh? Shanks asked, the tension still hanging in the air. Sabo nodded again, choosing not to comment on the Anchor nickname, even as he felt Luffy shift behind him. Speaking of the Anchor, Shanks said, trailing off as he looked in between Ace and Sabo, where he knew Luffy was hiding. Luffy gripped his brother's shirts tighter in his fists, squeezing his eyes shut as he tried taking deep breaths, tried staying calm. It was time, he had to face Shanks, he had to break his promise. Ace and Sabo glanced behind them with worry, noticing the look on Luffy's face. Everyone around them was watching with bated breaths, silence filling the air. Slowly Luffy shuffled closer to Ace and Sabo, gently pushing them aside so he could peek at Shanks, opening his eyes slowly to meet the man's gaze. Luffy. The name came out with a breath of relief, Shanks' face melting, a small smile still on his face. Luffy only managed to look Shanks in the eye for a second before they drifted to the ground. Luffy, I'm so glad you're okay, Shanks said in such pure joy that it shocked Luffy. Where was the disappointment? The anger? Shouldn't he be mad that Luffy was breaking their promise? That he had gotten captured in the first place? Why was he happy? When Garp told me you were kidnapped, I was scared. Shanks continued, the words seeming to spill out before the captain could stop them. Luffy finally managed to look back up to Shanks' eyes, noticing the tears that were filling them, only serving to shock him more. And then no one could find you, and we looked everywhere. Shanks said, laughing a little, though it was weak and strained. Luffy could feel his own tears starting to form, his grip on his brother's clothes loosening as his lip trembled. Luffy, I was so worried. Shanks finished, and something in Luffy broke, his tears falling in much the same way they had the day before, spilling out fast, running down his cheeks quickly, as his hands fell from his brother's clothes altogether. Before he knew it he was running, nearly tackling Shanks to the ground as he wrapped his arms around him tightly, careful not to stretch them though. And then he cried. He cried almost as loud as he had yesterday, gripping to Shanks like he was his lifeline, like, if he let go, the man would disappear. Shanks. I was so scared, and there were mean people, and they hurt me, and they hurt Ace, and they hurt Sabo, and they gave us nasty food, and they kept giving us these weird shots, and it hurt a lot, and they made me. Luffy's words trailed off into more wails, the crew's hearts all collectively breaking at the boys' cries. It was the most they had gotten out of the brothers about what had happened in the facility, and even still they only had more questions than answers, but they weren't going to push it. Ace and Sabo both watched their brother cry in Shanks' arms, noticing the red-haired pirate was shedding a few tears of his own, and relaxed. They were safe with this pirate, that much was obvious. If Luffy was able to get this close to someone, it was definitely someone they could trust. That didn't mean they weren't going to keep a close eye on him though. This lasted for a few minutes before the two finally separated, Luffy sniffling and wiping at his eyes a few times, before moving back to Ace and Sabo's side. Shanks. Ace spoke up suddenly, shocking everyone seeing as he hadn't spoken much at all, normally leaving it to the blonde. Sabo glanced at Ace out of the corner of his eye, but trusted his brother wouldn't do anything too stupid. He had a feeling he knew what he was going to say anyway. Yeah? Shanks asked, wiping his own tears away. Suddenly Ace was bowing, and Sabo did the same shortly after. Thank you for saving our little brother's life. He can be a handful. Ace said respectfully, slightly shocking Sabo. And thank you for looking for us as well, Sabo added sincerely, both of them maintaining their bow for another minute before raising again, Shanks grinning, tears forgotten. That was no big deal, and besides, I wasn't the only one looking, Shanks said, the mood suddenly becoming more somber while the brothers shared a confused look, Luffy back in between his brothers. Who else was looking? Sabo asked. Over the years the brothers had convinced themselves that no one was looking for them, so now to suddenly hear that more than one person had been searching was baffling to them. Why, Garp of course. Shanks said incredulously as if the brothers should have known that already. The brothers frowned. Jai-chan was looking for us. Luffy asked, confused. If that's true, how come the shitty geezer never found us? Ace asked skeptically. The world's pretty big, Ace. If Garp was looking for us he must have searched the blues first, and even that takes a while. Sabo said, though he was also skeptical. Garp was a marine. If he wanted them found he shouldn't have had such issues with it. Speaking of, I have to tell him the good news. Shanks said, pulling out a den mushi. You didn't inform him sooner. Whitebeard asked, and the brothers had nearly forgotten the others surrounding them, which was kind of difficult. Shanks turned to face the captain, shaking his head. I wanted to make sure before I gave him any hope, Shanks said softly, beginning to dial the marine's number. Pure. The brothers tensed at the ringing tone, not prepared for this at all. They didn't think anyone had been looking for them, and now they were about to be faced with everyone all at once, people they hadn't seen in years, people they'd given up hope on. Pure, gotcha. Luffy was gripping his brother's hands in his own, squeezing them as tight as he could, as he practically shook with nervous anxiety. Ace was biting the inside of his cheek so hard that it was nearly drawing blood, whereas Sabo was doing the same with his lip, though his was actually beginning to bleed slightly. The blonde ignored the sting, only biting down harder as they heard a familiar voice speak up. Red hair. Their grandfather's voice sounded much more tired than they remembered, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. It wasn't as loud or boisterous, just resigned and quiet. It was unlike anything they had heard before, and it only served to confuse them. Garp, I've got some good news, Shanks said with a smile, looking over at the brothers who tried their best to hide their anxiety from the many onlookers. Oh? Garp sounded a bit more interested now, the snail perking up and the tone becoming a bit more cheery. Shanks nodded, grinning even more if possible. Sure do. It seems Whitebeard's found him. Shanks said, only to be met with silence. You sure? It sounded like Garp was trying not to get his hopes up, but there was a restrained excitement to the voice, an almost choked sound coming through like he was trying not to cry. 100%. I'm looking at him with my own eyes. Shanks said happily, and Ace could see tears filling the snail's eyes. Sabo, still biting his lip, stepped forward a bit. Understanding what he wanted, Shanks handed over the snail to the blonde. Hey, there old man, Sabo said weakly, trying his best to keep his tone light and joking, but the emotion on his voice covered it. The tears, which were now visible to Sabo and Luffy, began falling now. Sabo, there was such happiness and emotion in Garp's voice that it nearly knocked the brothers onto the floor. They had never heard their grandfather talk that way, it was rare to hear him any other way, but angry or overly boisterous. In the flesh, Sabo said, smiling a little as he looked at the snail. I told you to call me Grandpa, you brat. What used to be an angry exclamation was now watery and weak, compared to how it used to be, the sound of Garp crying coming over the snail. Are your brothers with you? Are you three safe? No one's hurt you there, have they? The questions were suddenly pouring in, and Sabo had to hold the snail away, as Garp's voice got louder and more urgent despite his tears. We're here, shitty Gramps. Luffy too. Ace spoke up, shocking Sabo as he hadn't expected him to want to talk to Garp. Ace? And you said Luffy's with you too? Garp's voice was filled with relief as he heard the eldest. Ace nodded, nudging Luffy a little. The youngest looked hesitant but looked back over to the snail, Sabo moving it in front of Luffy. Hi, Jai-chan, Luffy said quietly, and Garp's tears were falling faster now. Thank Kami, you three are safe. Garp cried, silence falling as Garp compassed himself. Where are you three? I'll head your way. Garp said after a minute, and Sabo looked up at Whitebeard, not really sure where they were. They're safe with us, Garp, we're in the Grand Line. Whitebeard's loud voice boomed. The Grand Line, huh? I can be there within a day. If I find one hair out of place on my grandsons, you'll regret it, Whitebeard. Garp threatened, eyes narrowing. Whitebeard's laughter boomed across the deck, waving off the threat. No need to worry, Garp, we haven't harmed the brats, Whitebeard said, and Garp nodded, frown leaving his face as he addressed the brothers. Don't worry, I'll be there in a day, see you soon, brats, Garp said, and Ace scoffed, rolling his eyes. Shitty Gramps, we can take care of ourselves. Ace said, but even he was relieved that Garp hadn't abandoned them, the only other man they really called family besides Dayton and the bandits. Garp's laugh rang out loud and clear through Snail. I know you can. Stay safe. He said before the snail clicked again and went to sleep, Garp having hung up. Sabo handed the snail back to Shanks, who placed it back in his cloak. Well, now that that's over, why don't we go have ourselves a party for your safe return, Anchor? The guys really missed you too. Yasop was beginning to run out of people to put to sleep with his stories about Yusuf. Oh, and Ben was pretty excited to hear you were safe, Lucky Roo too. Shanks rambled happily, gesturing with his arm. Luffy smiled slightly, remembering everyone from Shanks' crew, and how much he got along with all of them. Sorry, Whitebeard, but I'm gonna steal the boys from you for a bit, Shanks said, turning to address the giant who merely laughed, waving his hand. That's fine, red-haired brat, go have some fun, Whitebeard said, Shanks, nodding and thanking the man once more before he started ushering the brothers over to his ship where his crew was watching, all of them cheering when they saw the brothers. Hey, it's Anchor. Hey Anchor, it's good to see you. We've missed you, Luffy. Glad to have you back, little guy. Luffy fought back the tears as he saw all the familiar faces waving and cheering at him. Ace and Sabo squeezed his hands and he looked up at them, both of them smiling encouragingly as they all made their way over to the ship. It's good to see them again, Halu. Ace asked, Luffy nodding happily in response. Well, it's a good thing we're heading there then, Sabo said, smiling happily to the youngest who beamed back at him. He was still a bit timid, and he could feel his brother's tension and nervousness, but he shouldn't be scared to see Shanks' crew, they were his friends, he knew they weren't bad people. And besides, there was gonna be a party. And Shanks knew about his devil fruit and how much he ate, so he and Ace could eat as much as they wanted without having to worry. This was going to be a good thing. Chapter 29. The Brothers Tell All. The Whitebeard pirates watched as the three brothers followed Shanks over onto his ship, the Kagame's crew cheering loudly with excitement as they began surrounding the brothers. It was strange to see the three closed-off, timid, cautious brothers smile and accept the hugs and pats on the backs from the other crew, when the Whitebeards could barely sit next to them at the table, without having the brothers glare at them. But as they watched they saw Luffy smiling, laughing, jumping from one person to the next, handing out hugs with ease, his brothers following with smiles of their own. Even still, Whitebeard could see some of the tension the brothers still held as they made their rounds. He could see the wary looks Ace and Sabo were giving to those around them, could see the slight hesitance Luffy showed before he gave a hug, but that was to be expected. None of the Whitebeards knew exactly what they had been through, so there was no telling what long-term effects it would have on the brothers, even to those they used to know. The captain would be lying though if he said he hadn't thought about making the trio a part of his crew, but he knew they had a family, people they probably wanted to see again, and after what they had been through, who was he to take that away from them? That wouldn't stop him from mentioning it to the brothers at some point though, and if they decided to join, who was he to stop them then? Ace, Sabo, and Luffy smiled to everyone on Shanks' ship, giving their final waves as they followed the red-haired captain and his first mate into the depths of their ship, heading to a meeting room. The three were still tense, but they did their best to put on an air of calmness, cheerfulness. That had been the most contact that the brothers had had in years that didn't intend to harm them. Ace and Sabo were still extremely uncomfortable because, even though they knew of the red-haired pirates, they didn't personally know them. They were strangers. Luffy had no such qualms, but that didn't mean he was completely relaxed either. Even though he knew these pirates, was friends with them, he was still hesitant before touching them or letting them touch him. Would it be the same when they returned home? Would they shy away from Garp, from Dayton and the bandits, or Makino even? If they couldn't handle these people they knew for sure were good, what did that mean for their family back home? Walking into the meeting room, there was only a table with chairs surrounding it in the middle of the room, a few den mushes against the wall as well. Shanks and Ben went and sat in the chairs, the brothers following suit and sitting across from Captain and First Mate. It was silent because the brothers knew what question Shanks was going to ask, and Shanks knew the brothers knew, but no one wanted to start the topic. The tenseness was already there, and Luffy couldn't lift his eyes from the table. The three hadn't told anyone what had happened in the facility, but once people started finding out, how would they react? They had been modified to be more powerful than a normal human, so there was the chance someone would try to use them as weapons. If the Marines found out, would they try and use them? If some greedy pirate found out, would they try and use them? If Shanks found out, would he try and use them? Or would he show sympathy? Would he listen to the brothers' story and give them eyes of pity? Would he try and help them get better? There were too many possibilities at play, and it only served to unnerve the brothers further. I think we all know what the elephant in the room is, so I'm just gonna ask. You three don't have to answer if you don't want to, I'll understand, but I want to help, and to do that, I need to know. The brothers all looked down at Shanks' words. Ready to hear them but unsure if they were ready to answer. What happened? Sabo bit his lip, staring intently at the wood pattern on the table. Luffy, who was in between he and Ace, was shifting again, avoiding everyone's eyes while fiddling with the straw hat in his hands. Ace wasn't much better off either though, also looking at the table, glaring at it as if it had insulted him and clenching his fists tightly. Do you want to tell? Sabo tapped to his brothers. Really, he and Ace both knew that it was up to Luffy, because if Luffy did or didn't want to, they would listen. Ace peeked over, though not so much as to give away that they were communicating with each other. Luffy? Ace asked. The two eldest felt a little bad that they were putting all the pressure on the youngest, but, really, it was his decision. Luffy remained silent for another second, his shifting becoming increasingly more noticeable as time passed. I'll do all of the talking. If you want to leave at any time, you and Ace can go, don't worry, it's all up to you. Sabo said, wanting Luffy to be comfortable. He didn't want his little brother to have another panic attack over this. Luffy's shifting calmed a bit, and he glanced at Sabo momentarily, and then Ace, both nodding to him and sending him pulses of warmth. Alright, Luffy tapped hesitantly, though he didn't raise his eyes to meet Shanks. Sabo gulped, taking a deep breath as he raised his eyes, Ace as well. It's a bit of a long story, Mr. Akagami, Sabo said, still unsure if he should really call the captain Shanks, despite the fact that the man himself had already told him it was okay. That's fine, I didn't expect it to be short, but really, just Shanks is fine. Mr. Akagami makes me feel old, Shanks said with a light-hearted pout, obviously trying to lighten the mood. Sabo swallowed again, glancing at Ben who had been silent the entire time, allowing Shanks to do all the talking. Well, I guess it started the day we were taken then, Sabo said softly. He didn't know if he was even ready to talk about this, but he had already started, so now there was no going back. We were just finished sparring for the day, Sabo started, the three of them remembering that day clearly. Sabo had to clear his throat before continuing, the feeling of it closing up making him pause. We were laying there and then, out of nowhere, these three guys came and started attacking us. We had Luffy try and run to Dayton's to get help, but he was caught before he could. He was able to scream though, and I'm sure she heard it too because it was loud enough for the whole forest to hear. Sabo said with a slight smile, remembering how crazy the animals around them had went, all running the opposite way they had heard Luffy shout from. And then they were tying us up and taking us to some other ship, Sabo said, his smile dropping. Luffy began fidgeting again, and Ace was clenching and unclenching his fists, his anger noticeable to Luffy who tried not to let it influence him. Shanks and Ben were listening to the story in silence, frowns on both of their faces as they did, but giving no input. I don't know how long we were on it, maybe a month, but we were kept in a small room, most likely a closet, and fed enough that we didn't die. It was obvious enough they needed us alive, we just didn't know why. Plenty of people had plenty of reason for wanting us after all. Sabo said with a nonchalant shrug, trying to play off how nervous he was. His stomach was twisting almost painfully, and he was beginning to feel slightly light-headed at the thought of what came next in this story. Shanks and Ben's expressions hadn't changed much, the only noticeable difference being that their frowns were deeper than before, giving way to their obvious dislike of what had happened to them. And then, we reached whatever island it was that they were taking us to. We were taken off the ship and immediately given to a different man who seemed excited to have us. Sabo said, trying to think of a good word to use. He suppressed a shiver at the thought of hair, trying his best to ignore the heavy feeling in his chest, or the nauseous rumble in his stomach. Poor Luffy was taking it the worst, which Sabo understood. He was beginning to tremble again, much more noticeable than his shifting had been, and he was gripping onto his hat so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. To combat this, Sabo sent slightly stronger feelings of warmth than normal, hoping to calm the terrified boy. He was sure Ace was too because soon enough Luffy's trembling died down, and his grip loosened a bit. His name was Har. Sabo didn't expect the name to be that hard to get out in that moment, but the name died on his tongue unexpectedly, and he had to clear his throat and try again. Excuse me, his name was Hair, Sabo said, trying to play off the hiccup. He took a second to recollect his thoughts and continued. He took us to a building on the island, what we call the facility, Sabo said, hissing the word facility with as much venom as possible. The best way to describe it is hell on earth. We were put in cells and given numbers, Sabo said, showing his wrist that held the number he had become known for back in that place. He could see Luffy grab his own wrist, covering the number with his palm, while Ace began glaring at his own number that was showing face up at him. And that was where we were left for our first day. We were fed, but it wasn't even something I think could be categorized under the definition of the food. Garbage would be more like it. By the second day, though, we were figuring out just what our new home was. Every day they would take children, all within the same age range as us, and do tests or experiments on them. They were especially interested in devil fruits, and Luffy quickly became one of their favorites. We were told by another child that the life expectancy of children in the facility wasn't long, barely a month if lucky, but we somehow managed to survive with everything they put us through. Sabo growled out, glaring at the wood now, not able to meet Shanks' eyes anymore. He was surprised he had been able to say this much though. He was expecting it to be much harder, and, sure, he hadn't even gotten to the hardest part yet, but if it went this way the entire time, he wouldn't complain. Whatever they could think of, they tried. What a human that can live through a life-threatening virus. Well, they'd inject a child with it and see if they could save them. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. They never could. Want to know how a person ticks? Let's cut a kid up and find out. Sabo knew he was getting a bit too graphic, but he couldn't help it. After all, he had been one of those kids. Ace had been one of those kids. Luffy had been one of those kids. Taking a deep breath to calm himself, he continued. After our first year in there, we were becoming known throughout the facility. We were the longest surviving children in there, having watched every child in there come and go, over and over again. We had a bit of luck though, finally, when we met Emily. She was actually nice and tried to help us in any way that she could. She would give us candy or fruit when she could and chalk to use, so we wouldn't get bored when we had to sit in our cell. She even gave us a map of the facility and wanted to help us, as well as all the other children, escape. Sabo said with a small smile, Luffy and Ace smiling slightly as well at the thought of the kind woman that had helped them. But of course our luck ran out quickly. The doctors decided to do a test on Luffy, see what sea stone in a liquid form would do to a devil fruit user. They injected it and sent us back to our cell where Luffy only started to get worse and worse as time passed. We didn't know what to do, but soon Emily came with something that would help him. It was a new test the doctors were going to try, a serum that would completely flush the sea stone from Luffy's system. She gave it to us, we injected it, and it worked, but only seconds after Haru came and shot Emily. Sabo said, hatred creeping into his voice at the thought of Haru killing the one person the brothers had liked in that place. Shank and Ben's faces, which previously had smiles when Sabo described Emily, had turned to frowns at the thought of the doctor's tests, and then anger at the mention of Emily's death. After that another year passed and we knew that the doctors were working on something, construction. Turns out it was a training room where we were forced to spar with other children. We tried to avoid the fighting but were punished for it, so instead, we fought. The doctors promised any kid that beat us freedom, but they never made it possible for them to win. Shortly after, they began doing a new kind of testing. They were beginning to enhance a person's natural abilities, for example, speed. They made it possible for a child to move so fast they were invisible. Another was healing where a child's regenerative abilities were instantaneous. Sabo said, hesitating now. Should he mention their abilities too? They would lose the upper hand if the red hair pirates turned on them, but he didn't think that they would. Should I tell him? Sabo asked. Ace looked like he wanted to say an immediate no, but he held off, not quite sure himself. Shanks is safe. Luffy's simple and quick response was enough for Sabo, because if Luffy was able to be that sure about it, then it was okay. And then they enhanced our abilities too. They mess with my ears, giving me much stronger hearing to where I can hear things happening on deck right now. They gave Ace much better vision to the point that he can see in the dark. And they gave Luffy a much better sense of smell to the point that he doesn't even need to see a person to know who it is. Sabo explained, noticing the looks of shock on Shanks and Ben's faces. It was hard to adjust to it at first, everything was too loud to me for a while, even whispers, and Ace got eye strained to the point that he would get horrible migraines. Luffy would get headaches from the strong smell of antiseptic in the lab too, and it would burn his nose and give him headaches too. We were forced to fight more and more. Another year passed, I think it was our third year there, and they ended up giving Ace a devil fruit, the Marimari no Mi, allowing him to create and control fire. We were already their favorite brothers, but now they loved us even more now that two of us had devil fruits. They tested on us more, did more devil fruit based tests on Ace and Luffy, and continued on with their experiments. At one point they messed up. They always did multiple tests on us at once, but apparently they did one too many tests on me, or something just didn't add right, because I started to. Well, die. At one point, I was dead. They had killed me, but after a few minutes they managed to get me back, and I survived. They kept me overnight and sent me back to the cell, continuing tests as if it never happened. And then, year 4, the worst happened. We were in our cells like normal when there was suddenly a loud explosion. No one knew what had happened, and then suddenly there was screaming and a fast-spreading fire. It crept through the hall and into cells until it finally reached ours. I have to admit, I definitely thought we were going to die. The fire was huge, and it wasn't going out anytime soon, but then Ace did whatever he did and we were fine. Sabo said, realizing he had never really gotten an exact explanation on what it was Ace had done to save them. Even though he had been wearing Seastone, Ace had managed to keep the fire from hurting us, and we were safe. The same didn't go for everyone else though, because when they finally managed to get rid of the fire, we found out that all the other children, and even some doctors, had died. They didn't know how we survived, but they didn't question it much. It took them some time, but they managed to fully restock the facility with all new children, and repair what had been lost in the explosion that had started the fire. They continued on like it had never happened. They continued doing tests on us, because when didn't they, and the next tragedy came. One specific test they wanted to do on Luffy involved poison. They gave him a myriad of different poisons with the intent of creating an antidote to cure all poison. At least, that's what I think the point of it was, who knows. Long story short, they weren't able to stop the poison's effects, and they managed to kill Luffy as well. They tried bringing him back, but they gave up after a few minutes and pronounced him dead. As they started cleaning up though, Luffy came back and they did the same they had done to me, keeping him overnight to make sure he was really okay. I think the worst year though was year 6, Sabo said, voice growing soft again at the thought of that horrible year. He could already see Luffy becoming more and more on edge at the mention of that year, which made Sabo hesitate, wondering if he should talk about it at all. Should I stop, Lu? He asked, not wanting to say anything Luffy didn't want Shanks to know. Luffy's frown deepened and he shook his head, standing up. Ace stood as well, having a feeling he knew what Luffy was doing, and followed as the youngest left his room, everyone watching them leave. As I said, it was a bad year, Sabo said softly, sighing as he leaned forward on the table, clasping his hands together as he got ready to tell the rest of the story. Things were normal in the beginning, we were tested on like normal and fought like normal, even learning hockey in the process. One day, though, the doctors decided they wanted to run a new series of tests that they called the Pure Souls tests. It was a 3-part series. It started off with the doctors taking Luffy and giving him something that made him see someone's memories whenever he looked them in the eyes. He couldn't control it, and no matter who the person, if he so much as glanced at their eyes, he would see their entire history. They also gave him the ability to feel people's emotions. He still can't quite control that one, and if someone's feeling a particularly strong emotion, it can influence Luffy's own emotions. For example, if someone gets really angry, chances are, Luffy will get inexplicably angry as well, even if he was actually quite cheerful moments ago. The next test they ran gave him the ability to see colors around people. In simple terms, they gave him the ability to see people's souls. The lighter the blue, the better the person was, but the darker the color got, the worse the person was. If a person had a completely black color. Sabo trailed off, shivering at the thought of hair once more. Anyways, after that test was the final test, the worst one too. This one allowed Luffy to create, in the doctor's words, bridges to other people. The problem was that, in doing this, there was a possibility of the person that Luffy was trying to bridge to dying. The doctors forced him to try bridging to several children, all of them dying in the process. And then they sent Ace in, and when Luffy tried bridging to him it worked, creating a wave in Luffy's words. They had him do the same to me, as well as a few more children after that, but they all died. It was deduced that Luffy wouldn't be able to create waves with people he didn't know well, and if he tried then they would die. The waves that Luffy created allow him to know where Ace and I are. We don't know if there's a limit on how far away he can be and still see it, seeing as we haven't been apart since then. He also has the ability to see what state of health we're in from the wave. The more transparent they are, the closer to death we are, the more opaque, the healthier we are. After these tests though, Luffy became much more withdrawn. He felt responsible for killing all those children, no matter how many times Ace and I told him otherwise. It was a struggle to keep his hopes up that we would escape in that last year, and finally, the day came when we were escaping. We had been planning it our entire time there. We had created a silent language to use so that we could discuss things without anyone knowing, and it's worked pretty well so far. We still use it a lot by making a series of tapping noises to create words and sentences. While planning, Ace and I were hoping to get all of us out, but mainly our goal was getting Luffy out, not that we told him that. It worked though, we got him out and he found the Whitebeards who came and got us and all the other children out. Sabo said, concluding the very lengthy story. Shanks and Ben sat back in their chairs, having a lot to take in. Ace and Luffy reappeared then, hesitantly entering the room, to which Sabo nodded. I just finished, Sabo said, leaning back in his chair as well. It was an odd feeling, finally telling someone else the entire story of the past 7 years of hell. Maybe he was supposed to feel like a weight had been lifted off his chest, or maybe just a general feeling of relief. After all, isn't that what authors normally put in their books after a character tells someone something that's been troubling? Well, he felt none of that. The heaviness was still there, and there was no relief to make him feel any better. The memories still haunted him, and he was sure they would continue to for many more years to come, most likely to his death. The heavy feeling would never go away, he knew that now. It may become easier to live with, but that feeling would always be there, no matter how much he ran from it. What you three went through was more than anyone eats in an entire lifetime, Ben said with a sigh and a shake of his head. The trio didn't respond to that, merely staring at the table. I wish I had found you three so I could have beat those damn bastards to a pulp, Shanks said with a pout, Ben rolling his eyes at his captain's antics. I wish I had been awake to do the same thing, Ace muttered, now pouting as well. This time Sabo rolled his eyes, though a smile did form at the now light-hearted mood that was beginning to take form. Shanks sighed again, sitting up once more. That was a hell of a story, and I'm glad you three are okay. If any of you need anything don't hesitate to ask, I mean it. Shanks said, the brothers all nodding, sure that, if necessary, they would take the man up on that offer. Now that that's settled, how about a party? You three need to fatten up, and a party is the best way to do that. Ben, tell the chefs to get started on the cooking, and tell them we've got some bottomless pits that need filling too. Shanks ordered with a smile, turning the entire mood around. Ben chuckled lightly, shaking his head as he stood. Aye, Captain, Ben said as he left the room. Shanks turned to the brothers with smiles. Come on boys, let's go start the celebration. Chapter 30. The Illusion of Peace. It was strange, after 7 years of torture and pain, the brothers always on edge, always ready for the next person they met to hurt them in new ways. For them to suddenly be able to be at peace was strange. Or, at least, a semblance of peace it is. The red-haired pirates threw a party that the brothers had never experienced before. They may have been the guests of honor, the whole reason for the party, but no one gave them special attention, no one made them uncomfortable, no one forced them into the spotlight. It was nice. It was a small blessing that the three never got to experience anymore. They were always the center of everyone's attention, for the past 7 years, and now, they could leave and hide out in their room, and no one would bat an eye. No one would demand they come back, they would accept that they were gone, and that would be that. Food was brought out about an hour after the festivities started. Now there was food to go with the many drinks being passed around, and the music playing felt much cheerier, now that they were filling their stomachs with delicious food. The brothers ate with no qualms to those watching for once, which was also a blessing they hadn't had in years. Back on the Whitebeard's ship, they were too scared to even dare ask for seconds, much less eat without the manners they had been forced to learn. Food was shoveled into Ace and Luffy's mouths faster than it was appearing on their plates, and while Sabo was eating much slower, and with utensils, it was still much faster than a normal person should safely consume food. They ate seconds and thirds, and though that's where Sabo stopped, it's not where his brothers stopped. They continued on to eat fourths, fifths, sixths even. By their 9th plate, they finally finished, much more satisfied than they had been in a long while. The pirates around them cheered, some collecting bets that they had made while they had been eating. With food out of the way, the party continued on with singing, dancing, and overall chatter. Luffy seemed to relax around everyone more, going and joining in on the singing, talking to someone named Yassip cheerfully, listening to the man talk about his son. And eventually dozing off during one of these stories. Ace and Sabo watched him closely throughout this, ready to come to his aid at any moment should he need it, but they knew that wouldn't be necessary, not while they were with the red-haired pirates. It was strange to feel that peace, that sense of security. They hadn't ever really felt that before, not even back in the forest, because you never knew when an angry pirate from the Great Terminal would come running after them, but here with these complete strangers, at least in Ace and Sabo's case, they felt safe. After the talk they'd had with Shanks and Ben, the two oldest brothers had been a bit more on edge around the captain and first mate, especially after Luffy told them they were both angry. Despite the youngest telling them repeatedly that they weren't angry at them, but at the facility, the brothers couldn't help but feel that anger would suddenly be directed at them, and they would have to run, to hide. It never happened though, and it seemed that the two men truly wanted the brothers to be safe and happy. Luffy told them that they were still angry, despite their outward appearances saying otherwise, but it was becoming easier for Sabo and Ace to relax around them, to feel safe. That definitely was not a feeling they thought they would be feeling in a long time. Maybe it was because Luffy so obviously trusted them, maybe it was because of their history with Luffy, maybe it was because they had always heard such high praise of them, but whatever it was, it worked. So when they saw Luffy fall asleep, they found that they felt no need to rush to his side, no need to carry him away, no need to hide their brother's weakness from these pirates. They did go over and pick him up though, taking Shanks' directions to a room inside the ship that they could use for the night. They didn't feel the need to look out for any incoming pirates that might be roaming the hulls. Instead of being out on deck partying, they merely made their way to their room and placed Luffy on one of the two beds, Ace crawling in beside the youngest, while Sabo moved to the other empty bed. Laying down and staring at the ceiling. Ace? Sabo asked softly, not wanting to wake Luffy. Ace hummed, his eyes closed but still awake. Sabo paused, glancing at Ace out of the corner of his eye, smiling a bit. You think we could get this feeling back again? Sabo asked, liking how secure he felt here, how nice the feelings were to experience, a harsh contrast to the one he'd experienced most of his life. Now Ace was quiet a minute, most likely thinking through his thoughts. Don't know, depends on tomorrow I guess, Ace muttered, and Sabo frowned a bit at the reminder of tomorrow. Tomorrow Garp would be coming, and that was probably going to be harder than when they saw Shanks, because Garp was their grandfather, he was family, someone they all knew and were, for the most part, close with. Seeing a stranger you knew about was a cakewalk compared to seeing a family member you had given up hope on ever seeing again. Tomorrow was going to be an interesting day, that was for sure. That's your right, night, Ace, Sabo said, turning to Lay on his side, getting comfortable and closing his eyes. Night, Sabo, Ace mumbled back, also shifting a bit to get more comfortable on the tiny bed he was sharing with Luffy. The two fell into a peaceful sleep within minutes. Wakey wakey, rise and shine. Shanks' voice drifted through the door and into the brothers' room, all of them groaning at being woken up. The captain was also knocking loudly on their door, and it didn't seem like he was going to stop anytime soon. Groaning, Sabo stood up from his bed, stretching and shuffling towards the door begrudgingly. Yeah, shut up you red-haired bastard. Ace's mumble wasn't loud enough for the captain outside to hear, but it made Sabo smile nonetheless as he reached the door, only pausing when he realized something. Normally they were all pretty light sleepers, Sabo especially, and the second anyone started coming toward their room he was normally wide awake. The blonde decided to shrug this off though, deciding to chalk it up to a mixture of feeling safe here, and being completely exhausted from both the facility, and making sure they were acceptable enough for the Whitebeards. Morning, Shanks, Sabo said with a yawn. The red-haired man was grinning widely to him, finally ceasing his knocking. Ah, finally, good morning, Sabo. Breakfast is ready if you three want to head to the galley. I'm sure Luffy remembers where it is if you want a few minutes, Shanks said, peeking behind him and seeing the still very much asleep Ace and Luffy. Sabo smiled a little, nodding. I think that's a good idea. We'll see you in a few, thanks for waking us up, Sabo said, Shanks, nodding and walking away, waving goodbye as he did. Closing the door, Sabo sighed, turning to face Ace and Luffy. Alright you two, come on, Sabo said, walking over to them and shaking them, trying to get them up as best he could. They both groaned and swatted at his hands, causing him to roll his eyes. It's breakfast time, and if you two don't get up soon who knows if there'll be enough food left for you, he said, grinning as he knew it would work. Within seconds the two shot out of bed, Luffy already on the other side of the room, and flinging the door open. Boy, Lu, wait up, Ace called as he chased after the youngest. Sabo chuckled, following at a much slower pace, not worried about getting lost. If he did have trouble all he would have to do was listen for Ace and Luffy's bickering as they fought over food. It was still odd to Sabo to feel so normal. It was such a sudden change from the tenseness and fear of the previous morning, but Sabo couldn't find it in himself to complain about it. After all they had been through, they deserved at least this much because he knew by the time his brothers really started to wake up, they would remember what was happening today. They would remember that Garp, their grandfather that they had given up hope on ever seeing again, was going to come and see them sometime today. When, they didn't know, but that would only make them more unnerved. Reaching the galley, Sabo was met with food flying every which way, Ace and Luffy the center of it all as they scarfed down as much as they could. Oh, hey Famo, Ace greeted, waving to Sabo as he spoke with his mouth full. Sabo shook his head, sitting beside Luffy. Swallow before you talk, Ace, we've been over this, Sabo said, beginning to eat his own food. Ace merely shrugged, saying nothing more as he continued eating as well. Shanks joined them soon after bringing a plate of his own food over. Your appetite is as big as ever, huh Luffy? Shanks asked as he watched the youngest finish his fourth plate. Luffy beamed at him, cheeks puffed out from all the food in his mouth and nodded. Shanks laughed at that, turning to Sabo now. So, are you ready for today? Shanks asked with a small smile. Sabo froze for a second, swallowing his bite slowly as he stared at his plate, thinking about how he should respond. Sabo assumed Ace and Luffy hadn't been listening because they continued eating as if the mention of Garp coming hadn't been brought up. He did notice that Luffy furrowed his eyebrows in confusion, glancing at Sabo as he ate. He had probably picked up on his suddenly nervous feelings. Taking a deep breath, Sabo calmed himself, sending a smile to Luffy which the boy accepted, returning to his food. As ready as I think we could be, Sabo decided to say eventually. Shanks nodded in understanding. Then said he should be here around noon, but the thing is, we have to leave soon, probably after breakfast. The Marines were already antsy when they found out I was heading towards Whitebeard, and now that we spend this much time near them, they're surely going to be sending someone to check it out if we don't go soon, so it's the best we can do, Shanks said, and this time Sabo stopped eating, realizing quickly exactly what all of this meant. So we'll have to continue staying with the Whitebeard pirates until Garp shows up is what you're saying, correct? Sabo asked, not meeting the man's eyes. Apparently Ace and Luffy were listening now because they froze, meals forgotten as they looked over with wide eyes. Afraid so, but don't worry, the Whitebeards aren't bad people, they'll keep you safe until Garp shows up, Shanks said, trying to be reassuring, but it didn't have the effect intended on the brothers. Even though the Whitebeards had saved the brothers and kept them safe and as comfortable as possible, the trio was still uneasy around them. If the pirates found out about what happened in the facility, they surely wouldn't be so accommodating. Besides, it'll only be a few hours until Garp gets here. Don't worry, Shanks said, but that didn't help calm the brothers either. Breakfast continued in almost a tense silence. The brothers were internally freaking out about having to stay with the Whitebeards again, while Shanks didn't know what else to say to calm them down. After they all finished, Shanks was told by the navigator that everything was set for them to leave, and that's when the brothers felt even more uneasy. Shanks escorted them back to the Whitebeard's ship, where they were once again the center of attention, all eyes on them, and any feelings of safety and security went away as they left the red-haired pirate's ship. "Welcome back," Whitebeard greeted, smiling to the group as they stepped onto the deck. Shanks smiled back, nodding to the man before turning to face the brothers. "Alright you three, as I said before, Garp will be here soon, so just relax for a bit. Everything will be just fine, I'm sure of it, but just in case, here," Shanks said, pulling something out of his pocket and handing it to Sabo. It was 2 pieces of paper, one with a number on it, most likely the man's Den Mushi number, and another completely blank paper. "What is it?" Ace asked, peering over Sabo's shoulder to see it. "That one's my Den number, but this is my Viva card. It's a paper tied to the owner's life force, so if you hold it, it'll move in the direction of that person, see?" Shanks explained, opening Sabo's palm and placing the paper in his palm, all of them watching as it crept closer to the man. "WOAH, so it's a mystery paper," Luffy said with a toothy grin, Shanks laughing loudly in response. "You got that right, Anchor. Anyways, I gave you enough to rip it into 3, so each of you can have one. If you ever need to find me, that paper'll lead you right to me," Shanks said, still smiling. Luffy was now pouting at the mention of Shanks' favorite nickname for him, while Ace and Sabo were nodding in understanding. "Thank you, Shanks, for everything," Sabo said, bowing to the man, Ace following suit and doing the same. Shanks waved, still smiling. It was nothing. Stay safe you three." "And Anchor," Shanks said, turning to address the still pouting boy. Luffy perked up to show he was listening, but he continued to pout as well. "I'm still holding you to our promise, yeah?" the red-haired man asked, shocking the pout right off of Luffy's face. The boy hadn't been expecting that. He had thought that their promise was dead now, thought that Shanks wouldn't want him to keep the infamous hat anymore, but hearing those words confirmed for the boy that it was still strong. Luffy beamed to Shanks, nodding. The brothers finally stopped waving when they couldn't even see Shanks' ship on the horizon anymore. They had been trying to ignore the fact that they were once again stuck with the Whitebeards, but now they were going to be forced to face that fact, seeing as they couldn't stall any longer with watching after Shanks' ship. "Why don't we just make a break for it back to the room?" Ace asked while Sabo suppressed a sigh. "Because that might cause them to come after us, which we definitely don't want," Sabo replied. Now that their only sense of security was gone, the brothers had reverted back to their timid and antsy state. Their smiles were gone, replaced with tense frowns, and they were back to speaking their silent language almost exclusively. No one had approached them yet, but it was only a matter of time until someone did. "So we're supposed to just stand here?" Ace asked. Luffy was shifting nervously in between the two, wanting to be back with Shanks, but knowing that wasn't going to happen. Of course not, but right now Sabo stopped his tapping when he noticed someone heading their way, stealing his nerves as he turned away from the sea to address the person, his brothers doing the same. "Welcome back, we got word not too long that Garp would be here in about an hour, Yor." The brothers' stomachs dropped at the news given to them by the Whitebeard's first commander. Wasn't Garp supposed to get here at noon? Another 3 hours from now. "He's made good time, then, huh?" Sabo asked weakly, trying to hide the nervousness that he felt. Marco nodded in response, glancing at the ocean behind them. According to him, he hit good waters which reduced his travel time, Marco said, turning to watch the brothers again. Sabo nodded, swallowing. "That's good news then. Thank you, Commander," Sabo said, forcing himself to give the man a pleasant smile. Marco seemed to notice that the smile was a little off, but to Sabo's relief he said nothing, merely nodding and turning to walk away. "Now can we go to our room?" Ace asked, any shred of a good mood that he had had that day gone completely. Sabo only nodded, the three turning to leave the deck, heading to where they knew their room was. "It's like a complete turnaround," Thatch said in slight amazement as he and the other commanders along with Whitebeard watched the brothers slink off to their room, not looking at anybody. "They look so happy back on the Red Force, now they look like they're scared we're gonna bite their heads off," Haruta said, confused as to the sudden personality change in the trio. "They also knew Shanks though, Yoi," Marco said as he reached the group. "What's that got to do with anything?" Rakiyu asked. "They know the Akagami brat so they were more comfortable around him, but here they don't know us at all," Whitebeard explained, though some were still confused. "So they're scared of us?" Blenheim asked. "Most likely it's not that they're scared of us as people, but more of what we could do. We have no idea what happened to them in the facility, but it definitely wasn't anything good, and that may have influenced the way they see strangers, Yuri." Marco elaborated, everyone slowly beginning to understand more and more. Poor kids, Vista said as he looked over to the brothers who were disappearing into the depths of the Moby. All we can do right now is try to make them as comfortable as possible until Garp gets here, Whitebeard said with a sigh, wishing he could do more to help the boys, but he didn't want to force them to do anything that would make them more uncomfortable than was necessary. I don't think that'll be an issue, they're probably going to camp out in their room till he gets here. Fossa said as he folded his arms across his chest. And that's okay. If they want to stay there then we won't force them to come out. Whitebeard said softly. Well guys, that is it for now, make sure to like and subscribe for a cookie, and join the Discord if you want. Anyway, see you guys later.